tail erupted with a monster's roar that thundered up from the forest's darkest depths. Lafay, the red-haired girl, lunged and split the beast in two with a single swift stroke. A shadow of worry gnawed at Lappy's mind. She had a friend named Wrath who, the instant he saw her bloodied and broken, surged forward like a hurricane. Mere elixir across her injury. Laffy blasted him for blowing a priceless potion on a tiny nick, Wraith. Her reaction stunned him. He smirked. He could just whip up more. Wraith and Alchemist ignited a knot of dread in Lappy's gut. Elixirs that could mend any injury, no wound too deep for them. They were staggeringly rare. Only a handful of alchemists could forge them after years of brutal toil, and most attempts still ended in failure. Snagging even one was nearly impossible. An entire lifetime of toil might still fail to yield enough gold. Once Lafay emptied her hoard, risking every last coin to buy an elixir. They lunged for it, only to find the last vial had already been claimed by a noble. Desperate to secure the elixir for her sister, Lafay begged the seller, promising she'd do anything. He shut her down, bluntly declaring his business came first. Stung by rejection, she spun away and slammed into a frail man who buckled against her, and she gasped, "Are you okay?" A thunderous growl exploded from his stomach. Luffy barreled over and thrust food at the man who was Wrath. The man, voice trembling with gratitude, revealed he was an alchemist. He vowed to repay her kindness by conjuring whatever she wanted with alchemy. She impulsively demanded an elixir, then eyed his gaunt, starving frame and doubted he could brew it. Her breath hitched as Wrath nodded and thrust a genuine elixir into her trembling hands. Stunned, he burst into laughter and shot, "Where'd you get that?" While Wrath just grinned, shrugged, and casually confessed he'd made it himself. She snapped the vial to the light. Its molten color and crackling aura mirrored the lone sheet she'd spotted in the shop, sealing it as the real thing. Laffy, breathless at its worth, vowed she'd pay any price. Wrather shot her a grin and declared it his way of thanking her for the bread she'd given him. Still itching to help, she leaned in with a grin and asked if he needed a hand hawking his potions. As they walked, he blurted out it was his first time in the capital and a pickpocket had snatched his wallet, leaving him flat broke. Luffy barreled forward, guiding Wrath straight into the Adventurers Guild. They burst through the doors as the guild erupted with murmurs about Lafay and the S-ranked adventurer, and Wraith leaned in, curiosity blazing, asking if she was well known. She shot back that fame was unavoidable at her rank. At the counter, receptionist Amelia flashed Lathe a warm, radiant greeting. When Wraith declared his name, Amelia flashed a wicked grin and prodded, "So, are you Lathe's boyfriend?" Cheeks aflame and laughing to deflect it, she insisted she'd only helped Wrath after finding him in your collapse. Her fierce denial stung him, so Wrath stepped forward and spelled out their purpose. They slammed the gleaming elixir onto the counter and put it up for sale. Lafay crashed to his knees. Stunned alchemists had toiled their whole lives for a single elixir, and Wraith casually produced two like they meant nothing. Her curiosity about Wraith burned hotter, nagging at her every thought. Amelia tested the elixir, declared it genuine, then locked eyes and demanded, "Are you sure you're going to sell a treasure like this?" Wraith smirked, conjured 4 more elixirs like it was nothing, and boasted he had plenty. Amelia erupted into a piercing cry that snapped the whole guild to attention. Alarm slammed into Lathe. He yanked the Wraith toward the exit and barked, "Explain yourself." Wraith blinked, baffled, shrugged off the uproar and snapped that they were just elixirs he'd brewed. Lathe thundered that his alchemical skill was extraordinary. She warned that dangerous people would come for him if word of his talent leaked, implored him not to sell his elixirs, but Wraith exploded in protest. He swallowed hard, voice cracking, and owned up, there was nothing left to sell. With no plan left, Lackey resolved to crash at her house for the night. Guilt tore at him for yanking his sales to a halt, and Wraith just stood there, utterly unbothered. Relief hit him like a wave. He'd take any roof over his head, even if it was with a girl. Inside Lafayette House, Wrath's jaw dropped at the resident's colossal size. Lathe burst onto the scene with a young girl at his side. She thrust the girl into the spotlight and declared, "This is my younger sister, Sylvia." Laugh stepped up to brew the tea, and Silly leapt in to help. Laffy demanded she rest, keep going, and her health would only spiral. Sylvia slid into the chair opposite Wraith, silence clinging to her as Lafayette darted off to make the tea. Silence ballooned into suffocating awkwardness, and Wrath's mind flailed for anything to say. Sylvie unleashed a rush of gratitude, and he asked why. She snapped that he'd handed her sister a precious elixir. He shot back that Lafay had helped him first, so his thanks belonged to her. Still, Sylvia insisted on thanking him, explaining that Lathe had labored relentlessly for her sake. Wrath's jaw dropped, bewildered. as Sylvia revealed Lathe was frantically racing to find a cure for her illness. It slammed into Ray why Laffy was so driven. He whirled to Sylvia and blurted, "You've got an amazing sister." Sylvia's grin exploded as she nodded. Lathe was, without a doubt, the greatest sister in the world. Wraith snorted, a chuckle escaping him. Sylvia had seemed so mature at first. She dropped a bombshell. She was only 15. Wraith wished her a stand as your shield. Sylvia flashed a daring smile. Hidden behind the door, Laffy eavesdropped and flashed a grin too. At dawn, Wraith ripped open his satchel and plunged straight into brewing potions. Lathe demanded why. He shot back that since she forbade selling elixirs, he'd switched to brewing potions instead. Sylvie leaned in and fired the question, "How long does potion making usually take?" Laffy shrugged and guessed about an hour per vial, depending on the brew. Wrath scoffed, boasting a medium-quality potion only took him seconds. Lackey yanked at Sylvia's side. He snapped, "Don't believe him, only someone as uncanny as Wraith could whip up a potion that fast." They traded barbs. Sully burst into a giggle and branded Wrath a total oddball. Wrath ripped open his bag, hauled out the ingredients, and held them up for Lathe to inspect. They watched as he snapped his eyes shut, steadied his breath and intoned the extract. Purge impurities, lock the components in place, then force them to leap straight into vapor. In a heartbeat, the potion snapped into being, exactly when he said it would. The sisters gasped at their first glimpse of alchemy, flawless, breath-stealing perfection. Ray though glided through it like clockwork. He couldn't fathom how priceless his skills were. He aimed for a mid-tier potion and it erupted into a top-quality brew. Holding back only a little, he saw that churning out dozens would erase his financial worries. Sylvia's eyes snapped wide as she shot out, "I finally get what my sister meant earlier." Later at the Ventures Guild, Wrath barreled up to Amelia and roared his greeting. He apologized for the previous day, slammed a brand new item onto the table, and shouted he was offering it for sale right then and there. He thrust a gleaming, top-grade potion toward her and asked, "Will you buy it?" Amelia grinned. He wanted to dig into the previous day first. Laffy shut that down and pushed it to later. Amelia slammed 3 gold coins onto the counter, daring the merchant to hand over 15 high-quality potions. Far beyond all forecasts, the rate exploded. She warned that with monsters swarming in more often, potions were running dangerously low. Relief surged through Wrath when he spied the inn's warm light. He fired a question at Lathe about her plans, and she confessed she hadn't taken a guild request in ages. Requests slammed in from every angle. One minute you were foraging herbs, the next you were hunting monsters, and sometimes you were on quiet, non-combat gigs finding lost cats or brewing potions. Laffy's details landed, Wraith smirked, and doubt clawed through her as she started second-guessing every choice. She slammed her name down to become an adventurer, lured by the thrill and the glittering rewards on offer. Lapti sized up the risk. One request for elixirs or any impossible ask would blow Wraith's cover, so she shadowed him relentlessly, ready to pounce the moment danger flared. Amelia announced to Wrath he'd just been awarded a rank. Even if he skipped extermination runs, he could still climb to rank D. Lathe suggested. He handled requests that ignored alchemy, yet Wrath's top pick plunged straight into an alchemy case. She lobbed a cat-themed plea to tip the scales, and he stared it down, refusing to budge from his choice. Amelia snapped, eyes sharp, taking that alchemy request would be a fool's gamble. The client was clearly peculiar. No one had ever pulled it off. It was a reckless choice, but Ray shoved aside her and Laffy's protests and insisted on taking it. Amelia probed whether he'd caught her warning. He nodded. He'd understood, and the challenge sparked a hungry gleam in his eyes. Breather thundered up to the client's house on a roaring ride. Lathe's worried face slammed into him, and he shoved himself to carry out the request without a hitch to ease her worries. He pounded on the door and boomed that he'd come for the request. The young girl grinned and barked, "Follow me now, we're starting." Wrath assumed the girl was just helping. She cut him off and declared, "I'm Daisy, I posted the request." He clocked in at about the same age, practically a peer. He blurted an apology for assuming she was younger. She barked, "Quiet, follow me." They stepped into a room where Daisy spelled it out. He'd be extracting and purifying herbs for her. Daisy described extracting as boiling the herbs down until their properties poured into a potent liquid, and purifying as stripping that liquid clean of every impurity. He shoved as many as he could into the process. He led with a sly, menacing smile, and a cold wave of the task crashed over Wraith. At the beginning of Luria's new adventure, she plunged into laughter, devoured food, clinked glasses, and chased wild, unbridled fun. His efficiency and precision dwarfed a typical alchemist's by at least 50-fold. Time wore on and doubt clawed at him, but he obeyed Daisy's orders and pushed forward, completing his first request effortlessly while craving Laptise's praise and determined to prove he could handle the tasks alone. Rave pressed on. Seeing how late it was, Daisy leaned in and called him out, "You slacking." She swung the door open and, cool and effortless, offered him a quick breather if he needed it. Daisy froze, eyes wide, as the room came into view with every surface piled high with processed herbs. He'd conjured everything from the supplied ingredients. She exploded into a shout, yelling for him to explain how he'd pulled off so much, so fast. Wrath's voice sliced through the silence, cool and steady as he dropped, "I only used standard alchemy." Daisy sneered that normal couldn't touch his speed and, still shouting, demanded he explain exactly how he pulled it off. Wraith plucked a herb and with one smooth motion distilled its purifying essence so effortlessly everyone fell silent. He treated it like routine alchemy, calm and practiced, while Daisy quivered, overwhelmed. She crumpled into unconsciousness. She jolted awake to find herself sprawled on the Wrath. She jolted, breath snatched at how close they stood. Daisy's eyes went sharp. The moment she grasped their position, she slapped Wrath. She flushed crimson and snapped, "That kind of closeness is only for someone you love." Wrath blurted an apology, explaining he couldn't leave her sprawled unconscious on the floor. Daisy took him at his word, then raced her eyes across the room to prove the incredible work wasn't a dream. She raved about Wraith's raw talent, baffled that his name hadn't spread beyond a whisper. He revealed he'd only just arrived in the capital, coming straight from the countryside where he'd been buried in alchemy. Curiosity burning, Daisy spun toward Wrath and asked him for a favor. She beckoned him to drop in now and then to lend a hand, and asked him to teach her alchemy too. The request slammed into Wrath like a sucker punch. He was blindsided. He'd never taught anyone before. Spark ignited in him and he shot back, "I'm in." Daisy thrust a request form into his hands. He inked his name. He swore he'd rush it straight to the guild, then sprinted away. Wraith blasted through his first guild request, then, before he could back out, found himself promising to teach Daisy alchemy. At the guild, Amelia whooped and pulled Wrath into a tight hug, shouting congratulations for finishing the task. Stunned he'd pulled it off, she thrust a single gold coin into his palm as his reward. Wrath spun to Laffey, chest puffed as he bragged he'd handled the request solo. Laffey, unimpressed, snapped, "Say that again," and Wrath went stone still. Half an hour earlier, Wraith crashed through the guild doors, the completed request clutched like a victory flag. He admitted the brief was brutal, do as much as possible left him unsure when to stop, so he worked relentlessly until every inch of the room was packed, and the client was so stunned by the result she fainted. Once the dust settled, Wraith stepped forward and pledged to teach the client alchemy. He swallowed hard and confessed he'd probably gone way overboard. Laffey slammed his point. This was no small matter. He'd knocked the client out and suspected the client was exploiting him. She clocked that the client had bent him into a regular assistant and teacher for her audacious alchemy projects, a perfect payoff for the client, and Rafe finally grasped the meaning behind her slay smile. Laffey snarled his advice: while kindness is valuable, he must be more cautious and recognize his own worth. Ray swallowed hard and admitted that grasping his own worth felt like trying to catch smoke. Next chapter, two adventurers huddle and swap a hair-raising rumor about an alchemist. A wild-eyed alchemist burst into the guild, arms overflowing with shimmering elixirs. Out tore through him, was it true? The other sneered, declaring it nothing but a fabrication. They were mid-chat when a strange sound sliced through the air. A few days earlier, after becoming an adventurer, Wraith leapt at Daisy's request inside her shop. He confessed to her, voice cracking, that figuring out his own worth had become a daily battle. Daisy's eyes went wide at the out-of-nowhere remark and she snapped, "What made you say that?" Wrath explained that a friend had pushed him to finally see his own worth, and he was scrambling to figure out how. Daisy had no clue he had friends, and Wrath reeled in stunned disbelief. He staggered, stunned that she had branded him a lonely outcast. Daisy thundered the rule: temper every action. Wraith snapped, demanding clarification. She warned dumping a heap of elixirs at once would light a beacon for every greedy eye, so she urged a slow trickle, just one elixir a year. Daisy snapped that selling them on the sly would keep prying eyes away. Elixirs could save lives, and any spectacle would invite deadly attention. Only a fool tried to hawk a large batch of precious elixirs at once. Curiosity ignited, she leaned in, asked if Wrath brewed elixirs, and vowed to learn to craft them herself. Wrath grinned, agreed to teach her, and dared her to demonstrate extraction, purification, component setting, and the final sublimation. Daisy, confidence crackling around her, dared him to watch every move. Ray stepped up to teach her alchemy for the first time, and Daisy had been aching for this moment. She locked her focus and in a heartbeat, brewed a flawless, potent potion. Wrath's face split into an impressed grin, and Daisy exploded into thrilled laughter. Her jaw dropped when he bluntly declared her knowledge was lacking. Daisy snapped for him to repeat himself. Wraith cut in, saying she'd mastered the basics, but he meant the deeper knowledge buried in books. He breathed the name chakra, a rare ingredient that only takes root where the atmosphere thrums with dense mana. It's the lifeblood of elixirs and high potions, yet herbals barely mention it. She'd been blind to its past, now the truth was about to slam into her. Rafe slammed several books onto the table and ordered her to dive into studying. Her jaw dropped. He was dead serious about making her study. She threw the question like a gauntlet: would studying sharpen her alchemy skills? He shot back, have you even heard of the herb? She snapped that it was for staunching bleeding, crushed and packed into the wound it worked best, and Wraith confirmed she was right. Alchemists bend alchemy to amplify clotting, brewing a potion that staunches bleeding and heals wounds. He thrust 2 vials at her, one she'd brewed from Lamu, the other he'd crafted. Daisy scanned them and saw his potion blaze with top-tier quality, while hers lingered at a plain, medium grade. Wrath leaned in, daring her to pinpoint what they'd changed, and her mind went blank. She couldn't. He leaned in and declared the difference was in picturing every step of refining the herb's components. How they used that vision decided whether a potion roared with power or fizzled into weakness. Studying was non-negotiable, the ruthless forge that hammered you into mastery of any skill. In the next scene, Sylvia bounded up and greeted Wrath warmly. She'd heard from her sister that he'd taken up adventuring. He declared he'd only take alchemy work, the adventurer label. He flat out refused it. Sylvia flashed a grin and teased that she hoped Lathe hadn't blabbed about the fainting incident. Then Lathe suddenly appeared and asked how he was doing. Wearing a Lathe-worn apron that disguised her at first glance, she fired a playful scold at Wrath, reminded him she was still a girl, and he sheepishly apologized. She slammed the pot onto the table and barked for everyone to eat before it cooled. Wraith snapped he hadn't come to eat, but Lackey insisted as their guest he'd join them. Sylvia blurted an apology to Lathe for dumping all the work on her, but Lathe waved it off. Sylvia still hadn't fully recovered. It was her first time cooking the dish, and she beamed because it had turned out great. While they ate, Lathe leaned in and asked Wrath how he was, and Wrath grinned that he'd started teaching Daisy alchemy, making Lathe's eyes flash as he wondered if Wrath would teach her the exact way he'd learned. Wrath shot back that reaching that level could take anything from a few days to outright decades. Sylvia's eyes flashed as she snapped, "You taught yourself alchemy." The moment he mentioned having a mentor, a shadow swallowed his smile. He fired off a sharp question about them. He sneered, declaring them utterly hopeless. He spat out how his mentor hurled him, still a kid, into beast-ridden dangers for training, and never lifted a finger for chores, a wasteful, booze-soaked eccentric who was utterly unreliable. He spat, "I never want to see them again." Dinner barely done, Wrath rose to leave when Sylvia lunged and stalked him mid-step. Gratitude surged through her as she cried out, saying. He snatched her sister back from death's jaws with his elixir. Wraith's grin exploded, pure gladness surging through him that he'd helped. He then strode toward his inn. Daisy's request handled, he headed for the guild and spotted a swelling crowd. He surged forward to see what was unfolding. He spotted Amelia barreling toward him, breathless and desperate as she begged him for help. At the town entrance, 2 adventurers lay bloodied and wounded, one clung to life, barely breathing. Wraith froze, dread slammed into him. Emilio already knew about his elixir. Brandishing it in public could be courting disaster. Laddie's warning slammed into him. Dangerous people were hunting him for his abilities. Wraith lunged into Estemelia, baiting him straight to the injured. He couldn't ignore people he could save. She hustled him toward the town entrance, where he barreled in and found the woman, gravely wounded. He sized her up and called it. She was bleeding out, eaten by rot, and had poison coursing through her veins. He thrust a green potion into the hands of the man holding her to staunch the bleeding, then pressed an elixir into his palm for the wound. He stood empty-handed, no potion to counter the poison. As the crowd scrambled to name him, he whipped up an antidote to the poison and dosed her in an instant. He slammed back all 3 potions, the one who reclaimed their health. The entire town exploded in stunned, joyful cheers at a life saved, and many had seen Wraith heal the girl's injuries. Direct requests for his services bombarded Wrath. He should have seen the complications coming. He swallowed his pride and admitted this was a nastier, heavier hassle than when he was penniless. Wraith tore through the requests, most begged him to concoct or sell elixirs. Many turned out to be wealthy collectors, perfectly healthy and uninjured, buying for the thrill not out of necessity. She barreled in, breathless and beaming, thanking him for the elixir that healed her and vowing to repay him with every day of her life. Wrath owned up to swiping the elixir without her permission. He wasn't expecting a single coin. She pressed to do something for him, so he asked her to come to his aid if he ever needed help. She agreed and stepped out of the room. He'd been so lost in his own head he totally blanked, and she snapped him back, reminding him he'd unleashed his powers to save someone. Rafe vowed to sell elixirs only to the truly needy, and he hunted down other ways to fix people's problems instead of letting them lean on potions. He threw himself into hospital work to treat patients, but the relentless shifts and crushing heartache drained him fast. He'd almost bulldozed through the backlog of requests. His ingredient supply was bleeding dry. He might have to trek back home for the first time in ages just to restock. Or he'd be forced to turn away every new request. Rafe burst into the Adventurers Guild and declared he'd completed the requests. Amelia burst in and thrust a sealed letter at him, a direct request from a high-ranking noble. Wrath ripped into the request. Amelia snapped that it was from the Radium family, the same ones he'd turned down before. He tensed at the thought of refusing again, but Amelia said they were waiting outside to escort him. The Radium family is about to burst onto the scene. One of the kingdom's 4 great noble houses, born of an ancient, honorable bloodline tied to the country's founders, didn't just support the royal family, they ran sprawling affairs, from overseeing vast estates and steering foreign relations to pulling strings with the Adventurers Guild. Amelia tossed him a fierce good luck, and Wrath answered with a warm, reassuring smile. He just wanted to bolt home and crash into bed, anything but face their mansion. Wraith scoured the mansion's exterior, his eyes mapping every crack and shadow. The maid flashed a welcoming smile and briskly ushered him inside. She hammered on the door, declaring rates meant to rival. Wraith swallowed, wondering if the master would heed his words. The master's voice jolted his heart into a thunderous beat, and anxiety coiled tighter as they entered the room. A handsome young man strode forward and declared, "I am Will's Requiem." Rafe flashed a grin, dropped his name, and they slipped into easy, casual banter. Wrath wanted to bolt home instead of wasting time on small talk, and Will snapped upright, shrugged off formalities, and demanded whether Wrath intended to sell him an elixir. Wraith flashed a grin and refused outright. Will thrust a pouch of 300 gold coins at her. Ruth shook her head and refused him again. Even when Will thrust his family's support forward, Rates still refused. Will absorbed the firm's hard line on Rates, then ripped into a new question. Will shot the question, "Did you teach yourself alchemy?" Wraith paused, then admitted he'd had a mentor after Will pressed for the name. Rafe warned that knowing would accomplish nothing, then dropped the bomb. His teacher was the alchemist Luria. Will's eyes narrowed and he snapped, "Ruth, are you talking about the fallen hero?" Wraith's jaw dropped. The rumors had already seeped into the capital. Will flashed a knowing grin and said that if Wraith was Lurie's disciple, it explained a lot. He tipped his hat to Wrath, thanked him, and offered to summon a carriage to send him back. Wrath waved the offer away. He was already headed for another destination. Will's warm grin spread across his face as he shot out his hand and said he hoped they'd forge a strong, positive bond from here on. They locked hands in a firm, unspoken pact. Wrath stormed out of the mansion in the city. Requests swarmed Wrath without pause. He hadn't caught a breath, the endless demand stripping him down to a lone elixir, and after burning through nearly all his supplies, he set out that day to restock. He stepped outside and Sylvia and Laffey sprang into his path. Wrath's help sent Sylvia into the open, and when he spotted something clutched in her hand, he demanded to know what it was. She brandished the staff, declared it boosted her magic, then flashed a grin and revealed she was an adventurer. Curiosity gnawing at him, he leaned in and asked, "What's your adventure rank?" His jaw dropped when he learned Sylvia was S rank. He blurted out if they were heading on a mission, and laughing shrugged, saying they'd just come back from slaying a water dragon. In this world, monsters earn their rank by raw, brutal strength. With SS crowning the top and F scraping the bottom, the weakest dragon still roared in at S rank. It hit Ray. One dragon could raise an entire nation, and Sylvia, the one who'd branded him abnormal, was pulling off feats that proved she was just as extraordinary. Chat died and the girls bolted for Daisy's place. They pressed on, gripped by one burning question: where had their race come from, and had he ever truly been alone? He shot back that he had a mentor. He wasn't alone. She pressed, curious, saying Wrath was impressive but kept himself tight-lipped, and Lafay admitted they'd hardly told Wrath anything about themselves either. They smirked, imagining his jaw dropping the moment he found out they weren't actually sisters. Lathe braced himself, convinced he'd be floored by how shockingly different she once was from who she is now. Sylvia was a girl snatched by goblins who laughed as they hauled her away, and he cared for her. She could remember only her name, nothing else. Familyless and alone, she was swept up by Lafayette, who claimed her as a sister, and they began sharing a home. Sylvia convinced herself she depended on Lathe, but the moment proved the opposite. Lathe asked her to weave magic and haul their belongings to the carriage, a task that was usually child's play for her. She went rigid mid-breath, then crumpled to the ground. Confusion slammed into Lathe and worry coiled in his gut as he scrambled to grasp what was unfolding. Sylvia had expected the elixir to heal her, but her body refused to obey, frozen and useless. Lathe held her tight as she fretted about the luggage. Lackey brushed the luggage aside and begged for help with the rates. Wrath barreled toward Daisy's shop. He veered onto a different route and still arrived unscathed, each turn stitching the capital into his map. It was his first time stepping into Daisy's shop as a customer, and he couldn't imagine what awaited. He was sure Daisy would light up to see him, and he pictured her face before he could even enter, because the doors refused to open. Daisy flashed a dazzling grin as she welcomed the customer. The instant she saw him, her carefully crafted mask shattered. She scoffed that he'd never drop by unless she asked for something. He admitted his pantry was bare and he had to restock. Daisy realized he'd become a one-man lifeline, constantly pulling people back from the brink with his elixirs and relentless work. She demanded to know why he kept coming to her and shoved him to recognize his own worth, but the knot of it was far tougher than it looked. Wraith snatched up the ingredients he needed, Daisy announced, 2 silver coins, and smiled at him like he was an old regular. Wrath locked onto her practiced customer service smile. Daisy snapped, "What are you planning to make with those ingredients?" He blurted out he was mulling over making an appointment. She spat a warning, making those things would rile the herbalists, and if an alchemist like him produced better medicines, they'd be out of work. Wrath scoffed, unfazed. He'd already heard the herbalists hated his mentor. Daisy watched his indifference and snapped that the very adventure he'd saved had been attacked in a bizarre, unexpected spot. Wrath stood oblivious. The very man who'd snatched them from death didn't even realize. The attack ripped through a quiet corner that never known monsters, crashing down right beside an empty house. The wound he treated oozed venom and creeping rot, poison any monster could spit, rot only a handful could summon. Either an undead abomination had crawled from the grave or a deadly special weapon had been unleashed. Those were the only likely culprits. No one knew exactly why the monsters came. People believed they burst from pockets of dense, roiling mana. Strange things flare up now and then. Wraith snatched the ingredients and pushed out of the shop, and the instant he swung the door open, a rough hand clamped onto him and he yanked him. Lathe blurted sorry and yanked him along. He swore he'd explain it later. She hustled him into her home as Wrath rushed to examine Sylvia, who'd fallen ill again. Guilt tore Lathe apart, an S-ranked adventurer crushed by failing to save someone, and he spun to Wraith, voice raw as he prepared to beg for help. Wraith cut her off mid-plea, voice like steel. "Sylvia will be okay." He smiled and vowed he'd save her. Luffy gasped, thrust himself into a deep bow, and blurted out his thanks. Wrath revealed Sylvia couldn't move. Magic crystal disease had locked her in place. Magic crystal disease forced a person's own magical energy to crystallize inside their body, freezing them rigid. The elixir they'd given Sylvia only stalled that petrification. It didn't cure her. He'd never faced this illness before, but he could whip up a potion to treat it. He was missing the crucial ingredients. Luffy leaped up to fetch them, but Wrath confessed she couldn't tell the herbs apart. He dared her to follow him back to his house, swarming with monsters, but overflowing with the exact ingredients they needed. Lathe leapt at the chance to help. The crystallization had only taken hold in Sylvia's hands and feet, but it would crawl to her heart in roughly 7 days. Wrath warned Lathe she had about 7 days before the disease turned deadly, so they still had a thin window. They planned to leave the next morning. Wrath tore home, intent on making the necessary preparations. Lathe barred his way and thanked him, gratitude roaring from her. Wraith smiled, then spun on his heel and strode away. He labored relentlessly in his home laboratory. Wrath infused a poison antidote into an ointment and fused a monster-repelling potion with a healing draft. He slid the ring off his finger and slammed it down on the table. Next morning, Lathe roared up in a rumbling carriage. They leapt aboard and tore off to gather the herbs they still needed. Rafe barked, "Is anyone caring for Sylvia?" and Lathe shot back, "Amelia's watching over her." Rafe suspected Amelia had been roped in by Laffey's pleading. He could practically hear Laffey humbly begging her, and he couldn't imagine anyone better to keep Sylvia safe. After scanning Sylvia, a question ripped through Wrath. He'd traced the magic crystal disease back to the northeast, and that kind of thing never showed up in the capital. Wraith asked if Sylvie had ever been to the northeast. Laffey snapped that she hadn't, not once since they'd met. Lafayette finally dropped the bombshell: they weren't blood sisters. She snatched Sylvia out of the void after her memories vanished and with no family took her in. Wraith listened, rapt, while Lathe shrugged the words off like nothing, even though choosing that path so young had been a huge, life-defining risk. With her memories wiped clean, Sylvie might originally have hailed from the northeast. Lafayette swore he'd never forget, then snapped, "Where's Wraith's house?" Rafe grew up in a creaky wooden house farther down the road they traveled, an uncommon, solitary life in the forest where his mentor reared him, until she vanished mysteriously one day. Wrath's thoughts gnawed at him over his mentor's whereabouts, then they suddenly stumbled upon an injured man collapsed in the forest. Wraith tended his wounds and the man, eyes on the dark tree line, asked if they were heading into the forest. The moment they confirmed, he fired off a blunt warning, "Don't do it." The man gasped that a blood wolf had ambushed him and he barely escaped with his life. Lathe leaned in and demanded every detail about the monster. They thanked the man, then fired off the core reasons they had to keep going. At last they plunged into the forest Wraith called home. They strode forward. Monsters turned the road into a death trap, forcing them off the carriage. They crept forward in silence to stay hidden while Wraith hissed a warning to Lathe that monsters might be nearby. Lathe, an S-ranked adventurer, stood razor-sharp, poised to strike the instant danger moved, her eyes cutting across every shadow. They were halfway to his house with not a monster in sight, but Wrath's instincts screamed that one would leap from the shadows any second. A jagged chill slammed into his skull, and Laughing's warning ripped out just before death claimed him. Right before the blast detonated, Wrath twisted at the last heartbeat as the C-ranked blood wolf strike sliced the air inches from his face. It wasn't alone, they were boxed in, danger snapping shut around them. Wraith kept a calm front, admitting he'd seen this before while terror churned in his gut and he ached to bolt. Lathe caught his burning urge to flee, unleashed a ferocious assault on the wolves. She engineered Wraith's escape. He'd bolt into hiding while she held them at bay. She warned she couldn't take on that many while shielding him, and Wraith, worried sick for her, was removed. She cleaved through the walls, each cut a thunderclap that announced her raw strength. He bolted, uselessness clawing at his chest as he scrambled for a hiding spot while Lathy tore into the blood wolves. Humiliation crashed into Ray as he dove for cover, and without warning more bloodwolves erupted from the gloom. He bolted, tearing away from them. They swarmed in overwhelming numbers, moving at lightning speed. He tossed back a potion brewed to make animal-type monsters bolt. Brimming with conviction, he hurled it. The walls just breathed it in, then fell silent. They tore after him again, hot on his heels. He sprinted flat out, mind racing as he wondered why the potion had failed and concluded their sense of smell had been dulled. He flung the potion and doused their eyes. A homemade dye rigged to rip their sight away, if only temporarily. He hurled something that blasted their hearing and blacked out both sight and sound, leaving them reeling. Every muscle burned, yet desperation hurled him onward. He had to find Laffey. Something plummeted from the tree. He leaned on him and startled him. While Laffey, having felled the wolves, tore through the underbrush hunting him. A suspicious sound sliced the silence. They darted toward it, instincts roaring that trouble lurked. Wraith spat a string of curses and bolted as a skeleton wreathed in flames gave chase. He zeroed in. Skeletons had no senses, so potions and dyes meant nothing. This 2-meter-plus colossus brandished a tree-felling sword, terrifying yet undone by holy water. Armed with only 3 vials, Wraith knew they'd barely stall it. He hatched a bolder plan. He flung something at the skeleton and it struck true. The thing staggered like he'd actually landed a hit. More potions followed, forged with his compress and driven by raw agitatability. It was Kachina, one splash of water, and it snapped into a relentless adhesive. Laffey hunted for Wraith, relentless and burning with purpose. He spots the smoke from earlier flaring back up. Wrath froze the skeleton for a heartbeat, but he couldn't fight it. It tore free and charged after him again. He had to break free and race to find Laffey. Wraith tore away from the skeleton until its clatter vanished, then ignited a smoke signal. He crushed the dye-rich fruit core, shoved it into a pot, and slammed his alchemy into it until the vessel burst into a billowing gas. He misfired an alchemy process most alchemists steer clear of on purpose. He knew the theory, but this was his very first attempt. He melted into the shadows, planning to lie in wait for Lafay and eyeing a tree to climb for the perfect vantage. The skeleton's massive sword came crashing down. He shattered his resistance ring, obliterating his final defense. Wraith reeled, losing his ring, and being blindsided by that sudden attack knocked him flat. He knew he could have wrung more time from it if he'd used it smarter. His tricks were gone and his energy was bleeding out. Everything screamed that this was the end for him. The skeleton lunged forward, closing in at the very last heartbeat. Lathe burst in and unleashed her crush ability, pulverizing the creature. Lafay rushed to Frith, checked he was okay, and his sudden blush made her giggle at his total lack of fear. He demanded to know if she'd lost her sword, and she shot back that she'd hurled it straight into the skeleton's arm moments earlier. When they looked, the skeleton was knitting its bones back together. Lafay was staring down disaster. She snapped at Wrath to stay back, then stepped forward to face the skeleton alone. He swore she'd won the she. She unleashed everything she had, but it still stood. The skeleton unleashed crackling arcane energy. She ripped through its enchantment, smashing its magic with raw, unrelenting force. She unleashed her fracture skill in a brutal strike, blasting Rafe into her arms where he landed, cradled like a princess. Carried like a trophy by a girl like that, he swore he'd never marry. Lafayette barked their only option was to bolt. They couldn't beat the skeleton, and she shot a question at him. Did he know the way to his house? Ray snapped to focus. They had to snag the ingredients he needed. He grabbed her arm and barreled forward as the skeleton thundered in pursuit. The skeleton lurched to a halt and unleashed a guttural, rattling growl. Wrath strained to figure out what it was doing. And he witnessed walls of blood surge up and slam together. He screamed to Laffy that the skeleton was summoning more bloodwolves. She braced to fend them off while sprinting, holding him tight. Blood wolf pounced, fangs bared and bloodlust blazing in its eyes. But she cleaved it with him still cradled in her arms. Wraith gaped again when he asked. Laughter's instincts prickled. He'd sensed something. He swore the blood walls weren't alive. She feared the skeleton was puppeteering the corpses, and she jabbed a finger at the crawling shadows they cast. They realized invisible magic was puppeteering them. This was necromancy. Magic seized the corpses, muting any stench, and it was Wraith's first time watching a skeleton wield magic like that. Among monsters, magic was rare. Only a handful, like dragons whose breath sparked arcane storms, could wield it. Commanding corpses was a dark art mastered only by the realm's mightiest mages. If they ranked that skeleton, it'd rocket straight to the top. Rafe snapped, "What are you going to do?" Latte snapped they had to fight it, ordering him to snatch what he needed while she pinned the attackers back. They were only steps from his house. They sprinted flat out and slammed into their destination. Lackey planted him at the threshold. He bolted inside as she tore into the wolves. Years of abandonment had caked the house in dust, but when he saw it still standing, not smashed to ruins, relief slammed into him. Wraith's materials lurked in the basement. Everything sat intact. Temptation clawed at him, but he snatched only what he needed. Those materials, for which he gambled his life to gather, would later prove invaluable. He locked onto a sword, and it slammed him back to the day his mentor sent him to gather ingredients. The brutal beating slammed back into him. He snarled that he'd nearly died, then exploded at his mentor for nearly getting him killed. She breezed up, tossed a casual hello as if the dust clinging to him were invisible, then barked, "Store the ingredients properly." He limped back, battered and bruised. Stunned she actually said that, and he hadn't even heard there were undead. She'd said nothing, then slapped on an adorable act, batting her eyelashes and claiming she too had no clue about the undead. She scoffed that the undead were child's play, just toss holy water and they're finished. Wraith snapped that he couldn't wield magic like she could. If he tried, they'd tear him to shreds before he could even splash a single drop. She sneered he'd be a fillet, not minced meat, a petty label that meant nothing if he died. Then she pressed a sword into his hands as a gift. She'd forged it ages ago and never once used it. When she finally drew it, the blade shredded the undead. Wraith lacks swordsmanship skills. Back in the present, he snatches the sword and locks eyes with his unreliable mentor, desperate for any guidance. He froze for a heartbeat as the idea struck. Hand the sword to Lafay. He'd barely stepped outside when the house behind him groaned, buckled, and crashed down into a thunderous pile of rubble. Lathe lunged forward, panic clawing at her as she frantically checked if he was okay. Wrath roared at her, fury igniting over the ingredients he'd worked so hard to gather. He thrust the sword into her hands, proclaiming it could take down their enemy, then confessed in a trembling whisper that he hadn't forged it. The sword floated in his hand, featherlight. Lackey swung and slammed it into the skeleton. Regeneration betrayed the skeleton. She slashed with ruthless precision, her sword struck true and the skeleton recoiled and fled. Determination blazing, Lafay hurled himself onto it before it could vanish and tore it apart. Wraith gaped in stunned silence while Lathe shrugged modestly. Her S-rank wasn't empty bragging, she said, and she credited the victory to the sword forged from the skeleton's own bones. After the battle, a massive, pulsating magic gem erupted from the ground. These gems, crystallized magical energy, are the beating hearts of arcane devices, usually buried inside mighty monsters as living power cores. Wrath had never laid eyes on one before, yet he'd always dreamed of harnessing one for his alchemy. Such gems were almost never traded, so this was his first real shot, and seizing the gem and the ingredients they'd been hunting was a crushing triumph. Devastation ripped through Wrath as the precious materials he'd buried beneath his ruined house were swallowed by the wreckage. The loss tore through them, no turning back. They'd crushed the skeleton, seized the ingredients, and now had to sprint home. Barely 48 hours after Sylvia crumbled, Lafay and Wraith stormed into the capital. 5 days on the clock, that's all the time they had to treat Sylvia. Lathe barreled into the room to check on her sister Amelia and Sylvia, both curled up and fast asleep. Wraith dove into brewing the potion while Lackey tended her sister. Magical energy was crystallizing Silly's body into living crystal. Wraith raced to concoct a potion from monster ingredients to siphon that energy out. Vito's monster loomed. From the frozen north prowls an SS-ranked monstrosity that rips magical energy from its victims and devours it. One touch yanked your energy away, handlers lost control, were drained dry and died, so anyone handling a Vito had to don magic-isolating gloves or they'd black out. Wraith's mentor had butchered those creatures to fuel her experiments, and he scavenged her leftovers for his own use. He soaked the Vito back to life, poured in water, cranked up the heat, and watched it purify as it sublimated into vapor. Unlike regular potions, medicinal brews cast aside the usual components, everything hinged on one decisive step: sublimation. They weren't trying to power it up, they aimed to snuff out the Vito's energy siphon, a precision only master alchemists could pull off deliberately. Rafe zeroed in, banking on his abilities, and with Lafayette watching, the room burst into light. Lafayette watched Wrath work, jaw-dropping at his mastery as understanding slammed into him. They charged him with treating Sylvia. After a storm of fierce moments, the potion shimmered ready. Sylvia only had to gulp it down. Seeing her asleep, Wraith refused to jolt her awake. He planted himself at the table and dozed until morning. He shot awake at dawn, snatched the potion, and bolted straight to Lafay. He caught sight of her and snapped, "Where's Amelia?" Lathe shot back that Amelia had just gone home after caring for Sylvia. He bellowed to Laffy that he'd finished crafting the potion. Joy hit her so hard a single tear slipped from her eye. Grinning, they knocked on Sylvie's door and stepped into her room. Ones clung to Sylvia from head to toe. Latvian Wraith bolted to her side and wraithed. Wraith's eyes hardened as he examined her. The disease was racing past every estimate. He shoved the potion into Sylvia's hand and snapped, "Drink." She fought with everything she had, but the wounds refused to vanish. Alarm jolted Laffy. She blurted, "What's wrong?" Wraith 3 flashed a steady grin and swore the potion worked. Progress inched forward, and worry had no hold when results didn't arrive instantly. Wraith barked at Sylvia not to use her magic until he gave permission, then fired his scan across her and watched her magic calm into a steady flow, proof the potion had worked. A triumphant smile split his face as he declared her life no longer at risk. He urged them to rest and take the day easy. Relief slammed into Lathe when Wraith spoke, worry for Sylvia still gnawing at them, and their legs folded as the pent-up tension finally snapped. The moment Wrath slipped out the door, they burst into a wild, whooping celebration, cheers and high fives everywhere. He exhaled, content Laffay's place had seen him through the day. A cold truth slammed into him: he needed a proper space to lay out his ingredients and potions. The Inweraith state cramped him with rules, and that tight space could keep him from treating some patients effectively. He insisted on a cavernous workspace, isolating himself so his work never disturbed a single soul. He stepped into Daisy's shop but couldn't hide it. His gaze kept drifting, his mind clearly miles away. She leaned in and asked what was on his mind. He murmured, eyes soft, that her shop felt impossibly peaceful. Just days ago he gambled his life foraging for materials in the forest, hunted by a towering skeleton and a pack of blood wolves. Daisy's heart slammed into her throat. Was that skeleton the monster that had attacked an adventurer the Wraith had saved? Shock slammed him. Guildrovers said 2 people had spotted a giant skeleton in a forest supposedly free of monsters, and it didn't add up. Daisy demanded the skeleton's fate, and Wraiths shot back that they'd crushed it. They heaped most of the credit for the effort onto the adventurer and him. Daisy snapped, "Who is it?" Her gaze slammed onto the skeleton. It was clearly at least a plus rank. Wrath tore the secret loose. He was with Lafay. Daisy's eyes went wide. Lafay was the youngest S-ranked adventurer. Daisy's jaw dropped. Wrath already knew someone that famous, and he'd only been in the capital for less than 6 months. By morning, Soviet had rallied, stronger, steadier, unmistakably much improved. Her mana flow surged back to perfect health, and she stood fully restored. Sylvia flung herself into Wraith's arms, squeezing him and choking out a torrent of grateful thanks, while Wraith exhaled with a relieved laugh, telling her it had all worked out. Wrath announced the guild was buzzing with talk about the skeleton they'd fought. Sylvia revealed she'd been handed a morning request to slay a monster in the very forest by the capital they'd just visited. Wraith froze when the request called her by name, then blurted that the client was the head of the Radium family, one of the 4 great noble families. Recognition slammed into Ruth. She knew that man. Sylvia declared she'd already defeated the skeleton, laughing uncontrollably. A blood wall might still be looming, and they're ready to haul the skeleton incident straight to the guild. Ruth leapt in to join her. She needed the magic gem to prove the defeat, and Sylvia wanted to come along. The trio thundered toward the guild, and Wraith's gaze snagged on the city's riot of shops as the others grinned and promised to show him the weapon shop next time. They halted at a glittering jewelry shop, and Sylvia's gaze snagged on a necklace she ached to buy for Lafay. Wrath rifled through the accessories, eyeing a replacement for his shattered ring. Sylvia, desperate to snag something that could heal her, shot him a quick, "Want anything?" Sylvia unleashed an irresistible smile, and Ruth answered by flashing a ring. He almost picked another trinket, but she insisted on the ring. Sylvie smiled and said a necklace wishes for safety, while a ring carries a different, far more personal meaning, and she blushed. Presents clutched tight, the group barreled into the guild where Amelia had gone. Felt a surge of joy at the sight of Sylvia, healthy and whole. They erupted, showering Amelia with fierce gratitude for her care. Warmth exploded through Wrath, ignited by the fierce closeness they shared. Amelia barreled the question at Lappy, eyes blazing, "Are you here about the monster request?" Lafay roared they'd beaten it, and everyone dove into the forest, foraging frantically for ingredients to heal Sylvia. Amelia gaped at their feet, spellbound, as Wrath brandished a pulsing magic gem he'd pulled from the skeleton. The aftermath screamed S-rank. Only an S-ranked adventurer could have felled a monster that fearsome, and Amelia, aware of Lathe's raw strength, urged her to rein herself in before she collapsed. She crushed all doubt and proved the gem genuine. It was only a scheme to report it to the Radium family, and the reward arrives in 3 days. Lappy thrust the entire reward into Wrath's hands, brushing off his protests. She'd risked everything for Sylvia, not for coin, so she insisted Wrath take the reward for vanquishing the skeleton. Wraith relented, swallowed by the glittering avalanche of 200 gold coins. They kept pushing him to open a shop. They commanded the shop, never once daunted. Wrath hammered it out with Daisy, then decided to build a workshop instead. To an alchemist, the workshop was holy ground, a sacred sanctum where experiments could roar to life without interruption. Like other alchemists, Wrath craved that private refuge. Out in the forest, he locked his experiments away in an underground workshop, but in the capital, the grind of daily life and the squeeze of finances yanked his focus. Flush with fresh funds, he could finally build one. He burst into Daisy's shop and unveiled his workshop plans. Daisy's eyes flared with curiosity at his sudden decision. With his sudden fortune burning a hole in his pocket, Wrath chased his dream and sought her help because she was well connected, confessing he had no clue where to find skilled craftspeople and relying on the resourceful Daisy to point the way. Flattery flooded Daisy as she noticed Wraith's master had carved out her own workshop, a rare, jaw-dropping feat. Daisy grinned, promised to hook him up with capable people, and practically leapt at the chance to join the project. Wrath hadn't expected her to get involved. He'd already chosen someone else to craft the workshop. Daisy's expression clouded as she pressed that her help was for his own good, and Wraith, thrown by her reclusive air, swallowed his protests and fell silent. Despite his worry about leaving the shop unattended, Daisy pressed him forward, snapping that she'd already closed up for the afternoon. As they walked, Daisy leaned in and pressed Wrath for the name he had in mind. He replied, Sylvia Laffey's sister. Daisy, unfamiliar with the woman, scoffed that Wraith had to be out of his mind to even think of calling an S-rank for help. Wraith shot back that it wasn't his idea. When he asked about the workshop builder, Daisy snorted and branded them a certified eccentric. Wrath scoffed at the eccentricity. Knowing Daisy, he shrugged off her wild antics. Skidded to a stop with her at a plain, ordinary house. They knocked and a beaming woman flung the door wide, joy exploding from her smile. She lunged at Daisy, sweeping her into an ecstatic hug even as Daisy demanded to be released. Wrath stared, stunned by the oddity, and Daisy snapped, ordering her to stop. Tears streaking her cheeks, she poured out her love for Daisy, and Daisy shut her down with an icy, soul-crushing rejection. Her gaze snapped to Wrath as he stepped forward and gave his name. She was Nicola, and she watched him like someone who'd already heard his name. Wrath declared his burning determination to build a workshop and revealed Daisy had vouched for her to handle the task. Nicola lit up at Daisy backing Wraith's request to create a workshop and bullying a sheet of paper forward, asked if it would be his first. Wrath smirked, claiming he'd pulled one off before and knew every requirement. This time he vowed to rig it right inside the two-story building he called home. He dropped the bomb that he'd already built a prototype and wanted the workshop designed around it. His budget sat at 200 gold coins, but he could squeeze out a little extra if pushed. Nicola's grin flashed, the budget opened 1,000 doors and she turned to Wraith, snapping, "What's your plan for the workshop?" Wraith declared it would be used mainly to brew potions and craft magical devices. He slammed a pulsing magic gem into her hands and asked if it could power the workshop. Nicola's face lit with admiration as she told Wraith to show her the workshop site he'd picked, saying they'd hammer out the costs once she'd seen it. They waited as she grabbed her things. In the lull, Wrath fired a question at Daisy about Nicola, and Daisy said they'd met back when she was an adventurer and had kept in touch ever since. Wrath's jaw hit the floor when he discovered Daisy had been an adventurer. Nicola came back and they strode toward the sprawling site of the Wraith's Plan Living Workshop. Nicola darted inside, scanned the place with keen eyes, ripped together a quote on the spot and zeroed in on the magic gem. She blurted, "Use it to store magical energy," and Wraith staggered. Magic gems were normally embedded in devices as components, not repurposed as energy storage the way Nicola proposed. She warned that Wrath's workshop was packed with enchanted gadgets that sapped him dry whenever he kept them powered, and locking their magic into a gem would let him snap any tool to life instantly. Magical devices ravenously devoured power, so stashing a reserve would make dealing with those that drained energy non-stop far easier, Wrath agreed. Nicola declared they'd kick off the workshop setup in about a week. Her tone snapped. She pressed Wrath about his relationship with Daisy. A cold shiver ripped through Ray as every instinct screamed for him to flee the sudden tension. Nicola clamped his hand around his throat before he could speak, and Daisy jumped in, insisting they shared a fierce bond while keeping the teacher-student detail to herself and saying Wrath had been teaching her all sorts of things. Trembling, Wrath realized her explanation rang hollow. Nicola, skin drained of color, stormed up to Wrath and snarled that if he ever laid a hand on Daisy, he'd answer for it. Wraith vowed he'd never do such a thing. Nicole's shoulders dropped, she brightened instantly and smiled like nothing had happened. She swept Daisy into a fierce hug and kissed her, cheerfully announcing she was heading home as Daisy scrambled to fend off the sudden burst of affection. After Nicole left, Wraith's eyes skittered, unsure where to land. He pressed Daisy, did she really intend to come back next week, and she stood her ground unshaken. She laughed, admitting Nicola's relentless affection was untamable, then hugged Ruth and thanked her for the day. Cut to the next scene, Wrath and Lathe strode side by side as she fired off a sharp question: what was he shopping for? He grinned and vowed to snap up anything that caught his eye: shelves, tools, trinkets to outfit the workshop's interior, then laughed and asked how the workshop was coming along. Wraith shot back that it would all come together, then whipped out a flower clip end. They draped it over Laffey. Heat surged to her cheeks as she insisted she couldn't pull off anything that feminine. The shopkeeper zeroed in on Wrath and Lathe, grinned, asked if they were out on a shopping day and tossed them a discount. They immediately blurted, "We're not dating." Rafe dove into his shopping, snatching the things he wanted while Lathe waited for him to finish. They'd grab dinner ingredients next, so Rafe asked whether Soltia and Lathe had anything they liked. Lath shrugged, claiming no particular tastes. Sylvia's eyes lit up for sweets. When Wraith declared that girls Sylvia's age always loved sweets, Lacking scoffed at how ancient he sounded. Wraith's heart tightened as Daisy's words echoed back, a sudden flash of sadness. They decided to make dessert and sprinted into Wraith's kitchen. In the kitchen, they sprang into action, carving, seasoning, and searing dragon meat. Wraith sprang to help, his blade biting in as the stubborn, sinewy meat refused to budge. Laffy demanded he chop the vegetables while she tackled the dragon meat, because dragon flesh fought every cut. Against all odds, they whipped up a mouthwatering feast. The soldier's eyes lit up at the spread. A die-hard fan of lactose-rich cooking, he lunged forward, craving every cheesy bite. Buzzing to try Wraith's dessert, they dove into dinner, trading easy banter after. Laffey and Wrath blasted through the kitchen dishes, and Laffey asked about Wrath's workshop any day. It was described as a workshop bristling with magical devices and shelves stacked with ingredients. She pictured odd items hiding in every corner because it was his workshop. After cleaning, he thanked them for the meal and slipped home. A week later, he returned to escort them home. Wrath stormed up to Nicolai and Daisy and declared he'd brought back up Sylvia. Sylvia stepped forward and introduced herself as Shyly. Her cuteness slammed into Nicola, nearly knocking them off their feet. Nicola's heart surged, aching to pull her into a hug, but she bit back the urge. This was their first meeting. Every time Daisy sized herself up against Sylvia, a twinge of jealousy jabbed at her. Sylvie revealed Wrath had singled her out to help, but doubt gnawed at her about what role she was meant to play. Nicola chuckled, mischief in his voice, and declared Sylvia didn't need to work hard, he and Daisy would cover for her. Daisy bounded up to Sylvia, eyes alight, and said she hoped they'd work well together. Daisy's charm crashed over Sylvia like a tidal wave, leaving her breathless. Sylvia leaned in and murmured to Wrath, eyes bright, "Isn't Daisy just the cutest?" Ray dropped Daisy's name like a grenade and revealed she was older than Sylvia. Panic slammed into Sylvia, forcing her into rigid formal speech. With everyone present, Wrath barked at Nicolette, "Are the preparations ready?" She clutched her magic bag, confirming everything they needed was inside. The bag bent reality, swallowing far more than its tiny shell suggested. A rare, priceless creation of advanced spatial sorcery, forged by master mages and never seen on any market. Nicola confessed a mage friend's spell pulled her across the finish line of that brutal collaboration. Wraith's jaw dropped, being asked to make something together slammed into him like a curveball. He had no idea what to do. He'd never tried it before, so he sought out a mage, imagining them fusing their talents to conjure something breathtaking. Work started, but Sylvia's focus shattered the moment Nicola came near. In the workshop, Nicola plunged her hand into a magic bag, pulled out furniture, and wove it into place with crackling spatial magic while Wraith stood wide-eyed, clearly impressed. Sylvia smirked and shot back, truly amazed. She pointed out that this kind of magic was standard fare for mages. She warned that spatial magic was a brutal labyrinth, no less complex than her own magic. Wraith, struck by a bolt of inspiration, sprang up with eyes blazing and asked Sylvia if she'd like to make a magic bag with him. Sylvia's grin exploded as she leapt into agreement, electric with excitement at the idea. Wraith nearly whooped. The idea of owning his own magic bag lit a wildfire of excitement inside him. They plunged into brewing potions while Nicholas assembled a humming magical device to store their ingredients. Preparing for any workshop, similar ingredients demand precise temperatures and humidity for storage. This critical step will make or break your entire prep. They split the jobs and plunged into the work together, moving like one unstoppable force. Having crushed his first task, Wraith dove headfirst into the second, and instantly spotted Daisy and Sylvia locked in conversation. Sylvia was deep in discussion when Daisy slammed her back to attention. "Focus!" she snapped, driving them to channel every ounce of magical energy into the skeleton's magic gem. Nicola labored alone, assembling the magical device, while Sylvia at the mage channeled crackling energy straight into the magic gem. Idle and burning with uselessness, Nicola snapped into action and plotted the workshop setup for the next day. As they geared up to forge enchanted devices, Nicola called out for ideas. They blurted it out, electric with eagerness to pitch their concept. He unveiled the magic circle he'd designed, and Nicola's interest ignited the moment his eyes landed on it. Daisy and Sylvia froze, bafflement crashing back over them. Sylvia's eyes widened. She'd never seen a circle like this before. Wraith snapped, "It's not for casting spells, it's meant for something else entirely." Impatience crackled in Daisy's voice as she snapped, "What's it for?" He revealed the circle was forged to craft magical devices through an alchemical pen process. By flooding it with a chosen enchantment, he could transmute ordinary accessories into true magical devices. He tethered the magic gem to the ritual circle, planning to siphon its power to fuel the spell and rocket the circles into existence. Magic circles are one-shot, they expend themselves forging a magical device and die the moment an artifact is born. Every new device needs a freshly drawn circle. A calculation suggested that pumping a constant surge from a magic gem into the circle would anchor it as a permanent, reusable conduit, but it would gulp down staggering amounts of energy. A skeleton's magic gem throbbed in their hands, crackling with the raw might of an S-ranked mage. Nicola saw promise in Wrath's plan, but he needed time to study the unfamiliar circle. Confusion plastered on their faces. Daisy and Sylvia watched Wrath and Nicola finish their discussion. Wrath cut in with a raw apology for shutting them out, then looked at Sylvia and asked if she wanted to craft the magic bag they'd been planning. He urged her to weave a special enchantment into the bag exactly as Nicholas instructed, his chest tightening at the thought it might all fail. Rafe snatched up the essentials: veto fluid, a battered bag, and a stubborn brush. He dipped the magic-infused fluid and painted a one-of-a-kind sigil onto the bag's surface, his first attempt a brutal scrap with every stroke. Daisy and Sylvia held their ground, patient as weathered stone. Sylvia snatched control and slammed a spatial expansion spell into the circle, forcing the runes to swell and the space itself to bulge outward. She barked at everyone to fall back, then unleashed the ritual. When they finished, the room held its breath. Nobody knew if it had worked. Wraith slammed the bag, testing its strength. The interior yawned wide, staggering in its vastness. Triumph glinted within reach, but Wraith's gut screamed that something was wrong. Without warning, liquid gushed from the bag. A spherical vortex erupted into being, spinning outward and ballooning larger by the second. Daisy clutched Wraith's foot as the sphere's pull yanked them inward. Sylvia unleashed a crackling surge of magic that slammed the absorption to a halt, sparing everyone from injury. The expanding sphere tore through the house, cracking walls and shattering everything nearby. After slumping down and gasping to fill their burning lungs, they locked in. Contacting Nicola was the best move. Sylvia's magic blasted to life perfectly, the real problem sprang from the flawed magic circle Nicola had drawn. It was his first attempt. He probably botched the containment marks meant to lock the bag's spatial expansion inside. The faulty circle tore itself apart, catapulting the expansion outward in a violent, explosive blast. It zeroed in to assess the damage first, storming into the workshop's core, the largest room nearest the entrance, that held the magic gem and most of the enchanted devices. Other rooms probably lay wrecked too, and guilt scorched Wrath for causing the mess. Nicola burst in and declared the original plan dead. He swallowed the setback and swore he'd use every one of them. He drained his savings dry to forge the finest workshop possible. A few days later, the damage was gone, wiped away by non-stop repairs. Outside, the workshop's exterior hit you like a punch, gleaming, massive, and utterly impossible to ignore. Curiosity burning, he darted inside to see if Nicola had finished the request. He burst into the room and his eyes snagged on permanent magic circles siphoning power from the magic gem, supercharging the workshop's magical device production, every piece forged from mithril, a durable, ultra-conductive metal. They weren't complete. Nicole declared the circles still lacked their final markings, so she'd crafted only 5 modest-sized ones to keep the space from choking with clutter. Mithril crackled with unmatched magical conductivity, the perfect pick, but its scarcity and savage temper after the trials made it a nightmare to work with. Daisy had already said it, Nicola's skill blew everyone away. She warned charging directly into mithril was too tough, so she shoved a custom-forged mithril tool into his hands. Once he finished, she'd link the circuits to the magic gem. Anxiety burned in Wraith. He swore he wouldn't repeat his earlier mistake, and as a veteran with magic circles he traced each sigil with surgical precision. The moment had come for Nicola to snap them together. She prowled with the gem in hand, her restless pacing baffling Wrath. Curious, Wrath blurted, "What are you doing?" She told him she was using magic to form the circuit, and when he asked to watch, she agreed. He shot the question at her: had she, like Daisy, ever been an adventurer? She smirked and teased that Daisy must have mentioned a love story. He snapped back, flatly denying it. Nicola burst out that she'd once hunted Daisy down, the same Daisy who'd flat-out refused to join any adventuring party. Nicola's heart slammed into his throat the second he saw her. When Wrath asked why she'd given up adventuring, she explained. She dove headfirst into crafting, driven by one person who ignited a fierce, soul-deep spark. This person became the fierce guide who steered her through every twist of her crafting journey. She radiated beauty on the surface and harbored a razor-sharp mind and iron will inside. Nicola ached to emulate her. Wraith demanded her name and she proclaimed she was Luria, the kingdom's legendary hero and Wraith's mentor. Wrath, Luria's disciple, snapped at Nicola to stop worshipping Luria, leaving Nicola stunned. When she caught wind that Luria had a charming apprentice, she cornered him and demanded Luria's whereabouts. He only shrugged. He didn't know. Nicola swore he'd claw his way back to Luria, and when Wrath saw that blaze in his eyes, he stepped back and said nothing. They finished, the work was complete. Nicola coaxed the magical devices into flawless operation, and Wraith unleashed them in a barrage of tests, each one cleared. She urged him to reach out the moment he felt dissatisfied or needed more help. Daisy and Sylvia burst in, curiosity sparking at the commotion, and Wraith practically vibrated as he shouted that the magic circles were functioning. A triumphant final clang rang out, announcing his workshop was finally finished. Later, Luffy caught wind of the news and fired off a question about the workshop. Wraiths beamed. It was fantastic. Amelia cut him off. She'd been waiting for him and thrust something into his palm. He assumed it was a letter, but she snapped that it wasn't. The royal family's command crashed down like an iron decree. Next chapter, Luria bursts onto the scene. He grappled with a hulking monster while coolly sipping his drink like it was nothing. She tore through the streets the instant she heard Wrath had set foot in the capital. At 7, Wrath stared up at Luria and demanded to know how she became so formidable. She locked onto him and grilled him about alchemy's most important principle. He shot back, knowledge. Luria snapped that something mattered far more than knowledge. Practical experience. She shoved him before the hulking monster and ordered him to snatch a fruit from beside its nest. They treated it like child's play for a 7-year-old while his terrified screams ripped through the air. Dream ripped through Wraith. He snapped awake and careened off his chair. His combined living and working space swallowed most of his time, and crashing mid-alchemy work became routine. Life now felt like a breeze after surviving the merciless grind of his mentor's training. Faint knot of unease tightened in his chest at the royal family's letter. A blunt royal summons demanded his presence at the castle in 3 days. Wraith wouldn't think of refusing the royal family's call, but a cold knot tightened in his gut. They hadn't said what they wanted from him. A dream of his mentor slammed into him, jolting him awake, her face surfacing for the first time since he'd arrived in the capital. A flicker of worry that his mentor might drop by stabbed at him, but he brushed it off as overthinking, ran through his morning routine, then strode out to go shopping. Every morning he stormed into his workshop and ignited alchemy that forced plants to explode into lush growth. A surge of joy hit him as he remembered those plants had once been nothing but scrawny, barely their sprouts. He lined up his tools with ruthless precision, snapped the box shut, and bolted out the door to go shopping. Ray yanked a letter from his mailbox. It was from Looms, which it slammed into him like a thunderclap, freezing him in place. He snapped awake and checked again. This wasn't a dream, the sound was coming from the Looms. He barreled over to Lafayette and Sylvia and demanded an emergency meeting. A terrible crisis was unfolding. Lathe snapped, "Is this about the royal family's request?" Wrath's voice went cold. "No, it's far worse." Girls crackled with excitement, then Wraith announced his mentor was coming. They erupted into laughter. Lafay teetered, torn, plan a party or play it safe. Wraith panicked, snapped that he had to flee immediately. Terror clawed through him because she knew his address and he feared his peaceful life would be ripped away. Lafay barked, "Relax." He clocked how strange his mentor was but wondered if he really had to go to such extremes to dodge her. Wraith insisted a reunion only warms hearts when mentor and disciple actually have a real bond. His mentor, though, was awful and completely lacking in common sense. Lafay blurted out that his mentor wanted to see him, so he could go meet her. Wraith snapped that living with her meant he cooked every meal, scrubbed every mess, washed every load, and stared down death every day. He refused to step back into that nightmare. Luria snapped into existence in the room, grinning as she greeted Wraith. And her presence slammed into the room so hard that even 2 high-ranking mages froze, their eyes snapping to her. The air snapped tight as Wraith, stumbling over his words and cheeks burning, blurted that he had urgent business. Luria clamped a hand on his shoulder, slid down beside him, and said it had been ages since they'd last met. Catching sight of Lafay and Sylvia, Luria jabbed Wrath with a wicked grin and taunted, "So you're the sort who sweeps cute girls off their feet." If anyone claimed they were his girlfriends, Wrath snapped, they were just friends. He tore into her for being rude to strangers, grinning as he quipped that her attitude was exactly why she was still single. Luria froze for a heartbeat, a mischievous grin splitting his face as he declared something was on it, then he flicked his nose. A single flick catapulted Wrath skyward, his body drifting like a tossed feather. The girl froze, jaw dropping as Luria's raw power slammed into her. Lathe snapped, "Who are you?" Luria's aura snapped into steel as she revealed herself. "I am Wraith's mentor, the legendary Mimi." Lathe and Sylvia stepped forward and introduced themselves. Wraith demanded why she had come to the capital, and Luria, speaking as an acquaintance, laid out exactly how to assign a task to her. She yanked the royal family's letter free from the hidden folds of her clothing. Wrath's breath hitched, she realized she actually had human connections. Luria owned up to her royal ties, scoffed at the fallen hero they'd nicknamed after her, and kept showering Rui with praise. Realization slammed into Sylvia and she blurted, "Am I Luria James, the one who drove back the dragon horde that attacked the capital and helped rebuild it?" Minnie gaped that a young girl knew her, hailed as the greatest mage. Wraith spun to Laffy, shot the question at her, and she nodded true. Luria demanded an outrageous compensation, free drinks at every tavern in town, and Wraith, knowing Luria cared little for coin, wondered if they'd picked the wrong person. Lathe explained Luria demanded free drinks across the capital, draining every bar for 3 days and nights, delaying reconstruction celebrations. Wraith's eyes snapped wide, he knew it was her. Sylvia spilled how he'd saved her life and Luria smirked at him. Wrath said he'd gotten the same royal summons and pressed Luria would she accept it. Luria shot back that it depended on the task. The letter only vaguely told her to come. Suspicion roared in Wraith's. Why had they buried details from his mentor? Luria offered to teach Sylvia magic during their stay, and she lit up. Wrath felt a warning claw at his throat, "Don't get attached," but Sylvia's sparkling excitement froze him and he swallowed the words. He smirked. Sylvia's S-ranked venture status meant she could storm even a dragon's nest. Luria vowed to begin training at first light tomorrow. Wrath excused himself and slipped away while Laffy and Sylvia set off to tackle their own task. Wrath locked eyes with Luria and asked what she'd do next. She had no plan, so she fell in step behind him. They headed straight for his workshop. She beamed she liked it. Daisy, fuming at Wraith's tardiness, snapped, "Who is Luria?" Luria proclaimed her name. Daisy snapped, "Am I the fallen hero?" Luria confirmed, and Daisy's piercing stare pinned her to the spot. Wrath jabbed the question at Daisy, "Do you have time?" She revealed she'd snagged a rare ingredient that would take far longer to process. Daisy locked eyes with Luria and demanded, "What's your purpose?" Luria leapt forward, vowing to help and atone for stalling Daisy's discipline, and Daisy accepted. He flashed a rare southern plant at them, both a kitchen secret and a trusted folk medicine. Luria leaned in, voice razor-sharp, "How will this be used in Daisy's medicine kit?" The moment Luria confirmed they had enough materials, she leapt into action and launched the process. She explained that current trapped heat and wiped out bacteria, but a single slip in its preparation could summon a nasty stench and doom it to be unsellable. Skilled at wielding it with magic, Luria radiated fierce confidence. Daisy gasped and Wraith stared in awe. Luria asked for magic bottles, calling them perfect for storage, but Wraith was still crafting them. Luria snatched her own bottles and snapped her fingers, several of them popped into the room. Daisy gaped, astonishment written all over her face. She craved praise, but Daisy never doled it out. Wrath noticed their mentor fused alchemy with magic. Their methods clashed with his like fire against ice. The first time Daisy watched someone fuse spatial and control magic in a single motion, she slammed Wraith and Luria together in her head. Wraith snapped, insisting he hadn't touched a drop, then shouldered his responsibilities. Practicality burned in her veins, leaving Luria in the dust. Luria flashed a cocky grin and declared elixirs spilled from his hands as easily as breathing. Ray blurted she'd been brewing elixirs just to wipe out her bar tabs. Daisy watched them spar, shot a glance at the bottles, and realized both were selling themselves short. The next chapter kicks off with Ruth glaring and demanding to know why Luria was tailing him. She shrugged it off like it was nothing, declaring that visiting a disciple's workshop was a mentor's responsibility. Ruth finally gave in and let her stay since she'd finished the day's tasks. Luria was relentless, hounding him at every turn. He pleaded, "Don't wander off so much." Reluctance knotted her, but she relented and agreed. She pressed him about opening a shop and he admitted he was weighing the idea, still undecided. Luria shoved his orders aside the moment she stepped in, prowled the place and peppered everything with questions. She grabbed trinkets, whooped as she swung in the hammock, and fired questions at anything that caught her eye. Wrath's chest tightened. Would she stay in the kingdom? She met him with a firm, unshakable "I will." Reality slammed him. He'd be the one cooking, hauling her laundry, and cleaning her messes all over again. A bitter cloud swallowed Luria's mood, but he forced a grin and convinced himself he was thrilled to move back in with his mentor. She asked for alcohol. Wraith snapped, reminding her of his age. He snapped, "Where have you been?" She grinned, saying she was out collecting ingredients and visiting friends. Her translocation magic, devastatingly powerful, devoured her energy, so she couldn't use it often. Curiosity flared in Luria. He leaned in as Wrath revealed monsters had swarmed his old home and his coins had dried up, so he was forced to hawk potions. Ever since he left that house, life beat him down, and now his mentor's iron expectations and the crown's pressing demands are closing in from both sides. Wraith slammed a pot on the counter and said he'd cook, but Luria flat-out refused and admitted she couldn't, and Wraith gaped. She who commands alchemy and magic couldn't even boil water. Her lone attempt at cooking left Wrath doubled over, clutching his gut in a merciless stomachache, the final proof she was hopeless in the kitchen. While Wrath stirred the pot, Lurie slipped through the other rooms, memories crashing over him as he realized just how much he'd grown. She burst into the freezing room, recoiled as if slammed by ice, and bolted straight back out. Suspecting Sylvia had enchanted it, Wraith couldn't use magic. She burst into the final room. The last room swallowed the light, dark, damp, and at first utterly empty. Luria's eyes flashed with suspicion. She squared her shoulders and readied herself to pounce on the thief. Her scream tore the air. Wraith launched himself toward her. I kept finding her, tears streaking down her face as time wore on. Bugs swarmed across every surface, and he revealed they were worth a fortune. They spun unique threads that could shrug off magical enhancements, and Wraith pushed to turn simple things, shoes and bags, into little charms to lift Luria's spirits. Right after dinner he leaned in, eyes blazing, and implored her to help with the project. Mid-bite he tossed the task into the conversation and snapped, "Don't talk with your mouth full." He revealed they had to forge a magical device, and Luria's jaw hit the floor when she learned Wrath couldn't build it himself. His voice tightened as he made it clear the task demanded magic, something he couldn't face alone. She flashed a confident grin and told him to trust his mentor. Wrath grinned at her fire, then cut her off. She didn't need to unleash her full power. That could obliterate the capital by dawn. She pressed him about the project. He cracked a grin and confessed they were building a bag that warped space to hold many items. Luria seized the spatial magic, ripping open pockets of space to bend the battlefield to their will. Wraith clung to the hope she'd leap in to help the instant things went wrong. He hailed her mentorship as the power of 100 helpers and dropped that he'd use a brand new method to craft the bag. Hidden in the materials were threads torn from the bug that had jolted Luria earlier. They dwarfed Mithril in strength, siphoned magic like lightning, and laughed at any hand's attempt to snap them, able to hold a grown man's weight. He showed her the bag where he'd woven a magic circle into the threads. Luria gave the bag a final sweep, confirmed it was bug-free, and dove straight into the process. The moment she finished, Wraith fired. Did that work? Confidence burned in Lorien. He slid an item inside to test it. The bag worked. Luria grinned, eyes narrowing as she waited for his inevitable cheeky remark. But his mind's fixed on her. It hit her like a punch to the heart. Tears streamed down her cheeks. A sudden impulse hit her and she fired off a bold invite, "Join me for drinks." Wraith called him out as underage, shrugged, and offered him juice. His excuses crumbled on the spot. Later, Sylvie plunged into her first magic class, flanked by Luria and Wraith. They asked Luria if she had any teaching requests. She hesitated, then a daring idea surfaced: teach Sylvia spatial magic. Luria stepped forward and offered to teach Sylvia magic. Wraith rushed to join them, concern burning in his eyes, and Sylvia glowed with excitement. Lost in thought, Luffy jabbed Wrath with a blunt question, "You worried?" and snapped that his Sylvia wasn't some fragile thing. She then said private lessons from Luria, the hero who saved the city from giant dragons, were insanely rare, and as a swordsman she bitterly wished she could teach Sylvia herself. Wraith pressed, "Is this going to get ugly now that Sylvia's hurt?" Lathe confirmed it would. Luria's eyes flashed as she urged, "Begin with translocation magic." Spatial magic sharpened to a terrifying, godlike edge. She flashed a confident grin and insisted the challenge was nothing for Sylvia's talent, but doubt already flickered in Sylvia's eyes. Laffy scoffed that Luria had chosen translocation on a whim. Wrath agreed, flagged her impulsive streak and grudgingly conceded she could be reliable sometimes, which Laffy took as proof she could just as easily be unreliable. Luria proved translocation. One heartbeat she stood there, the next she blinked out and rematerialized on the far side of the room. Sylvia snapped her hands together, but expecting her to jump in right away was a pipe dream. Celeria guided Sylvia to the magic, took her hands, funneled the power through her, and Sylvia trembled as it flooded her. Luria pushed her to try. Sylvia froze, bewildered and unsure which step to take. Luria snapped his fingers and sewed the advantage. The room went dead silent, people gaped, eyes wide as dread seeped into every face. Sylvia burst back into the sky. She tumbled into Wraith's arms. He caught her, cradling her and breaking the fall. It hit like a gut punch. Luria was responsible. Wraith scolded her, then flashed a wicked grin and joked he'd plant a bug on her pillow that night so she'd regret it. Luria leans in, voice snapping. Sylvia, did you feel the magic during that experience? Sylvia confirmed she had. She picked that spot to cling to the sensation and warned that keeping the link between her target coordinates in mind was crucial while casting. They started with small things like one of Wraith's potions. She handed it to Sylvia, who managed to shift its location but then accidentally fired a shot. It shattered, but Luria snapped that despite the minor damage, the translocation had worked. No ordinary person could have pulled that off, and Sylvia just had to lock her focus on the connection. Lose focus and you'll rip whatever you're moving to pieces. Sylvia's curiosity snapped into a daring thought: what would happen if she tried moving a person? Luria smirked and casually shot back that they could split in two. The day's magic lesson ended with one triumphant cast. Every other attempt fizzled out. Lathe snapped, when did they meet? Luria revealed she first crossed paths with Wrath 7 years ago. A whirlwind of events ripped through their lives, and by age 10 Wrath had pledged himself as her disciple. Sylvia declared their meeting incredible, a thunderous clash of gifted minds. Lauren blurted she'd already known Wraith's parents, stunned they'd raised a child who turned out to be a prodigy in alchemy. Sylvia's brow nodded in confusion, and Wrath shot back that his parents were adventurers who could go toe-to-toe with Luria, yet not a single spark of their combat prowess lived in him. He couldn't fight to save his life. Alchemy flared in him like lightning, a rare, singular talent that made Luria take him under her wing. He confessed he might never have sworn himself to her if he'd seen her true colors back then. Sylvia practically exploded with joy when she met Luria. Luria's friends slid up to the girls and whispered something that sent them grinning straight at Wrath. He demanded to know what she'd said, and she confessed she'd told them that. He hurled razor words, yet a tender heart hid beneath his armor. She beamed and said Wraith sent her a birthday gift every single year, each one a quiet, unwavering testament to his kindness. That evening, Wrath came home and chaos hit him like a thunderclap. Luria gripped a bottle of liquor to her chest, knuckles white. Wraith tore the moments apart in his mind, hunting for the missing pieces of what happened earlier. Luria's voice broke as she implored to drink just one bottle. She shoved it at him, proclaiming it harmless. Wraith refused, but she kept pushing, reminding him she helped with his magic bag. He caved, forcing out a grudging nod, one bottle and only at dinner. Unease coiled in him, even though Luria had long been at ease with drinking. He forced out an apology to Sylvia and they lunged forward and plunged into cooking dinner. Later, a thunderous crash shattered the quiet and yanked him into the room to check on Luria. The room where she sipped from her glass. Wraith demanded to know what had happened, and Lafferty blurted that Luria had suddenly unleashed her magic. The bottle looked untouched, but Wraith suspected she'd used translocation magic to pluck a drink straight out of it while he staggered drunk. He conjured a swirl of water magic and filled it to the brim, then Wraith urged her to sit and vowed he wouldn't scold her for drinking. She swore she wasn't drunk. Lathe bellowed, "What do we do?" But before Wrath could answer, a savage gust ripped through the room, hurling everything into chaos. Luria cast spells even drunk. While magic usually demands razor focus, she channeled it by muscle memory, a deadly art etched into her bones. The house teetered on the brink of destruction as Sylvia wrestled her magic into submission and smashed the spell. She stopped it. The blow slammed into her, and she crumpled to the ground. Wrath slammed a healing potion into her shaking hands, a single vial to yank her back from the brink. Fury flared inside him. He swore he'd never let her drink again. Luffy shoved Wrath forward and barked for him to watch her while they cleaned up. Ray shouted a grateful thanks to Laffy, then yanked Lure Sims toward him. Wrath hatched a plan, left Sins to rest, and teamed with Renee to tinker with a waterlogged fruit he'd meant to test first, but time ran out. Lorraine had dragged Lathe and Sylvia into chaos, so Wrath pinned his hopes on this to be his apology. He wove an alchemical rite, and the liquid rumbled like a beast waking. The mixture seemed to take hold. Wrath's grin split his face with pure triumph. He shoved the sadi in at the last second, his very first creation that wasn't a potion, and it came out flawless. He burst back into the room to find it spotless, then proudly unveiled his creation, a gift meant to say thank you. They demanded to know what it was. He simply showed them. A rift ripped through the lights, and the bottle flared to life in a ghostly glow. The girls lit up, grins spreading. They clearly loved it. Crushed fruit runoff turns into a liquid that shimmers in a riot of colors under the light. Sagi, a soil drinking plant that drains magical energy, pulses with blinding light and creeping shadow. Then alchemists fuse them, and they burst into a breathtaking glow coveted by the kingdom. They showered Wrath with grateful thanks, then were yanked away by a direct summons. Business waited for them at dawn. They were the Linford family. A prominent noble lineage sprang from a legendary herbalist who fought in a war over a century ago, and their heirs wielded fearsome magic and carved unforgettable feats across the battlefield, unmatched in their age. Victories vaulted the Linfords into one of the kingdom's 4 great noble families. Generation after generation they forged master herbalists and mages to safeguard the land, and right now Seth Linford, the eldest son, was being raked over the coals. Elisha snapped at him for sighing, convinced every sigh chased away happiness. She begged him to snap out of it, but sorrow clung to Seth like a shadow. Elisha coaxed a reluctant smile from Seth. Someone smirked, snapping that he looked better that way, and shot, "Are you thinking of Ada?" Seth couldn't stop thinking about him, the lack of any word gnawed at his heart. A jolt of suspicion struck her. Could this be tied to their father's earlier talk about the royal family? Seth's silence sealed her suspicion. Alicia told him she wanted him to lead the family, but never if it meant robbing him of his joy. Seth snapped that he wasn't turning down the role, but if he stepped aside, the burden would fall on Aura or his younger brother. He eclipsed Seth in herbalism and wizardry, convinced he deserved to lead the family and seething with resentment toward Seth. To seize the clan, you must inherit its territory and prove yourself in both skill and character, and despite his dazzling talents, his poisonous temperament made him a terrible choice to lead. Alicia leaned in and told Seth their father was leaning toward naming him successor. If everything goes right, things should fall into place. Seth thundered that depending on how this royal crisis plays out, it could tear apart the established line of succession. A direct command from the royal family slammed down, and though Alicia was unaware of its contents, she knew 2 people had been chosen to carry it out. Seth swore he'd give it his all, then swallowed and admitted Otto's skills dwarfed his. He snarled that if he'd been more capable than Otto, they wouldn't be stuck in this mess. Alicia scrambled to explain, but Seth raised a hand to silence her and said, "Steady, it'll be okay." He swore he'd figure it out. Alicia prayed nothing bad would happen. Seth shot her a mischievous grin, tossed a playful jab her way, then strode off to see their father. Guilt slammed into him for putting Alicia through so much worry. He burst into the hall and locked eyes with Idha, whose voice dripped with cruel mockery as she taunted him. Someone suggested they meet their father together. Seth couldn't refuse, so they set off. He couldn't risk saying no since he had no idea what Adam might say. As they walked, Ada crowed this was the perfect chance to prove to their father who was best suited to take over the family, while Seth shut out the noise and locked onto his own preparations. At the same time, at Rate's house, Luria snapped awake after tumbling out of her sleeping spot. To Wrath she was nothing but a bug, and yet she rubbed against him, pleading with her whole body for him to protect her. Raid stare bored into her no matter what she protested. He barked for her to stow her complaints for later and get ready to. They charged toward the royal castle that day. The day the royal family's direct request landed, Ray's pulse spiked. He swore he wouldn't blow his chance or make a bad impression. Luria looked relaxed, but Wrath's smile sliced at her like a blade of ice. He slammed the truth at her. "We're linked again because of you." Before gearing up, Luria seethed at the nagging wraith and ached for his kinder, younger self. She snapped her fingers, muscles coiling ready to launch. She pleaded for breakfast. Wrath snapped there wasn't a second to spare. If she's gonna blame anyone, let it be her. She brought this on herself. Hunger gnawed at Luria, and they complained with every step. Ray cut her off cold and demanded, "How well do you know the royal family?" Luria roared that she'd slain towering dragons for them, and that victory won her formidable influence. Wrath found it useful, but she explained they wouldn't let her sever ties because they wanted to keep exploiting her. She'd fled the kingdom since the strain of doing their tasks would have been a nightmare, and Wrath hadn't realized she'd endured all that. Luria giggled and leaned in, her voice a velvet blade as she warned Wrath to tread carefully as her disciple. She knew the kingdom had branded her a free spirit, untamed and impossible to corral whenever they sent a request. Realizing this, they'd lock onto her dispel next, put simply. Requests could start flooding Ruth's place from now on. Wrath's jaw clenched, he refused to be her errand runner. They crested the hill, and the castle burst into view. Luria bolted, heart pounding at the promise of food waiting there. Wraith lunged to stop her but failed. She behaved like a petulant child, and the possibility that no food would be prepared could set her off. When they reached the gate, Wrath gaped, its colossal height knocked the breath from him. Soldiers cut them off the instant the royal family's letter is brandished. The soldiers erupted into apologies and ushered them inside. As they walked, Luria revealed the dragons loomed as massive as the castle. Ruth froze, shock pinning him to the spot, then a stranger barreled straight into him. Otto sneered, branding them as nothing but commoners. Rage surged through Luria as he barked, "What's your problem? You don't even know me." Wrath's pulse spiked. Had Otto been summoned to the castle too? Otto snapped that it wasn't his fault, swearing he'd already apologized. He shoved Wrath deliberately, he meant it. The maids burst in, apologies tumbling out for the delay. Unease coiled in Wraith's chest. Inside the room, they discovered Seth and Otto already there. Wraith's jaw dropped when they were seated in the same waiting area as the nobles, right beside the man from earlier. Luria paid the others no mind. A ravenous hunger consumed every one of her thoughts. Seth Rose erupted into a grin and offered them a tray piled high with snacks. They poured out thanks, swapped names, then pressed him for his purpose. Wrath snapped that he was Mimi's disciple sent to carry out her request. Seth's jaw clenched. Wrath wasn't different. He and his brother Otto were carrying out the royal family's orders. Another laughed and sneered that nobles like Seth mustn't mingle with commoners, it would tarnish their status. Seth snapped, "Not my problem," his words sharp as knives, but his face stayed ice cold and utterly unfazed. Wraith sensed the tension crackling around them, but every fiber of him wanted to bolt straight home. Preparations complete, they were primed and ready to move out. When that sudden thing sprang up to among them, Seth lunged forward, apologizing and pouring out raw regret for his brother's actions. They burst in, and the royal family's father barked for everyone to calm down. Luria bounded up to Wilbur with a warm grin and teased, "When did you start getting older?" After a brief pause, Wilbur conceded, age was finally catching up. Luria snapped, "Why were we summoned?" She was sure it wasn't for idle small talk. Wilbur realized the Linfords present already knew the reason, but he ripped the silence open and spelled it out for Luria, James, and her disciple, who'd been left in the dark. One mission burned in him: recover the crystal dragon, the nation's emblem. For over 300 years, worshippers bowed before this rare dragon as it birthed shimmering crystals. He implored them to save it, and they lunged forward, seizing it and hauling it to safety. The crystals, once flawless, blackened and cracked like dying stars, and the dragon's colossal body began to wither, shrinking inch by inch. Luria slammed the point home, the goal was to heal it. Doubt trembled in Ruber's voice, but he stepped forward and swore to the king it was healed. Seething at his smugness, Luria shot back that her disciple would definitely succeed too. The king recoiled at Wrath's youth. Luria shot back that Wrath outclassed the other young man. Wrath urged her not to expect too much and swore to the king he'd give everything he had. Luria braced herself and fired off the question, had this ever happened before? The king met her eyes and shook his head, no, never. Luria demanded to know the dragon's diet and habits. He revealed it gorged on metal and habitually prowled the yard and castle with his daughter. Wrath's gaze burned with a hungry need to inspect it up close. The dragon seethed with restless energy, every scale trembling, yet it held itself utterly motionless. Wraith zeroed in, dissecting it with razor focus and cataloging every flicker of reaction. The king's voice cut through the hall, "Did you discover anything?" Wrath snapped that the crystal's dark stain came from microscopic metal flecks trapped inside, even though the dragon usually digested metals completely. Wraith fired off a theory. The dragon either couldn't digest metal or something went wrong after digestion, and its insides were packed with undigested metal, jamming and choking its vessels. Normally dissolved metals streamed to the dragon's skin, but clotted blockages choked the channels. He realized the dragon's vessels had stopped flowing, triggering a deadly buildup. He demanded to know if the crystal dragon had been devouring metals like it always did, and the cane said it hadn't. Maybe the dragon's instincts smelled a deadly threat, knowing any extra fluid could burst its vessels. To a human, the pain hit like blood vessels exploding. Ray was flooded with sympathy and swore he'd find a cure. The king asked any solutions. Wrath's eyes flashed as he pitched an idea he'd just hatched. The king's nod fell like a verdict, permission granted, and Wrath surged forward to confront the dragon. At first the dragon recoiled, whipping its head away from his hand. Wrath ripped into it with a lawsuit, wielding a promise to help like a weapon. He hurled a desperate transformation spell at the dragon. Not magic, alchemy twists the practitioner's own materials and harnesses the power of influence, possibly letting him wrench the metals free from the dragon's crystal. This ability slammed hard into its limits. And Wraith's influence, stronger than Luria's, slammed into the dragon and bounced off its scales, leaving the beast untouched. Ray's jaw clenched. This wasn't going to be so easy. Luria leaned in, imploring him to try a different approach. Wrath dropped to one knee before the king, voice raw as he apologized, admitted this was all he could do for now, and swore he'd return later with a solution. On the threshold of leading the castle, someone warned Wrath to bury every reckless impulse. Seth burst onto the scene, set on striking a deal with him in the next chapter. Lorien swept Seth and Wraith into the nearest eatery, hunger roaring in her belly. With the last bite gone, Seth sprang to his feet, locked eyes with Wrath and begged him for help. Wrath's eyes shot wide. Was Seth saying he should snatch the credit? Seth cut through the doubt and said plainly he was okay with Wrath completing the request. He vowed to stop his brother dead in his tracks. Rafe didn't care who finished it, only that it got done. The request bore the nation's emblem, and Seth pointed out that if it came from the royal family, his family shrugged. Anyone could do it, but he wore it like a burning brand. He dropped the bomb. He was the eldest scion of a prominent noble house, the one everyone expected to inherit its leadership. Luria knew the family, renowned for their herbalists, resented her. Her alchemy outshone theirs, so her arrival was met with icy hostility. If the request passed, the family succession would swing to Seth's younger brother, a fate Seth would fight tooth and nail to stop. He sprinted to rally allies and lock down a Wraith's pact to stop this. Ray stared the proposal down, ran it through his head, then dropped a firm yes. Seizing a chance to bolster his shop's funds, Seth moved with quiet kindness and modesty, totally unlike Ada. Faith couldn't shake the question, what fire burned in Seth that made him so bent on leading the family? Seth exploded, insisting his younger sister backed his claim. He refused to entrust that responsibility to his brother. Onlookers mocked Seth's sweet motive and he flushed with shame, but Wraith stepped forward and declared it noble. Wrath blinked. Seth was shockingly approachable for a noble. Seth played easygoing to dodge any aloofness, but a prick of doubt nagged that maybe he should pull back. Wrath owned up to having almost no experience with the highborn of great families, yet he prized kindness over pedigree and reached out to everyone as a friend, regardless of rank. Seth, shackled by noble status while his heart rebelled, felt a jolt of freedom when he met Wraith, the rare soul who treated him as an equal. They clasped Seth Eager's hand, sealing a pact to collaborate. They dove into plans, and Wrath fixed Seth with a hard stare, demanding what he knew about the crystal dragon. Seth swallowed and confessed that even nobles scarcely glimpse the dragon, so he knew no more than Wraith. Rafe had no solid plan for now. Luria pushed for experiments, but they couldn't risk it. They were dealing with the nation's symbol. The real gauntlet was pinpointing exactly which metals they were. The crystal dragon refused to dissolve, and anything that did dissolve snapped right back into its original form. He jabbed the question at Seth. Did he know anywhere in the kingdom that processed liquid metals, and could they track down a metal that shifted from solid to liquid with terrifying ease? It could check every box he'd laid down, and to learn more they had to head straight to the facility that handled the kingdom's circulating molten metals. He scoured every room for answers, but she could only point to a bar in the city. Ray scanned his options for someone who could tame liquid metals, then a lightning bolt of inspiration hit him. Luria pressed, "Do you have someone in mind?" Wraith snarled a warning. If someone less capable stepped in, everything would spiral into disaster. He dove into feverish brainstorming, and Luria bristled with irritation. She screamed for them to move now, and they tore off into the unknown. Nimi steered them to a girl who practically burst with joy the moment she saw Nimi. Disbelief hit Luria like a punch. Nicola, the name rang out, yet at first she didn't recognize her. Memory slammed into her. Nicola had nursed her through that drunken night years ago. Mortification slammed into Wraith, leaving him poised to bolt. He declared they were here because their mission demanded they investigate liquid metals. An unavoidable chill crawled up Nicola's spine. seeing a noble and an alchemist tackle the same task set every alarm in his gut blaring. She rattled off several likely spots and leaned in, looking for anything specific. He snapped, "Is there a metal that melts and solidifies easily?" The moment his fingers brushed the dragon's crystals, warmth exploded through him, like blood suddenly rushing into frozen veins. He figured if the surface burned like that, the interior had to be molten. Nicola dropped the bomb that a new liquid metal had just been imported from the south. Wrath guessed the name silver, and he was right. She revealed only a trickle had ever been imported and nothing remained. Seth snapped that the information still mattered. He'd tell his family how to source it. Rafe scoffed, convinced the scheme would flop. Scoring silver was mostly a roll of the dice. Silver surfaced only in volcanic layers, always flanked by a twin metal so silver-white and fluid it passed for the same thing, indistinguishable until the volcano fell quiet and the metal flowed, finally revealing itself. But silver-streaked volcanoes seethed with restless spirits. Spirits haunted the forces of nature, visible only to those with fierce magic, and they could ignite volcanoes into roaring eruption. Nicola swallowed an apology for not doing more, but Wrath brushed it off. She'd been invaluable and pressed her into action to scour the kingdom for any silver left. He dangled Lorraine's as the bargain, and Nicola pounced, eager to help. Wreath barked at Seth, "Pull every favor from your family and check if the royal household still has any left." 5 days later, every attempt had failed, and they were still empty-handed. Wrath snapped, "Did you find anything?" Their frantic searches came up empty. The royal family's stores were bare, and Nicola came up empty-handed too. Wraith set his jaw and charged straight to the source to seize it himself. Even armed with his analysis, he fought to pry it apart from the nearly identical metal. He fired the question at Laramie, "Can you cool the silver with magic?" She breathed that it might work in a spiritless zone, yet she held back, afraid to tangle with their power. She swore she could pull it off if the spirits let her unleash magic. Wraith gaped, stunned she could actually talk to them, and explained that spirits of massive natural phenomena could be sentient. They'd better be friendly or they'd risk being incinerated. Their best move was to parley with the spirits. Wrath asked if she could defeat their enemies should they turn hostile, but the reply crushed her hopes. A bolt of clarity slammed into him. He had to act. He warned that if his mentor couldn't conquer them, they'd have to forge a magical device to snatch victory. He plotted a magic circle to supercharge magical energy and aimed to forge a ring to magnify that power. Luria admitted she knew of no circle that could do it. Ray smirked and confessed he'd hatched the whole idea while she was away, certain she'd put it together in no time. Luria snapped, "That intricate magic circle is beyond me, only Wrath can pull it off." Wraith clenched his fists, drew a steady breath, and readied himself to launch the process. Magic refused him, so he leaned hard on Seth and Luria to carry out the tests. He brandished the scarlet crystal. It wasn't an alchemical reagent meant to amplify magic. Seth's hand cut the circle's first arc, dread coiling in his gut. Wrath finished and shot out. "Who wants to try it first?" Seth faltered. Luria volunteered. Seth's eyes darted as he asked if it was safe, and Wraith shrugged, declaring it merely radiated light and couldn't harm a soul. When Miriam touched the circle, a blinding flare seared their eyes. In the next chapter, Sylvia and Laughing watched a blinding flash erupt from their house and bolted inside. Wraith's light magic test on his magical enhancement device unleashed a blast like a second sun that seared the three, leaving them with brutal, severe eye damage. Lathy grinned that they'd been lucky to be right there, and Salvia, sleeves rolled with dinner simmering, hustled to serve and asked if they could move. The mere mention of food yanked Luria upright, her legs trembling as she fought to stay standing. Seth slammed Wrath with a blunt reminder about those safety concerns. Wrath shot out an apology, but it fell flat. They put the magic circle to the test and witnessed its power firsthand. Seth shot back, he'd rather never have gone through that himself. Wraith unleashed powers so incredible that no ordinary alchemist could ever hope to match them. Catching Lathe and Sylvia's curious stares, he strode forward and declared his name. Seeing Lathe's expression, Wrath snapped that he'd met Seth while working on a request from the royal family, and their injury came from an experiment tied to it. Silly smirked and declared Wraith had a knack for diving headfirst into trouble. Wraith then implored Lafty and Sylvia for a favor. He held his breath, praying it wasn't trivial. He beckoned them to join him at Wulumulu Volcano. A colossal volcano looms over the southern Delicate Mountains, and since ancient times people have worshipped it as a home for spirits. Ray thanked them for joining, confessing that unease churned in his gut at being down to just the three of them. Lathe, bound to him by debt, sprang to his aid. Wraith sputtered, cheeks flaming, muttering that having two ranked adventurers at his side was the only thing keeping panic at bay. Lafay slammed the conversation toward the spirits that had stained the mountain blood red. Luria hissed that anyone lingering in the mountains after nightfall would summon a curse fire, then spat that spirits outclassed humans, those that wore human or animal shapes held the deadliest power. She felt it they'd already picked up the spirits, which was why the salamander spirit lashed out, fiercely guarding against outsiders. Wraith Hope and the villagers would step forward, ready to parley, and charged off toward the nearby village, which breathed an easy, untroubled calm. Sylvia's breath hitched and a sharp gasp ripped from her. Dread coiled in Rafe's gut, forcing him to worry that something was wrong. She squealed and threw her arms around the unbearably cute plushie like she'd just found treasure. The other girls were also drawn to the plushies, while Seth and Wraith stood by. The seller snapped that the dolls were modeled after the salamander that lives on Lulu Volcano, and they looked nothing like what Seth had pictured. The seller barked, "You can't climb the volcano now, it's impossible." From the village, the world burned a warped, molten red. Salamander's power had turned the volcano into a living furnace that dried humans out in minutes. If they insisted on going, they'd have to stalk the hours until Salamander crashed into sleep. Wraith yanked an item from his pocket and slammed it forward like a trump card, grinning as he offered it as their solution. The seller snapped, "No illusion, no arcane trick will shield you from Salamander's power." Wraith scoffed at caution and lunged in to test it himself. The seller cackled, flung a crooked grin their way, and cried, "Good luck," as they stepped out of the shop. Rage boiled in Salamander as humans dared trespass his domain, certain his searing blaze would incinerate anyone who stood before it. The group advanced toward the volcano, not a bead of sweat on any of them, and Wrath's grin sharpened. His plan was working. He thrust a ring of impact resistance and 3 magic strengthening rings into every hand, each one single use, and growled a warning: use them only when it counts. Seth snapped, demanding to know how those devices could shield them when magic had already failed. The group threw their weight behind the Wraith's plant, insisting it was fine. A sudden voice cut through the silence, snapping, "That's not okay." Wrath snapped, "Did anyone else hear that?" Laughing hadn't. Sylvia demanded how far they'd have to go, and Luria replied it all hinged on where the spirit was hiding. Wraith toyed with the idea of launching wild strikes at the mountain to bait the spirit into revealing itself. Wraith flashed a grin and playfully booted the stone to prove his point. A monster ripped into view. Lathe snarled at him for sketching monsters, and Wraith, stunned, declared the creature short-tempered. Jock crackled through the air as the monster snapped back, swearing it wasn't short-tempered. Wrath heard it speak, blood running cold, but Laffy swore monsters couldn't talk. The monster erupted into a dizzying spin. That ignited Lathe. She ripped her sword free and lunged to strike. Lauren sized up the jagged terrain and the monster's stone-armored back. It locked onto the exposed Billy, pinpointing him as the weak point. He shifted his form, locked onto the Billy, and carved out the opening Lafty needed to strike its weak spots. Laffey seized her sword, vaulted into the air, and plunged it into the monster's belly, felling the beast. She landed cleanly, then tore into Wrath, fury snapping at his reckless actions. Wraith insisted they'd reach the spirit if they pressed on this path. Lathe's glare hit him like a punch. He recoiled and backed down. Lathe planted herself between him and danger. Wrath swallowed his protests and fell in step behind her. They pressed on, and the road erupted into chaos. Luria urged them to seek another route, but Wraith snapped that he'd carve one into existence with his transformation. The instant he planted his feet on the ground to start, the voice slammed into his mind again, warning him to stay out of its territory and snarling that it would never allow him to interfere. Looking up, Wraith's gaze snapped to a colossal bird plummeting out of the twilight. Bellow it at them and watch everyone bolt. He locked eyes with Lathe and shot the question, "Can you handle it?" The bird hung defiantly in the sky, giving no sign it would descend anytime soon. Seth's eyes snapped to the emergency. He snatched his ring and slammed it into action. Seth wrestled to seize control of his wind magic as it fought him every step. Suddenly it seized and ripped beyond his control, teetering on the brink of a violent eruption. Moments later, a thunderous blast erupted, hurling Seth into a brutal, stomach-dropping fall. Plummeting through the air, he hurtled toward the earth. A memory of that pre-journey talk with his sister slammed into him. He'd told her Wrath would craft magical devices for them. His sister whooped, eyes bright, declaring it was wonderful to watch Seth revel in pure joy. He couldn't hide his grin. This was the happiest sheet he'd seen in ages. Seth snapped that Wraith's knack for treating someone from a noble family like an old friend made everything easy. His brothers barged in, spitting venomous insults and tearing him down once more. Seth snapped that this had nothing to do with his brother, he was ice cold. Shot back that Seth could humiliate himself to his heart's content. Tomorrow move like a shadow, keep your guard razor sharp. His brother's departure hit Seth like a gut punch, doubt clawing at him, had he done something to drive him away. Hope died in him and his will to live shattered. He mouthed apologies to everyone in his head, then gave himself over to the fall. Out of nowhere, Wraith launched himself after him, diving in to save him. He shot his arm out, fingers snapping shut around Seth's wrist. Wrath yanked Seth close, channeling his ring's impact resistance too. They plummeted, slammed into the earth, and somehow walked away without major injuries. He scanned Seth, hunting for any sign he was alright. Seth's voice cut through, confirming it, he was. Then he replayed what had happened earlier, heart pounding as the moments crashed through his mind. Seth snarled that his brother had almost certainly sabotaged him with interference magic beforehand. Ray's mind raced, could siblings really sink to such deadly actions, but Seth unfazed shot Wrath a curt, thanks for saving me. He demanded how would they escape. Stripped of the impact resistance ring and the magic enhancing ring, they stood exposed as the volcano swarmed with monsters, so they tore back to rejoin Laffey and the others. From their vantage they could lock onto their allies' status. Wraith hesitated, but Seth's shout split the air. They peered out and froze as a colossal snake locked its cold, unblinking gaze on them. They bolted from the serpent, sprinting for their lives, until the beast finally caught and killed them. They tore free from its pursuit at last. They'd raced for miles, breath burning, the world spun around them. They plunged into a volcano ravaged by relentless monsters and ended up completely lost. A voice ripped through the silence again, razor-hot and snarling, demanding Wrath never meddle in its domain. He leaned in and snapped, "Did you hear a muffled voice since we arrived?" Seth shook his head, he hadn't. Seth's voice cut the silence, "Did you hear that?" Wrath snorted and waved it off, insisting it was just his imagination. Wraith's eyes locked on a familiar red rock and he called it out, but Seth shrugged and pointed out the ground was littered with identical stones. Wraith etched a mark into the rock, a quiet precaution to keep him safe. They forged ahead only two. They stumbled onto the marked rock again, a gut punch of proof they were trapped in a loop. They dropped into a tight huddle and tore through escape plans. Wraith's jaw clenched as he toyed with confronting whoever engineered the loop. Being stuck turned every step into a desperate fight. Sets declared that if spatial magic spun the loop, certain coordinates could be bound to it. Wrathgren snapped that they could shatter those coordinates with one explosive burst of earth transformation magic. Seth's eyes snapped as he seized his meaning and lunged to force his way into Geinber. Rafe roared that true men give everything they've got. Seth barked a warning to be careful. A thunderous explosion ripped through, cutting them off. While the girls huddled, bewildered about where they were, Sylvia's voice cut through the silence. What's next? A spike of awareness told Luria they were still on the volcano. She locked onto the magic's wrong location, twisted and tangled in spatial magic, and as long as she felt their magic, they were alive. A single burning question ripped through them. Who else could wield such advanced spatial magic? Minnie shot a sharp look at her plushie and muttered that the salamander had likely marked them as foes, turning negotiation into an uphill battle. A deafening roar ripped through the air as the creature stamped its claim on the land, barring humans from moving freely. A monstrous, wind-forged colossus tore into view right before them. The salamander spirits leaned in, murmuring like smoldering embers and insisting they'd come only to talk. The salamander snapped, "Leave now." Luria, Sims murmured, urged Sylvia to prime her magic at a heartbeat's notice. Sylvie's voice sliced through the volcanic haze. They'd come for a medal found only here, and she begged the salamander to free their two companions held captive by his master. The salamanders dug in, refusing to budge and swearing they'd stay forever. Lori snarled, "Keep me locked up and you'll live to regret it." Rage ignited in the salamander. He rocketed at them, only to be slammed to a stop by a thunderous explosion. Confusion crashed into him and he froze. Lori realized it was real. A scream ripped through the air as something crashed to the ground. Wrath and Seth fumed, snarling that he'd plummeted from deadly heights twice in one day despite every desperate move he'd made to stop it. Their final ring of impact resistance stood between them and total annihilation. Wraith scoffed at Seth's complaints, grinned at the limbs and jabbed a finger over his shoulder at Solomon. Both sides froze, shock slamming into them as they locked eyes. Wrath snarled that his expert findings would let him blast them free with alchemy, and the salamander scoffed, insisting no one could use alchemy freely in his domain. Oblivious, Wrath laughed like nothing could surprise him. Even Luria admitted alchemy would be easier to wield here than magic, though its reach would be limited. He dropped a bomb. Wraith might be the exception. That ignited a wildfire of fury in the salamander. It roared again. Luria roared, counter his magic, as a wall of flame hurtled straight toward them. Wraith's ranks slammed up a shield around them, leaving the salamander reeling. The magic-enhancing ring from Wraith supercharged Sylvia, catapulting her power tenfold. Freed from its bonds, the salamander roared, swearing to turn them all into smoldering ash. Luria summoned her ring's power and blasted the salamander. After the attack, the dust settled. Everyone froze when the salamander gun came into view. Wraith's gaze snapped to a tiny hammer skittering across the floor. It was a twisted twin of Sylvia's doll. It barreled toward them. Sylvia snatched it up, grinning with pure delight. Salamander, still inside, roared, "Release me." Wrath's breath caught as recognition slammed into him. This creature was the salamander. Doubt slammed into him. Was this its true form? It grinned and admitted it had been overusing its power. Luria Eames ripped it into her grip, felt its power fizzle away, too weak to threaten them, and grinned. The salamander twitched like a fuse burning out, then lunged and snapped at her. She lunged to land the hit, but the other cut her off and stopped her. Tension finally loosened, and Wrath declared they'd come to the volcano for a rare metal. They needed the salamander to lift the mountain's magic. Still defiant, the salamander stood its ground and flat-out refused to bow to the invaders, and that was the end. Eyeing its stubborn streak, they coaxed the salamander in a soft, smoky voice, "We need something from the volcano." And she bowed her head, respectfully asking for his help. Her earnest eyes struck him like a blade. He gave in and barked for them to leave the moment they had it. Bursting with joy, Soldvaya launched himself at him and clung on in a fierce, crushing hug, all for a green. Ray reeled, outshone by the salamander, and Seth's gut flared. He loathed that smug attitude. The salamander snuffed the magic away and guided them straight to the silvery. He barked, "No needless moves." Ray flashed a grateful grin, and they lunged forward to snatch up the shimmering silvery. Later, Seth re-entered the Linford residence. She barreled into his arms, welcoming him with a wild, relieved grin. She shot him a sharp question, "Are you hurt?" He shot back that with everyone's help they'd pulled it off. When Seth questioned her, she blinked, puzzled. Otter swaggered up to him and spoke, every word pulsing with raw confidence. The moment interference magic hits him, he erupts into blistering speed. He barked a denial and put on a show of wounded outrage. Seth pressed for an update on his request. He declared he was finally making headway and urged Seth to stay patient and let him take care of it. Seth coiled to snap back, then froze when Alicia's stare locked onto him. She cocked an eyebrow, asked what was going on, then gave his cheeks a teasing pinch. Seth snarled this wasn't the first time he'd pulled a stunt like that, vowing he'd discipline him the moment he became Lord. Lucia's brow furrowed with worry as she said bluntly that his trouble was going shopping with her. Seth was forced to carve out an entire day for it. Wrath cut through the ash-choked streets, eyes raking over charred roofs and smoldering rubble left by the volcano's eruption. Lathe and Sylvia barreled home and plunged into their next task. Seth went to visit his sister. Lamb cracked open a bottle and began to drink. He jabbed Seth with a reminder about their planned silver experiment, knowing Seth was swamped. Luria had probably been out all night, leaving him with one last problem. I burst into a women's shop. His pulse hammered in his throat as the women leaned in, whispering about his presence. He steeled himself. He was only here to buy gifts for Lathe and Sylvia when a woman's voice sliced the air, asking if there was wrath. Her gaze locks onto Amelia. You know her the instant she steps into view. She snapped, "What are you doing here?" and he clicked. He raced through the market, hunting the perfect presents for Lathe and Sylvia. Amelia froze, confusion written all over her face. He leaned in and explained they'd helped him out in a huge way just days ago. Her expression collapsed with sudden disappointment and she asked, "Have you decided yet?" Wraith blurted out he had no clue what they found cute and begged her to help him. Amelia leapt at the chance to help. He tossed out dolls as gift ideas, remembering Laffy adores anything cute. It shocked everyone. She blazed with a strength and boldness that outshone any man, and Amelia snapped, warning him not to ever say that within her earshot. Wrath winced. Laffy had already rebuffed the accessory he'd offered, and he feared she'd do the same to a doll. Amelia flashed him an odd look, sensing Lathe was too shy to accept it. She caught him in the act, using it to hide this from him, and kept her mouth shut. She volunteered to pick a doll. Relief flooded Wrath, then she snatched the ugliest one in the entire store. Wraith's breath snagged as the doll flickered between mouse, fish, chimera. He couldn't tell which it was. while Amelia forged adorable. He thrust the rabbit doll at her, eyes blazing, and asked, "What do you think?" She paused for a heartbeat, then snapped that her pick was better. Lathe would love it. Rathover bristled when he realized people loved different things. The doll's adorable charm hooked him, maddeningly, and since Amelia had gone out of her way to help, he couldn't flat-out refuse her choice. He hatched a daring plan: buy both dolls and make sure the strange one never reached the girls. Next day he strode into Lathe and Sylvia's home and pressed their gifts into their hands. A bright laugh escaped her, color flaring across her cheeks, and she murmured a soft thank you to him. Sylvie beamed a heartfelt thanks, pointing out that Lathy adored all things cute but was too shy to buy them, and that revelation made Lathy's joy impossible to miss. Wraith beamed as they loved the gifts, then Lori materialized behind him, jaw clenched and eyes rimmed with hurt. She snapped, "What are those hideous things?" He confessed he didn't want to buy them either, and I dropped the bomb. There was a second gift. To make the gifts practical for their adventure life, he pitched forging battle-ready weapons, and they snapped to attention, eyes blazing. Wrath hadn't forged weapons since he set foot in the capital, but a wildfire of confidence surged through him. This was going to work. They plunged into the forge, hammered out a sword first, then spun to Lafay and asked, "Any specific requests?" She snapped that it only had to be razor-sharp and built to last. Lathe's raw, earth-shaking power demanded a weapon forged tough enough to survive every devastating strike. If the sword held up to her relentless swings without shattering, Lathe would be powerless. Wraith leaned in and asked to see her sword, and she flashed the heavy blade. Laffy trusted raw swordsmanship and brute strength, hauling a weighty sword because light weapons felt like toys. Rafe eyed the sword's heft, measured the blade's thickness, tested the grip and length, then crowned Chalkum the clear choice. Lathe bristled, insisting such a priceless material wasn't necessary. Wraith flashed a grin and assured her it was fine, he barely ever used it himself. He thrust charcoal and orchulcom into the furnace, stoked the blaze, yanked the orchulcom out as it glowed, shoved it back in and repeated the brutal cycle several times. The orchulcom flared to life. He reinforced the piece and pounded it, each strike siphoning the hammer's light straight into the metal. At last he unleashed transformation magic and let it cool. While he waited, he dove into crafting Sylvia's staff, rapid-fire asking her about every preference. She requested a feather-light staff that wouldn't tether her movements. Sylvia's staff had to do more than spark a mage's magic activation. It had to amplify raw power. Usually those staffs were forged from ores that conducted magic and left them heady, and Rafe considered mithril but itched to experiment with another material. The true heart of a staff was the channel where magic roared through instead. Wraith tossed the standard magic gem aside and forged a staff from his own magical strength and the metal of his rings, baptizing it with holy water to finish it. Sylvia's jaw dropped as he wrapped it up in a heartbeat. Wrath grinned, saying a staff's much simpler than a sword, so he blasted through it. The sword still needed time, so Wraith urged Sylvia to test her staff right away. He implored Lathe to wait until dawn for her sword, and she nodded, agreeing. They burst outside, hunting slimes to fulfill a request. A wave of nostalgia crashed over Laughing and Sylvia. They hadn't hunted slimes together in ages. When they ran into slimes, Wraith barked, "Do these slimes shrug off spells or tank physical strikes?" Laughing warned, voice urgent, even a lightning-fast sword slash could still slice them. They came to push the staff to their limits, the Wrath advisors. Strain tightened in her muscles as Sylvia set her new staff to the test, unleashing a howling blast of wind magic. Wrath's memory snapped. Master mages could slice monsters cleanly in two with a single wind spell. Sylvie lunged to slice the slimes, but her blade cleaved the earth beneath them instead. The staff surged to life, blowing everyone's minds with its raw, unstoppable power. Wraith's eyes glittered. He vowed to corral the slimes. He realized Laughing felt awkward and uneasy. When Wrath asked if she still felt it, she admitted the washed sensation still clung to her. Lafayette said the sensation evaporated the instant she swept her gaze across the room. Sylvia feared that once Wrath chose her, someone would come for him, but they vowed to protect him. The butler fired off a report to the man, revealing Wrath had slipped into the forest with 2 ranked adventurers to hunt slimes. The man demanded if Wrath had done anything notable, and the butler warned the adventurers were closing in on him. One had sensed his presence and snapped to alert. Every move risked disaster. He barked at the butler to keep watch and strike the instant an opening arose, waiting for Lathe and Sylvia to step out of Wrath alone. The next day at Wraith's house, Lafayette and Sylvia stood together. Wraith staggered and heaved, Lath's new sword a brutal weight that nearly dragged him to his knees. Laffey hoisted it like it weighed nothing, flashed him a grateful smile when Wraith asked if she wanted to test it. She scoffed and refused, claiming she didn't need it. Wrath made it, so she trusted its quality. After receiving a request to leave the group, the others slipped away, leaving Seth and Wraith alone, and Seth flashed a grin as he pointed out how much they'd trusted him while Wraith burned crimson and scrambled to steer the talk elsewhere. At last they seized the silver they'd hunted, a precious, delicate material that demanded careful hands. They pried the box open and slid the silver inside. The lights died in an instant, and something invisible slammed the wreath backward. Seth's instinct screamed, a magical assault, and he wasn't alone. With no one in sight, Wrath snapped at Seth to haul the intruder out. A hooded man hurtles at Seth, whistling a cold, mocking tune. A brutal kick to the gut ripped the wind from Seth's lungs and he crumpled to the ground. The attacker let Seth live, snapped his focus to Wrath and jolted him into bewilderment. Wrath knew in a heartbeat, they wanted the silver the instant the man's hand lunged for it. Luria's voice sliced through the air, ordering him to freeze and threatening that if he continued to harass her disciple he'd be lucky to walk away with only a few broken bones. The man launched a deadly hail of knives toward the sound of Larry's voice. Many were already hot on his heels. She sent him crashing to the ground. She snapped at him, "Don't you dare underestimate me just because I'm a woman." She snapped at Wrath, "What's happening?" He threw up his hands and admitted they were clueless. She lunged, ripped the mask from his face, and tore the hoodie away to expose the intruder. Seth's eyes snapped to the man. He knew him, one of Order's lackeys. Wrath snapped, "What's our next move?" Seth ground out that there was little they could do. If Otto found out his sabotage had failed, he'd strike again. They tied the man up and dove back into their tasks. 5 days later, they stepped into the king's presence. The king barked, "Have you devised a plan to save the crystal dragon?" And Luria fired back, "Ironcom, we wouldn't be here otherwise." Wraith surged forward, closing on the frail dragon in a heartbeat. With Luria at their side, they forged a spellbound device to ice the mineral with freezing magic so the dragon could gulp it, and the silver trapped in its body would liquefy and run free. The dragon inhaled sharply, tasting the mineral, then crushed it beneath iron teeth and swallowed it whole. Then they unleashed transfer magic, and a tide of inky black ichor gushed from the dragon. Luria unleashed her extract ability, seized it in a flash, ripped the silver free and slammed the gleaming metal into a bottle for safekeeping. The dragon's dark marks dissolved into nothing. In under a minute, Wraith's gaze sliced through the crystal dragon. He confirmed it was completely stripped of silver. Wraith proclaimed to the king that the crystal dragon was stripped of every trace of silver and healed completely. The dragon surged to its feet, reborn and crackling with power, and the stunned king voiced his gratitude. They told Seth and relief surged through him. Wraith, beaming, grilled Seth about his progress. Seth said the attacker finally cracked under pressure and confessed, so they ordered a quick, temporary retreat to the countryside. "He's been thrust into running his family's affairs. Every moment feels surreal." Bates' voice cut through the room, "What about his reward?" And Ray answered without missing a beat, asking for some ingredients from the Linford family stock. They unleashed a wave of greed, eyes hungry for the shifting rates and tightening tensions. Wrath unveiled his dream of opening a shop. Later, at Daisy's shop, she snapped, "Why are you here?" He replied he'd resume helping on the regular tomorrow and then fired off a question of his own. He vowed to open a shop and begged her to show him the ropes, and Daisy scoffed, calling him a fool at first. She slammed the ledger shut and warned him opening a shop without any knowledge would be pure folly. He had to nail down the location, the budget, and what he'd sell. She snapped that selling only potions and ingredients wouldn't cut it. The market was already packed with them. Rafe unveiled plans to craft enchanted devices, igniting more buzz than any other idea. To open a shop, he first had to wrest a permit from the guild. A cold reminder of the kingdom's iron rules slapped Wraith, but his razor-sharp skills and hard-won victories meant approval would likely come fast. Wraith scrambled to secure supplies and funding. She urged him to chase the guild's permit first, prove he's committed and she'll unlock the next steps, and he thanked her. He dove into the shop, eyes darting as he mentally sketched every aisle and fixture to recreate the layout in his own. Her silence didn't faze him. Wraith pushed deeper into the shop, combing the shelves with hungry eyes. In a forest, a carriage thundered through the trees, hauled by 2 snarling monsters. The earth dragon-pulled carriage surged onward with a black-haired girl and an adventurer. He leaned in to check she was comfortable, and she confessed it was her first time riding in one. Ariel, an S-ranked adventurer, charged forward to ask her out, but Lucia, the beautiful girl, stared him down and coldly refused. Ariel dropped that she'd be meeting another S-ranked adventurer. The other smirked, amusement dancing in their eyes. At the guild, Wraith stormed up to Amelia and greeted her with a booming, cocky laugh. He proclaimed his burning desire to open a shop. "I'm this close, congratulations are about to rain down on me." She told him bluntly, turn in the merchandise samples and crush the test. The examiner Keel strode in, and they kicked off the test by tearing into the merchandise samples to rate them. Amelia swept forward and thrust Kyle into the spotlight as the examiner for anyone starting a business, flashing a grin as she declared the test a mere formality and that Wrath had nothing to fear, then dashed off to marshal the paperwork. Wrath's jaw dropped as she yanked out papers and started prepping documents before the exam even ended. Kyle beamed and made it clear Amelia was certain Wrath would pass, raving that his samples blew past the standards, and he was already itching to buy some of Wrath's goods. Kyle slammed his fist on the table, demanding proof Wraith had forged the items and could produce them at scale, and called for a live demonstration. Kayla was sure a top-quality potion would chew up a full day even with speed. Kyle braced to wait, but the brew finished in just 30 minutes. In 5 minutes, Ray conjured a flawless, top-tier potion and sent astonishment ripping through the room. Her mind reeled. How had he finished that fast? She muttered under her breath as Wrath locked onto his exam. Healy shouted the news. Rafe passed and Amelie returned. Aw seized them as the potion shimmered like bottled starlight. They thrust the documents into his hands, eyes burning with total belief he'd succeed. And she leaned in, pulse racing, demanding to know if Lathe liked her gift. Rafe shrugged, smirked, and casually dropped that Lafayette loved it, even though they were standing in his house. Amelia beamed when Lafayette gushed over the gift, while guilt gnawed at Rates and he swallowed the truth. He slipped out of the guild on silent feet, snuffing any spark that might have upset Amelia. For the next step, Seth's house crackled with strange tension as Seth handed over the Wraith materials. Their behavior dripped suspicion, every move screaming shady, yet the ingredients were ordinary. Wraith urged Seth to play along for a beat, but Seth flat-out refused, scoffing that Wraith couldn't carry it all. Rafe, confidence crackling around him, shoved the materials into his magic bag and squared his shoulders to leave. Lisha barreled in, slammed the door like thunder and sobbed, "I missed you." They were dead certain Wrath had cut a shady deal with a stranger. The door slammed into his face, blood spurted from Rate's nose as they thrust a napkin at him, and Lisha stammered, "I'm sorry for assuming things." Ray swallowed his pride and owned it, lingering at the front door like that was his fault. Alicia shot back, admitting she should have opened the door more carefully. Seth staged Wraith's reintroduction to his sister, certain she'd start running into him at every turn. Wrath saw her as a charming girl. A sudden flash told him she was wise, and when he heard Seth aim to become a lord, a grin spread across his face. Seth swore she'd take his place while he was away and told Wrath not to forget her. Wrath had hunted down every ingredient he needed and was ready to head out. When Seth offered a horse-drawn carriage, Wrath smiled and politely declined. At home, Larry's unleashed a torrent of complaints at Wrath, but he was slammed and couldn't spare a second to feed her. We handed her the pile of ingredients to sort, but Cream's flat-out refused to lift a finger on an empty stomach. Ruth snapped no work, no food and made it crystal clear, if she wanted to eat, she had to help. She plunged into work, but Wraith brushed it aside. He combed the shop inside and out, hunting for detoxifiers and rings of magic reinforcement. They'd driven the interior to the brink. Now the exterior was the only thing left to conquer. Outside, he spotted the house. It looked perfectly ordinary. They hoisted a sign into place, but it still wasn't enough. He fought the urge to plaster the room with decorations when he caught that smile. A plant in a pot, he channeled his power into it and it burst into a towering flower. In an instant, Lafayette and Sylvia burst onto the scene. The moment Sylvia heard he was wrestling with the shop's exterior, she exploded into action and insisted on helping. He declared he had only interior and exterior decorating left and asked them for a shop name. Lafay recoiled. She'd expected him to blurt his name, but the idea jarred him, so he ushered them inside to hash it out instead of lingering out in the open. He whipped out paper and ink, leaning in to catch every idea they spilled. Lathe slammed a blunt, no-nonsense proposal onto the table, alchemy. Ray waited in a heartbeat, grinned and agreed. Lathe gaped at how quickly he accepted. He snatched a decision in a heartbeat, speed beat overthinking, and genuinely believed the name was perfect. They needed a logo. Lathe owned up that she couldn't draw, but she read it. Great greenlit it, they just had to scrutinize his design and lay down their verdict. He'd been scheming about this for months but only recently committed to opening a shop. When you unveil the finished logo, jaws drop and the room erupts. They both stamped their approval. Relief slammed into Faith the moment she completed the step, and the OAS stared in disbelief at how quickly she'd finished. Lathe snapped, "Did you do it all without us?" and he admitted their presence sped him to the finish. The burden of crafting the shop's products landed on his shoulders. Lafay pressed a homemade bento into his hands and urged him to give it everything. Ruth exploded with joy, declaring he'd cherished it forever. He brewed potion after potion, refusing to stop as he surged forward. Seth's bounty of ingredients sent him into overdrive as he churned out an avalanche of new products, feeling hungry. Seething, he snatched Lafay's handmade bento and started devouring it. Then Luria suddenly appeared, despite. She cut him off. He tore into the bento for a few quick bites, then plunged right back into his work. Adventurers lined up for rings forged by Grace, famed for his uncanny craft, enchanted, strength-boosting, and built to shrug off crushing blows. They became the shop's signature items, and he planned to sell everyday goods he'd retooled to be effortless to use. Wraith poured himself into designing products, betting housewives would fall head over heels for anything that banished the grind of household chores. He plastered his logo on every item, determination roaring like wildfire. He'd make his shop thrive. Wreath flaunted the logos across the exterior like trophies, pride blazing in his eyes. And with that, how was he suddenly geared up and ready for business? Dawn had barely cracked and the shop stood silent, but he burned with certainty that in a couple of hours it would erupt with customers. Convinced top-quality products would sell like wildfire, Wrath was blindsided months later. For 3 days the shop stood empty. Daisy swung by, spotted the gloom etched on his face and asked what had him so down. Crushed, Wrath crumpled into sobs, howling about his lack of customers. Later, Daisy burst back into Wraith's shop to check on things and shot him a grin, asking, "How's business going?" Wrath explained, voice fraying, that he'd hung a sign, revamped the shop's interior and crafted a logo. Still no customers, and it was driving him mad. Daisy shot back that sitting idle wouldn't solve anything and asked if he'd tried anything else, like actively luring customers or using his reputation to promote the shop. Wraith hadn't lifted a finger to lure a single customer. He brooded for days, griping about his lack of customers while refusing to lift a finger. She snapped that potion shops crowded the capital, and a nameless shop with nothing special stood no chance of competing. She slammed the truth into his face. His fame was a weapon he couldn't afford to waste. Clarity struck Wraith's. He turned to Daisy and asked how she'd launched her shop, and she revealed her adventuring contacts had blasted the word through the guild, swelling her customer base. Rafe's eyes blazed, tapping his social circle to rocket his shop into the spotlight wasn't a fantasy. He knew he could pull it off. Daisy grinned and said top-quality products would ignite on their own, with minimal effort. He just had to reel in a few customers to spark a word-of-mouth blaze. She slammed the point home, hustle to reel in your very first patrons. With his next moves crystal clear, Wrath slammed into action, hungry and focused as he unleashed his plan. Daisy spurred Wrath onward with a teasing grin, joking he didn't need the boost, but she still called out a warm good luck. Wrath strode out, Daisy's words burning in his mind, and set his sights on finding someone who could spread the news like wildfire. Suddenly, Loveshe barreled up, breathless and urgent, asking for directions to the Adventurers Guild. Ray, struck by Lucia's charm, swept her straight to the guild. He shot a quick thanks at him and pressed on. The fox on her head piped up, thrilled that Rain knew the way, and said they only had to snag some potions to start raking in coin. Lucia kept stealing glances at Wrath. The fox, sensing it, snapped, "Has the young man caught your eye?" She hardly ever showed interest in anyone. Lucia guessed Wrath commanded alchemy, and the fox quipped he looked young, about Lucia's age. Foxtionen grinned, declared he trusted Lucia to handle things, then plunged into a nap. "Wake me if anything happens," he told her. Slipping into sleep, Lucia scrambled to follow Wrath's directions and wound up hopelessly lost. 7 days later, the Ventures Guild crackled with tense anticipation. Wrath fretted whether the girl he'd helped had made it there. Then the three-tailed fox on her head flashed through his mind. What a striking mascot that would be for his shop. Austin convinced himself he hadn't heard Amelia call his name. He apologized, confessing he'd been swallowed by a swirl of ideas, and Amelia, spotting Wreath's grave expression, pressed, "What's on your mind?" He laughed it off with a brittle giggle, calling it nothing major, then confessed he'd finally opened his shop. It was flopping far below his hopes. This blindsided Amelia. Luffy barreled over grinning and said she thought his shop would be so swamped he'd be scrambling just to keep it running. Wraith threw up his hands and admitted running a business was brutally tougher than it looked, and Laffy leaned in and pressed him, asking if he had any strategies in mind. He revealed Daisy had slipped him an idea, launch a mascot or put a poster girl front and center, and he was still chewing it over. Laughing gave a heavy nod, feeling the weight press down on Wrath, and Amelia barreled into the room, blurting an apology to Wrath for making him wait. She thrust the papers into his hands, voice urgent, "Handle these carefully, they're important documents for your shop." Wraith said he was finished and ready to leave. He wished Amelia and Lathe good luck and they wished him luck with the shop in return. Trapped, Wraith couldn't escape the room. Suddenly the door slammed open and someone barreled in, roaring that Shine had returned. Shock tore through the room as people scrambled to make sense of the commotion. Heads snap up, some spot the man and murmur they haven't seen him in ages. Wrath froze when he caught a whisper that he was one of the few ranked, while Lathe melted into the crowd to dodge his gaze. Sylvia hissed, "What are you doing?" And Lathe silenced her with a sharp shush. Sylvia had never seen him this stone-faced, not even during your volcano mission. Wrath's mind raced to pin down what was wrong as Luffy frantically tried to hide Ariel, the man who'd burst in and locked eyes with her. Wrath demanded, was Ariel the ranked person who slammed the door open? Curio bounded up and asked, "How long has it been? You doing okay?" Laffy privately branded him a jerk but swallowed it and replied, "It's been a while." Ariel dropped to one knee, heart pounding, and asked her out. Trembling, Luffy shot back that she'd rejected him countless times and flat out wasn't interested. Wrath froze when he realized it had happened over and over. Ariel insisted he'd been blurting confessions with a laugh and that he wouldn't quit as long as she stayed single, so he vowed to keep confessing until she agreed. Panic clawed at Laffy and she hatched a plan, fired a quick glance at Wrath and blurted to Ariel that she was already with someone. Ariel staggered back, stunned, and demanded who it was. Rafe, equally stunned, didn't even realize Lafayette had someone. Daffy shot forward and seized Wrath's arm in a lightning-quick grip. He thundered to Ariel that Wrath was her partner. Silence slammed the room, everyone froze, Ariel and Wrath included. Eyes went wide in surprise as Ariel, skeptical, tore into Lafayette for lying, pointing out he'd never seen her with Wraith. Lafayette forced a strange smile and insisted she couldn't always be seen with him in public, claiming she'd met Wraith while Ariel was away on requests. Though Ariel fought to believe her, doubt clawed at her. Ariel plunged into her own soul to find confirmation of the effort. Sylvia Backlaffy declared they'd met Wraith while Ariel was away, confessed she couldn't vouch that Laffy and Wraith were really a couple, but insisted Laffy hadn't lied. Ariel stormed up to Wraith, locked him with a glare and demanded, "Are you really dating Laffy?" Wrath froze for a heartbeat, and when Lathe's grip crushed his arm he feared it would snap. Voice trembling, he stammered that they were together. Ariel's disappointment flared, he refused to accept that this had happened while he was gone. He gaped in disbelief, jabbed a finger at Wrath, bellowed his name and warned Lathe not to trust him. Ariel, reeling, stormed out of the room. The moment Lathe released Wrath's arm, Wrath crumpled in pain and murmurs rippled through the crowd. After Ariel walked out, Lafayette sank down beside Wraith and apologized for the incident with the blonde guy. She said she and Ariel had been fellow ranked adventurers for a while, and from the first moment they met he'd poured out his feelings relentlessly. Wrath had watched her reject him every time, but he refused to back down, so when his persistence showed no sign of stopping, she said she was forced to cook up a lie. After reconnecting with Wrath, she hatched a bold bluff, claimed him as her boyfriend, and enlisted him to play the part until Ariel finally gave up. A cocky grin split his face. He'd already planted the seed with Ariel, and the moment she relaxed he jumped on board with the plan. Laffy choked out another apology, poured out a heartfelt thank you, then looked him straight in the eyes and asked if he was truly okay with it. Wrath smirked that, from a guy's perspective, Ariel was a total catch who could form an impressive adventuring duo with him if she chose, and she admitted Ariel wasn't a bad person but his personality didn't fit her. Wrath growled, "What do we have to do to make everyone believe we're a couple?" Laffy's cheeks flamed as he stammered that they could go on dates. The moment she said it, her words ignited his cheeks and he flushed too, burning bright crimson. She snapped that these were fake dates. Ariel still doubted their relationship, so they had to tread carefully or risk blowing the whole thing. Wrath swallowed his pride, admitted she was right, and vowed he'd give everything to make good on it. Lathe's gratitude spilled out as she thanked him again, and Sylvia watched with steady certainty that Wrath would have Lathe's back when she needed him most. Wrath launched into his journey just after striking a deal with Lafay, the promise to pose as her lover still searing in his mind, links in the description. He strode forward, every footfall pounding like a drum. He pressed on until his gaze slammed into a girl lying motionless on the ground. Realizing she'd collapsed, he snapped to her side, zeroed in on her well-being, lifted her gently and asked if she was all right. His voice shook with worry as he cradled her face and scanned every feature, a lightning bolt of recognition tearing through his mind. Recognition slammed into him and relief crashed over him when her chest rose and fell. She was breathing. Her familiar face steadied him as he kept scanning for any spark of awareness, and just then the fox padded forward and Wrath snapped, "Who are you?" The fox announced himself as Letitia's friend and begged desperately for someone to come to her aid. Wraith froze, stunned. The fox could speak. The girl groped for words, trying to say something. Wraith lunged closer and asked if she was okay. She choked on the words, struggling to ask for help. Her stomach rumbled, and she blurted out that she was hungry. Wraith darted back with a warm loaf for her. The fox seethed as he explained they'd been fleeced of every last coin, leaving them utterly penniless. Penniless and desperate, hunger gnawed at them as they couldn't even buy food. Wraiths ached with sympathy for their situation. After she devoured the bread, he demanded to know who she was. She introduced herself as Low in the Fog. Mimi bared the truth that he was a spirit, and Ray snapped that a spirit and a human becoming companions was almost unheard of. Mimi blurted that he'd been by her side for years, the spirit insisting Low was like a daughter to him, and Ray, stunned a spirit would call a human kin, demanded to know what they planned next. Low snapped that she was hunting down an alchemist named Wraith. Wraith's eyes snapped open as surprise slammed into her. Shock slammed him when she announced she was searching for someone named Wrath. He shot back that he was Wrath and demanded why she sought him, and she declared she wanted to be his disciple. Wrath froze, then snapped, "What do you mean?" She said whispers had crowned him an extraordinary alchemist who could concoct elixirs. She never imagined he'd be so young. Wrath gaped as his name spilled into foreign lands. Torn between running his shop and laughing fits that ate his hours, he had no time for a disciple, yet her flushed cheeks made it impossible to shut her down. She insisted again, burning with resolve, that he teach her alchemy. He snapped a solution into place and declared he'd take Lucia as his disciple, 2 strict conditions. She had to work in his shop so he could train her in alchemy, and she could walk away whenever she chose. She turned up whenever she wanted. With Ladur in play, he stayed put in the shop and coached her every step. Lucia nodded, locking in the first condition. His second request cut through the air: let the spirit be the shop's mascot. The spirit, unsure of its role, leaned in as he explained that a mascot just sits in the shop for customers to chat with or reach out to pet. Pride surged, but the thought of human touch made it hesitate. They proved the perfect, irresistible choice as a talking fox, turning the shop into a one-of-a-kind spectacle. Hope blazed in Patatia's eyes as she implored the fox once more. The spirit crumbled and agreed. Wrath pressed how long she'd stay in the capital, and when she confessed she hadn't decided, he slid her an offer: stay at his shop until she sorted out a place to live. At home, Luria's breath hitched. Wrath stood before her with a girl she didn't recognize. He silenced her with a piercing glare and declared the girl would work there from now on. As they climbed the stairs, Letitia pressed him about the woman, and he revealed she was his mentor who lived there. He flung open the door to Letitia's room, shoved a black crystal into her hand, and dared her to prove her alchemy. A device from her homeland that forced alchemists to prove their worth by measuring their ability through sublimation. The instant her fingers met the crystal, it flared to life and flooded the air with blinding, dazzling light. Clearing the crystal to 70% would wow any seasoned alchemist, but Letitia shattered that mark at 90%, so Wrath, pricked by curiosity, pushed himself to test his limits. He'd never tested the limits of his own power. Crystal erupted into a blinding, searing glow. Agony ripped through him, he crumpled to the ground. Letitia shot to his side, heart hammering. Relief crashed over her when she saw he was fine. He stared at the broken crystal, wondering why it failed, and Letitia shot back that he'd pushed it past its limits for her. She asked him to craft a magical device right before her eyes, stunning Wrath who. They braced for a plea for potions, but Lucia cut them off. She brewed potions, sure, yet her true genius was crafting magical devices. You asked which device to make, and she shoved the decision into his hands. Under the blistering summer sun, he cobbled together a makeshift cooler from a large sheet of paper, a pen, and a necklace. He filled. They brandished the pen flecked with white powder, explaining that this special pen They ripped material effects into existence, skipping the usual ritual of tracing magic circles and gathering specific materials. Rip through the inked magic circles scrawled across the paper. She dropped the necklace onto it and sealed the device beneath. Letitia's face drained of excitement. When he asked what she wanted, she requested a ring. My jaw dropped as I realized he was getting one to another girl. Luria watched misread everything, and panic exploded inside her. She swore Wrath was in a relationship. He snapped, "Does this look romantic?" And she had to concede he lacked the guts for it. Luria cut in, demanding what they were doing, and Wrath shot back that he was testing Letitia's alchemy. They introduced themselves. Wrath shot a look at Luria and declared Letitia would be living on the second floor starting today. He urged Lucia to go on, and she leaned in, whispering a spell that infused the ring with enchantment. She ripped the pricing rate apart with a flash of magic. Lucy. She hammered out magical devices nonstop, infusing each one with lethal attack magic born from her hard-earned mastery of sorcery. Luria swore Lucia had come to study magic, but Wrath shot that down. Lucia hadn't, and Luria gaped, baffled, declaring Wrath's way of crafting magical devices was nothing like hers. Lucia cut him off, insisting Wraith teach her magic circles. Wraith arched an eyebrow, questioned her resolve, warned the craft was brutal and urged easier lessons, but Lucia planted her feet and vowed she'd try her hardest. Mid-dinner, Wraith blurted, "What do spirits eat?" The fox snapped, eyes blazing, "Spirits don't need food, only frail humans do." Lowry slammed the truth, "Spirits feed on magical energy. When that energy runs dry, their memories crumble and they're reborn as spirits." They grilled Lucia about her origins and she slammed down the truth, "She's from Wano country." Wrath had never laid eyes on it, but Lurie had walked its halls and painted every detail with words. Luxurious alcohol and snacks unleash a one-of-a-kind flavor that slams into your palate. She could feel the place scream different, its character carved into every building, and the country's fierce reverence for politeness set Wrath's curiosity ablaze about Lucia's hometown. Larry's gaze snagged on Lucia's youth and he burst out, "Have you studied alchemy your whole life?" Lucia exclaimed. She poured out her burning passion for alchemy, while her parents had already enrolled her in a magic training school. Luria lunged with a question. Was Lucia an ability? Schools were mostly for nobles, and Lucia dodged it. Wraith pivoted, pressing Mimi on how her spirit fox became her companion. Mimi shrugged, evasive, then admitted Lucia had sealed a contract with him as a child. Luria's jaw dropped as Lucia forged a spirit contract, spirits siphoning magical energy to unleash raw power that made ordinary magic look puny. Wrath flashed a grin and declared Lucia would start at their shop tomorrow and be an incredible asset, and Luria jabbed him with a mischievous smile. "So, you think she's cute?" Suggesting they make flyers shoved rates into dodging. Lorien agreed for once. The next question slammed down, I'm sorry. The next day the shop threw open its doors, but Wrath's heart sank despite their mascot cavorting outside. He clung to hope, telling himself a quiet first day was normal. The shop bell sliced the silence as Lafayette and Sylvia there. Round up the first customers, or mount up and thunder over to demand an update on the shop's progress. Wraith burst forward with a booming hello, greeted them like an old friend and thrust Lucia into the circle. Meet Lucia. Sylvia's eyes lit up and she lunged at Mimi, peppering her with rapid-fire questions about the tiny creature. Wrath declared he was Lucia's contracted spirit, and a faint ripple of unease washed over Sylvia. Ray I flashed a reassuring grin and urged Sylvia to pet Mimi. After all, they were guests. As Sylvia bantered with Mimi, Wraith turned to Lathe and asked why she'd come. Shy and fumbling, Lathe admitted she wanted to talk about their pretend relationship, with Wraith playing her partner. Ray implored Lathe for a low-traffic day, and as he can see, the streets lie deserted. Lathy scanned his schedule, tossed aside her nerves, and boldly asked him out on a date. Her request slammed into Wrath like a punch to the gut, nearly drowning him in stunned disbelief. Next chapter, Adventure Rick, poring over a small potion, suddenly crashed into a nap. His partner spotted they were closing in on the quest site and snapped, "What are you doing?" Rick shrugged and confessed he'd been eyeing a potion in an unfamiliar shop, scoffing at its promised effects. His partner gaped. He'd actually bought a potion to supercharge his physical abilities. Rick felt the oddness, yet faith in the shopkeeper's honesty won out. He slammed the potion down and swallowed it to test it against. Colossal poison spider catapulted aside, dodging its own venom with unexpectedly high leap. Suspecting the potion sparked his newfound abilities, he set out to prove it. He cleaved two of the spider's legs clean off and slammed to the ground, his speed, agility, and control unmistakably pushed to a whole new level. The potion's power stunned him, confidence roared through his veins, and he single-handedly obliterated the spider with no help from his partner. He made short work of the creature, and before the dust even settled, his partner snapped, who brewed the shop's potions. Wraith swept the potion inventory with a razor gaze, then planted the new vials front and center. Grinning at the perfectly arranged shop, he checked the clock. Opening was almost here. His hand closed on the door handle as he told Luria they'd probably get few customers today, but they'd give it everything. Luria nodded, eased the door open, and his jaw dropped. Outside, a massive, eager crowd pressed in, buzzing and waiting for the shop to open. Disbelief slammed into wrath. He expected a blink and the world to vanish the moment the door swung wide, but when he flung it open, he found himself utterly exposed. A tidal wave of customers crashed in, burying the staff under a mountain of orders. They raided the store, stripping the shelves bare well before closing time. The once empty store and Wrath and Lo, gasping for breath, were blindsided by a tidal wave of business they couldn't comprehend. Customer barreled up and asked, "Have you sold out?" Rafe confirmed a massive crowd had just wiped their shelves clean, then leaned in, curiosity burning, and asked her if she knew why so many had swarmed in. He blinked, stunned he hadn't known, as the other revealed that over the past few days rumors had exploded about a shop selling astonishing potions and magical devices. Anything stamped with a flame mark was trusted above all. As Rafe let that revelation sink in, the question of whether he'd take orders. He snapped a quick nod, scribbled down her order, and thanked her. Wrath never imagined the logo he crafted would rocket the shop's popularity through the roof. Elation surged through him, riding the momentum. He vowed to crank out more items before their materials ran dry. After shutting the shop, Lucia and Mimi stood drained to the bone. Wraith praised their grit and warned tomorrow would hit just as hard. Though they sagged under the workload, Wraith reminded Lucia, prompted by her fierce commitment, sprang into action. She bristled, then gave a tight, reluctant nod and vowed to give it her all. That evening, Wrath faced a date with Laffy, a setup to chase Ariel, and beneath his fake boyfriend act his stomach twisted with nerves. Lafayette swept into their meeting spot, and at the sight of her Wraith's cheeks flamed crimson. She blurted an apology for the delay, her shyness mirroring his like a shadow. Wrath's jaw dropped at her outfit. He blurted, "Did you pick this?" and Lefty grinned, crediting Sylvia. Ariel hung back, watching them from afar as they strolled, and Wreath's mind raced as he wondered what couples usually do on dates. Laffey bragged about how fast his shop was booming, the pace catching her off guard, and she felt a sour mood settle over her. Adventurers clamored, voices crackling over the flame-marked potions and rumors of a three-tailed fox. A jolt hit Ray. The customer's praise mirrored earlier remarks, proof his little shop's fame was exploding by word of mouth, the exact plan Daisy laid out when he asked her for advice. Lucia and Mimi turned the shop into a magnet, enchanting customers of every age and gender, and Wraith clung to hope it would last. She giggled and swore the excitement wouldn't fade. His products were simply exceptional. Flattered and flushed, Ray stammered a thank you, silently begging the momentum to carry them forward. Today, Wrath burst out of the shop and ripped himself free from someone else's care. Suddenly they heard a child's sob rip through the air. Wraith's instinct screamed to rush in, but Laffy stopped him dead. Moments later, Ariel burst into view, thrusting the flower toward the crying child and speaking to them. He clashed violently with that lovely face of hers. He reached out with a kind gesture, but anguish gripped her and her sobs wouldn't stop. Wrath gawked at the man's bizarre garb and let out a sharp chuckle, certain the guy had been tailing them. Guards stormed in and snatched the Ariel away. A desperate urge seized them, bolt now while they still had the chance. Wrath froze as the man refused to relent, and she declared she had a plan. She burst into a vivid description of New York's annual festival. The capital exploded into life. An incredible parade dazzled the streets while quirky, one-of-a-kind shops popped up on every corner. She snapped that Sylvia had been relentless, flooding her with texts, desperate to drag her to the festival, just the two of them. Ariel would probably keep watching them, so showing up together at the festival could sell the idea they were a couple, and Wrath agreed, grinning that festivals were classic date spots and he was game. Lath nodded, sealing the deal. They sprang into action. He steeled himself and carried it out. After a brief pause, Ray realized Ariel had been taken away. The date was pointless, so they ended it. A week later, Lucia cornered Wrath and demanded, "Are you really going to the festival?" At the festival, he shot back that it was already noon, so the crowd should be more manageable. Lucia's nerves spiked at the thought of going alone, but Ray reached out, reassured her, and praised her confidence. On their last date, Wrath choked when he tried to take charge, shame burning in his veins. Now he's sworn to seize the moment and turn this festival date into a smashing success. He steeled himself and marched straight to Daisy for help. Wraith burst in, breathless with apology, and blurted that he urgently needed Daisy's help. His heart slammed when he saw Sylvia. He stammered, "Why are you here?" He flashed a grin and scoffed, questioning what he thought she was doing. Daisy cut through the fog. Sylvia had asked her for help with something murky. Wraith threw out a bold plan. Sylvie cut in, reminding him of his promise to attend the festival with her sister and warning that his unfamiliarity with the capital's festivities could leave him stumbling. Unable to lead or set the right mood, Sylvie offered. He dove in and matched breaths with his date the moment he sensed his unease. She threw out, "Can you handle this alone?" Not a clue her doubt was exactly why he'd come to Daisy. Daisy either snatched up the request or stood there, puzzled they'd picked her. Sylvie said Wraith knew almost no one to ask. Daisy blurted, "Are you dating an S-rank adventurer?" Wraith barked that he was only pretending to be her boyfriend to drive away an unwanted suitor. Confusion cracked across Daisy's face. Sylvia jumped in, "If Daisy can't help, we'll ask Amelia." Ruth slammed the brakes on bringing Amelia in. She could already see the storm Amelia would unleash. Daisy shrugged. Amelia was an adult, no problem, but Rafe begged for her help, and a burning question ignited in Daisy. Why was he so desperate for her, of all people? He demanded they hear him. This was a matter of utmost importance to him. His relentless pleading wore Daisy down, and she agreed to help. Sylvia practically fizzed with excitement and shoved everyone into kicking off festival preparations. Daisy was still buried in work, so they shoved the plan back. Ignited 300 years ago at the country's founding to summon the kingdom's prosperity, the Royal Dragon Festival was forged to honor the crystal dragon. Centuries later it has swelled until the whole capital erupts in celebration, and every soul there counts down to it each summer. Astonishment ripped through Wraith as the event's grandeur swallowed him whole. Lathy leaned in and asked if he was enjoying his first Royal Dragon Festival, and he gushed that every sight was incredible. He finally understood why it was so popular. As his gaze locked onto Lathe and her stunning outfit, he couldn't help himself. He blurted out a loud, admiring compliment. Lucky break, Lafay didn't hear a single word. Suspicion flared in Ariel as she kept her gaze locked on them. Wraith frantically scanned for the others but came up empty. Sylvia and the girls were hiding. Nicola was practically glowing beside Daisy and Sylvia, Daisy's exasperation already obvious, and Luria declared Wraith so hopeless with women that turning him into a proper boyfriend felt impossible. She spotted Ariel and rushed over, voice cracking as she cried, "Are you okay?" The escort caught wind that no one needed to worry about him, and at this, Wraith had gone and bought something for Lafay. He handed her candied apples. The second their fingers met, their cheeks ignited and they jerked their hands away. Lori and Sylvia beamed, glued to Rafe and Lathe's crackling banter, while Niccolo, heart-hammering, nervously tried to ask Daisy out. Daisy rebuffed her with stone-cold firmness. Nicola melted at that fiery defiance, while Daisy only wanted her gone. Sylvia and Luria huddled, feverishly scheming ways to pull Rake and Laugh into each other's orbit so they'd grow closer. A swaggering pack of men closed in and unleashed a volley of flirtatious lines at them. Sylvia pinned them with a bone-chilling glare, and they shivered. And the man grinned, shrugged, and declared they were only out for a good time. It was their first time in the capital, so Laura stepped in, admitting she and the others were just as lost and telling the men to ask someone else, but the men wouldn't take no for an answer, pressing on and offering to explore together. Some guy yanked Daisy's shoulder, bragging he could hang out when a menacing voice snapped, "Let go." A blast of ice seized his hand, freezing it solid in an instant. Girls formed a living wall around Daisy as Sylvia locked the men in a razor-cold stare. They swore it was all just for fun, but Sylvia snapped, her smile gone, and ordered them out. Sylvia laser-focused on helping her sister and Wrath, snubbing random strangers. She even toyed with triggering an accident to freeze they. Clutch your legs and beg them to hang tight for one tiny favor. Back at the festival, Wrath and Lafay tore into sizzling street meat, laughter and spice igniting the night. Wrath's gaze devoured stalls brimming with goods from distant lands, and Lafay cracked a grin, proposing they snatch up bizarre little creatures as souvenirs. He snapped back to Lucian's words, she'd be at the festival, most likely tearing into the food at your stall. I prayed Luria Eames was just at home nursing a drink. Then the same men who'd tormented Sylvia and Laura burst in and started harassing her. They laughed in nervous bursts, and Wraith wasn't fooled. Fear laced their smile as their eyes kept darting behind them, not flirting. Lathe planted his feet, refused to go, and shot them the same fierce glare Sylvia had. Terror ripped through them and they bolted. Laughter itself froze, stunned by the encounter. Sylvia watched her plan implode and crumpled to her knees, frustration boiling over. Blind to the scheme, Loria prayed for Lackey's courage. Sylvia had hoped the chaos would let Wrath step in and shield him from the thugs. Lathe proved too tough. Sylvia sprang to her feet, zeroing in on Wraith to guarantee her sister's happiness. Sylvia seized Luria's arm, eyes blazing, and demanded they bring Wrath and Luffy together, make them touch. Curiosity flared in Luria as Sylvia readied wind magic to shove Wraith toward Laphicupli. Plan sealed, they fuse their powers and surge upward, exploding into a towering force. A roaring gust hurled Wraith closer to Laffey. Wraith lurched and slammed his face into Lackey's chest. He chokes out a frantic apology. Sylvia and Laura erupted into triumphant cheers. They'd finally reached the goal they'd been chasing. Laffey and Ray locked onto a game stall and stepped over, while Wraith's hands trembled as he hurled ring after ring at the bottles. He clung to the hope he'd finally nest. The ring snapped onto the stick at the last heartbeat. Wraith snatched it up and tried it. Tried again and smashed it. The crowd surged around him as confusion ripped through him. He had no clue how he'd pulled off the win. Sylvia and Luria slipped through the shadows and tipped the scales in his favor. Lurie clocked the swelling crowd and scoffed they'd seriously overdone it. Sylvia agreed his sister was slipping into full work mode and snapped they had to lure him. It's their only move. We urged them to dive into the festival, and Wraith vowed to scout out a perfect spot to sit for the fireworks after the game. Suddenly, Wraith plunged into the festival, and Wraith vowed to scout out a perfect spot to sit for the fireworks after the game. Suddenly, Wraith plunged into the festival, and Wraith vowed to scout out a perfect spot to sit for the fireworks after the game. Suddenly, Wraith plunged into the festival, and Wraith vowed to scout out a perfect spot to sit for the fireworks after the game. Suddenly, Wraith plunged into the festival, and Wraith vowed to scout out a perfect spot to sit for the fireworks after the game. His eyes locked on a melee barreling toward him, and trying to dodge her, he blurted he'd grab some drinks. Too late, escape was already cut off. Amelia flashed a grin, asked where Sylvia was, convinced they had the festival to themselves. Latte leaped in to clear things up, bringing Ariel's situation into the open. Amelia nodded, smiled, and pointed out how close they'd become, saying the festival was a magnet for couples. As she spoke, Wrath spotted fog coiling into being and snapped his gaze to his hand. The Ritz ring, the very band that nullified magic, cracked in an instant. Light erupted, revealing the thought was pure magic. Amelia collab. Sharp jolt ripped through them both. Wrath pressed a fingertip to her wrist, found a steady pulse. She was fine, just asleep. Lathe exhaled with relief even as bafflement tightened his jaw. Wraith hissed the fog was laced with sleep magic. His ring kept him immune, and when he asked Lafty how she felt, she shrugged, "I'm fine," then argued the mist hit people differently and urged them to move before their limbs went heavy. A choking fog swallowed a wide swath of the capital. Its scales screamed a powerful mage had conjured it, and Rafe's mind snapped. How many people were still awake? Lathe demanded they comb the wreckage for anyone still conscious. With no clue when the fog would lift, they spread out to scour the surrounding areas. The fog slammed into a choking curtain, and suddenly they realized they could be facing someone as strong as, or stronger than, a mentor. No more waiting, they had to act, and Rafe would take Amelia's teasing over this crisis without hesitation. They slipped forward and found everyone dead to the world. Lathe's senses flared at the presence, and he shouted, revealing. Ariel greeted them with a cocky grin, laughed, and fired a blunt question at him. Did he know anything? He swallowed and admitted he didn't. He suspected the few still awake, him and Lafay, could shrug off spells, their ranked adventurer status proving they had high magic resistance. Luria and Sylvia hustled Daisy and Nicola into a safe hiding spot and tore off after Wrath, while Lafay reached to trace Wrath's magic, only to have her own power cut off cold. Sylvia strained to trace her sister's magic to lure him, but two rival spell currents crashed in and drowned it out. Sylvia's eyes locked on Ariel, the ranked adventurer they'd set as bait. Sims snapped that Ariel was the one hopelessly in love with Lafay. When pressed, Sylvia shot back that her magic held fast in the choking fog. Luria launched into the sky, squeezing every ounce of magic to stay aloft, and after a breathless stretch they finally spotted Wraith and the others. Rafe froze, eyes wide as they swooped in from the sky, and with a teasing grin he shot back, "Are you drunk?" A voice sliced the silence. They snapped into position, bodies coiled to strike. Mimi sneered, ripping into them over their weakness. He demanded the obvious, why was she here and where was Lucia? Mimi dropped a bombshell, Lucia started the fire. Wrath's brow knotted when Ninny dropped Luria, and Ninny snapped that it wasn't the Lucia he knew. He asked, voice sharp, if that silent, stone-faced Lucia was the one who bristled at every little thing. Mimi explained that the Lucia he knew was the light Lyria. Dark Luria, a half-human, half-vampire hybrid, unleashed the magic. Over 1,000 years ago, a magical race called vampires rose to rule the night with blood-drinking ferocity and inhuman strength, but their failure to reproduce doomed them and they faded into history. Rumors tore through the crowd. Lucia hadn't mastered her powers, and when her blood runs low or alcohol clouds her, her personality snaps and she erupts into a berserk rampage. Mimi warned that Lucia had plunged into her dark vampire mode and was wielding her power to smother the capital in a choking fog. Wraith demanded when the mode would end. Mimi warned it could drag on from half a day to well over a full day. Lucia, a hybrid, unleashed power that made ordinary humans look tiny, and because she was Mimi's contracted spirit, Mimi couldn't step in to stop her. Wraith wrestled with what first made her snap, explaining she'd only had a little alcohol while Nimi pushed her to drink. Wraith leaned in and demanded Luria's thoughts. She shrugged and declared a strategy wasn't necessary. They had to stop Lucia. Fears of injury flared, but Ariel stepped in and assured them. He'd deal with him. Ariel flashed a sly wink and promised his potions would crank their effectiveness up. Everyone's resolve hardened. Mimi urged them to follow and then bolted, dragging the others after her. Lathe shot her hand out to Wrath, urging Wrath to fly because it would be quicker, while Sathya lunged and clutched Lathe. Tossed by savage turbulence, they finally slammed onto the runway. Wrath, unaccustomed to such flight, was slammed by nausea as his life detonated in rapid flashes before his eyes while a spotted dark Lucia hovered menacingly above. She beamed, licking her lips as she eyed the mouthwatering group below and mused aloud. Her grin chilled Wrath. This wasn't the Lucia he knew, yet he clung to the hope they could talk her down. Mimi snapped to stay alert. Lucia wouldn't hold back. Lucy flung caution aside as if it were a worthless cloak. Luria's tone stayed polite but razor-sharp as she asked Lucia to lift the fog magic, then tore into her for misbehaving and stirring trouble throughout the capital. Luria's voice hardened into a razor as she refused, sneering that she was just an old woman. It lit a fuse in her. Wrath froze, eyes burning, and snarled, "Lucia, what's your purpose in unleashing all this chaos?" Lucia shot back with a laugh. No specific game, she just wanted to let loose after being cooped up for so long. She blinked into existence right in front of Wrath. She beckoned him to join, her speed hitting him like a thunderclap, and Wrath froze as she readied to strike. Luria launched a fierce kick at Lucia, but she slipped aside like water and laughed, taunting that the move wouldn't catch her. One backward glance cost her everything. She unleashed jagged ice that erupted and sealed her in a frozen prison. Dizzy and breathless, Wrath's pulse pounded. Had she really just teleported? A bolt of realization seared him and he barked at them, "Bind her now." But Lucia slaughtered him, then melted into the shadows. She sneered that their magic couldn't even graze her, then launched into a taunting circle above them. Wraith saw through her trick. She was moving by dissolving into fog, and Sylvia snapped a chain to snare her. Lucius melted out of his bonds with a cold, effortless grace. Lucian's eyes snapped to Sylvia. She wasn't aiming to strike her, and he demanded to know what she was really after. Countless chains boxed Lucia in, and so. No, she wasn't trying to hit her. Right from the jump, she planned to snare her with a whipping chain ball. Lucia's blood ran cold as the chains snapped into place, curling into a merciless sphere that stole her movement and sealed off any escape. She swallowed her pride as she realized she'd misjudged Sylvia's cunning, and Lucius unleashed a searing blast that turned every chain to ash, setting her free. Next, Laffy lunged at her, but the moment they collided, Lucid liquefied her arm into choking fog, sending Lathe crashing to the ground. Laffy abode, apologizing for her failure, and Wraith's eyes went wide. How could she vault like that in a flowing yukata? Lackey snarled that the only way to stop her might be to hurt her. Wrath snarled and refused, insisting there had to be another way, but Luria shot back that Lucio was the fog's source and was effortlessly fending them off. If they didn't act decisively, everything would spiral out of control. They surged forward, unleashing a synchronized onslaught. Lucia snapped back, unleashing a flurry of strikes as the fight spiraled into full-blown fury. Wraith pleaded with Minnie for a solution. Minnie leaned in and laid out the vampire's specific weaknesses: sunlight, crosses, flowing water, fire, and holy water. Even at night they could summon sunlight, and Luria's group was already unleashing torrents of water and roaring flames. Conjured elements shattered against Lucia. They had to draw power from the natural world, plunging them into a desperate hunt. Holy water was their best shot. Wraith gripped a single bottle, praying it would stop her if they smashed it against her. Lucia sprang up behind him and tore the bottle from his grip. Laffy lashed out, booting her, then checked himself to see if he was all right. Wraith snapped that Lucia had taken the holy water. Lucia cracked the bottle, poured its contents away, and taunted that skulking around alone only made him stick out. Lucy sneered and unleashed a torrent of taunts at Wraith, laughing as each insult landed. Wrath quivered, but her jabs earned only his stubborn silence. He told the girls he wasn't angry, he was fired up, plotting a cruel scheme to make her cry. Fear lit their faces as he stepped forward, vowing she wouldn't be harmed and saying he needed all three of them to help. Rage flared in Luria's chest as she refused the plan if it meant committing anything awful, while Wraith brushed it off and insisted it was harmless. Sylvia pressed, "How can we help?" He pulled them close and hissed the plan into their ears while Lucia watched, bewildered. He ordered them to bait her into the open at Southgate and pin her so she couldn't flee if at all possible. The assignment was brutal, and Wraith shoved them forward, promising he'd handle the rest as they whispered. Ariel lunged in with a sudden strike, but Lucia slipped it without breaking a sweat. Lucian sneered, calling her an old lady, and fury snapped through her like a live wire. Luria unleashed a flurry of glistening water orbs and blasted them straight at Lucia's gaze snagged on the spinning water orbs, then Sylvia's chains snapped into place inches from her face as Sylvia dared her to dodge, miss, and she'd be injured and her beauty ruined, and Lucia's heart dropped when she realized they'd been holding back. Now he devours the challenge, daring them to give it everything as they desperately dodge him. They herded her toward the area Wrath had mentioned, wherever it lay. They found and planted themselves, but Lucian read their intent and stopped dead. Ray barked, "Follow my plan to the letter," and vowed to shoulder whatever outcome came. Lucia's pulse thundered as she froze, torn over who to approach first. She expected it would be Luria or Sylvia. Wrath lunged without warning and struck first. Lucia's brow furrowed in disbelief. Wraith couldn't fight or conjure a single spell. She hung back, doubt clawing at her. She didn't trust his skill. Wrath slammed her compression power into the fountain, shattering it into a storm of flying stone. Lucia's gaze snapped to the threat and she tore off, sprinting for her life. Lathe tore after her, hot on her heels. Laughter surged, threatening to swallow her whole. Lucia tore through the fog, only to have Luria and Sylvia materialize right behind her. Wrath barked at Luria to erect walls and trap Lucia inside the area, not caring how she pulled it off. Luria, skilled in magic, seized the task. Wrath wasn't trying to shove Lucia into the fountain, he was hauling the fountain itself toward her. He unleashed his compression power again, and the fountain detonated into a roaring geyser. The blast ripped the sky open, unleashing a brief rain as Lucia hurtled down from above and felt darkness start to drag her under. He snatched her out of the air, stopping her fall before she slammed into the ground. Wraith double-checked their safety, then froze. Lucia was soaked and laughing. Lathe snapped, "Why are you staring?" He whispered, "They're close," and immediately got snapped at for openly gawking at them. Wraith gaped as Luria's wind magic ripped the rain away, leaving her and Sylvia completely dry. Lucia snapped awake and with a wry grin conceded Wraith had utterly outdone her. A crooked grin split her face at defeat. She reveled that someone without magic had just bested her. A triumphant grin split Wraith's face. He'd surprised her and he savored it. Wraith's jaw clenched as he realized the dark Luria's taunts had plagued them at every turn. With that resolved, trouble pounced on Lucius. Wrath and Luria tore after her, Wrath landing a few stinging spanks. Williams, as Lucia, swore never again would she repeat that action. Luria scoffed, eyes flashing. Wrath might have gone overboard. It lay in their wake now. They had to charge forward, not waste a breath on it. Wraith leaned in, voice sharp, and pressed Lucia. How much did she still remember? They found out she remembered everything. She apologized with raw, unmistakable sincerity. Remorse radiated off him, and Mimi praised everyone while snapping that she'd expected a quicker finish. After all, it was 4 against 1. Wraith braced and grew used to her jabs. Lucia snapped back to herself. The fog retreated and people broke down into tears. Wrath surrendered to sleep as reality melted away, and he slipped into a dream. He rocketed into the sky for an aerial sweep, locked onto the heat signatures and guaranteed everyone's safety. They thanked him. He dropped the bomb that he'd been digging into whether Wrath and Lathe were dating. Wrath's memory betrayed him. He'd forgotten the mission originated with him. He demanded answers from Ariel and discovered Ariel and Laffey were indeed a couple. They both played dumb about the real investigation. Ray, skeptical at first, couldn't deny it had hit their mark. Ariel blurted, eyes blazing, if Wreath's love for Laffey ever faded, he'd rush in and declare his own. With a final plea, he implored Wrath to keep Laffey happy, then vanished. A week later, Wrath trudged in, shoulders slumped and eyes hollow. Lathe snapped, how long are you going to stay like that? Mimi sulked too, and Seth, standing there, snapped at him to move on. Fountains ripped apart, roads buckled and split, magic convulsed across the city, the festival erupted into chaos and spells flew with murderous intent. They were serious crimes that slammed people straight into jail. Wraith understood, but the price slammed into him, too steep to accept. Lucia's shoulders sagged as she admitted they were broke. Sylvia leapt in, offering help to lift their spirits. They offered to pay for the spirits, but Wrath snapped it was between him and Lucia, so with no other option he gritted his teeth and picked up the tab. Lucia spat a protest, but he shot back that she had no grounds to argue. She'd collapsed penniless. Catching the hopeful look on her face, he snapped that it wasn't free. She'd sweat behind his counter until she paid him back. She snatched his offer with a grateful smile, and he conceded the whole thing would have played out differently if she'd been up front. She swallowed hard, apologized, then spilled everything about the non-human races. Branded like a vampire, she was refused service and even attacked, and terror welded her mouth shut. Ray I vowed to her, his voice steady, the people of the capital were kind. He told Lathe that alchemists were rushing to the aid of roadside stragglers and ranked female adventurers, and Lathe nodded, saying prejudice against non-human women was finally fading as more of them became adventurers. She swept Lucia back into the capital once more. Their next steps loomed, scraping together enough from the shop alone would be a brutal uphill battle. Seth thrust the paper into Wraith's hands. They demanded to know what he was thinking, because it was an application for a temporary teaching job at the Royal Magic Academy, where legends are forged and rivalries ignite. Will's Radium presided over the school. 7. Shock slammed into Seth as Wrath's stare pinned him. Wrath knew him and burned to expose every one of his connections. Rafe rushed to clarify it hadn't been intentional. Seth leapt in to ask about the alchemy teacher role, and the pay was generous. Temporary teachers leapt in to cover the lessons, freeing Rafe to run his shop. With Alicia at Academy 2 and 2 familiar faces in his corner, Ray dared to believe he could handle whatever came. Doubt hit him like a punch. He had no teaching experience, and the idea of stepping up to a classroom stopped him cold. Mimi urged him on, but Ray felt she couldn't see the hesitation clawing at his chest. Lara believed in him without question, but Wraith feared the students would dismiss his authority because he was almost their age. Sylvia declared, "I'll enjoy his class." He sized up the job, ready to summon Seth's sister the moment things went sideways. Seth's laugh burst out as the realization hit him she was younger than him. Wraith anchored the scene with unnerving calm despite being the younger one, while the frazzled Seth tossed a playful taunt and dashed off to get ready. They hustled in the shop day after day, and months later, Wraith and Seth burst into the Royal Academy for Wraiths to meet the Wells. Wrath stalled at the door, about to ask if they really had to meet Wells, but Seth pressed him. Wrath was going to work there, so they knocked and stepped into Wells's room. Will mustered a polite greeting for Wrath. They traded brittle, forced smiles. Will's eyes flashed. Stories about Wrath had flooded his ears ever since their last encounter. Will snapped, "Why did you choose our academy?" When Will caught Wrath's nervous twitch, he froze, convinced he'd crossed a line, and blurted an apology. Wrath's gut clenched as he wondered if Will knew about the fountain he'd destroyed. Will assured him, voice bright, "No matter your reasons, we're thrilled to have an alchemist of your caliber." He snapped the question, had Wraith reviewed the documents? Wraith shrugged and shot back that he'd already seen the papers they'd handed him earlier. They slotted him into the assistant role for academy classes, tossed the contract details aside, and expected him to fall in line with the lead teacher's instructions until the test. If he noticed anything during classes, he'd leap in and drop his insight like a grenade. Wrath had free rein to hurl his opinions into the ring whenever he wanted. He asked if he'd be assisting and discovered the teacher was Helga. The name hit Seth like a punch, his nerves snapping. Will remembered Helgo as the man who'd taught Seth at the academy. Wrath snapped, "Are you saying health counts as part of someone's personality?" Will praised him as an excellent teacher, but Wraith pushed harder, demanding to know Helva herself, not just her teaching credentials. He butted heads with Will. Will slammed his signature on the papers, demanded they meet Helvet face to face so he could judge with his own eyes, certain Helga would hand over exact class instructions. Surprise cracked across Wrath's face as Will's teasing hit him. Will just smirked that he'd expected they'd be working together, then waved them off. In the hall, Wrath let out a ragged, furious breath and swore he'd never touch a Will for years. Seth scoffed at the overreaction but nodded along. Read Will's perpetual grin drove me up the wall. I swore I'd call him out next time. Rafe chewed over Helga's character, trying to read her, while Seth blurted she wasn't bad, she was fighting to keep herself together. He blasted out a razor-sharp description of him, so Wraithade would understand the moment they met. Seth hustled him toward Helga's room. Stunned, Wrath staggered into a cavernous room packed with books that dwarfed his tiny workshop. A jolt hit him. He was way more organized than he'd thought, quietly commanding the chaos and keeping everything afloat. When Seth hurled the question, what kind of person did he picture? He pictured Helda as a chaotic wreck like Luria, and he taught her only the skills he knew inside out. Seth froze. It struck him as bizarre that his teacher wasn't in his room. The man had always been there when Seth was his student. Rafe swept the room with a razor stare, certain it held no one. Seth urged them to wait a beat. The Wraith's eyes snapped to something on the box. At first it passed for a plain stone. It pulsed like an enchanted gem. He leaned in, hungry to inspect it up close. But a gruff bellow tore the air, demanding to know who dared be there. A bearded old man burst into view, claiming the room as his research lair and snarling that they weren't free to move. Seth greeted Helva, who. Recognition slammed into him. Seth lit up, clutching the remembered memory. They zeroed in on him, struck by how shockingly bright he was as a student. Helga wasn't anything like Wraith had pictured. It knocked him flat, leaving him reeling and baffled by Seth's earlier reaction. Helga exploded into motion, circling wildly while Wrath fixed him with a hard stare. He blurted that Wrath looked shockingly young as he'd heard the name and boldly claimed he knew it. Helga took a personal interest in Wrath. Since he appeared in the capital from nowhere, his reputation exploded, and she found him shockingly skilled for his age, brewing elixirs that dragged wounded adventurers back from the brink. Those were the feats everyone shouted about. Whispers said he was bound to dreams, and Wraith gaped that so much of him was already common knowledge. Just as he began to think this was a win, Helga barked that he wouldn't credit the Wraith's abilities until he'd seen them himself, and he wouldn't let Wrath get cocky. Wrath bristled at Helga's iron discipline, then snapped a sharp look at Seth, who plaster fake smiles like masks. Spotting Wraith frozen in place, Helga tore into him again for lagging and barked for him to come over. Wrath trailed behind, gut twisting. Could he really handle working here? He slid close to Seth and hissed, "Why make us move just to discuss the job?" Guilt clawed at him. He was sure he'd screwed up and that Helga seethed after they barged into his room uninvited. Seth brushed it off, insisting it was no issue. He knew Helga, she'd bristle that Rafe was the same age as the students. Wrath lurched when he realized his age was fixed, totally unchangeable. Seth chuckled, brushing Wrath's worry aside and insisting Helga wasn't a bad person. Wrath had nothing to fear. Helga bellowed, "We've arrived." Keith snapped, "Where are we?" And they found themselves staring at a training ground. Helga declared he'd test Wraith there. Shock crashed over Wraith, leaving him stunned. Seth. He refused to meet Wraith's eyes. He'd kept him in the dark about the test. Wraith swore he'd carve it into his memory, holding his breath for Helga's orders. Then Helga snapped, "Build a golem." Golems weren't toys. Gem cores of raw magic pulsed like hearts, driving the dolls to spring to life and move on their own. Bewilderment slammed into Wrath. Tests usually focused on potion making, weapon enhancement, or crafting magical devices, so why was he being tested on this? He ached to know what Helga was thinking, and Helga snapped that the gall didn't need to be large only to move flawlessly. Helga pressed a small magic gem into his palm. Anxiety slammed through Wraith. He'd never crafted a golem, he knew. He'd mastered the theory, but nerves hammered his chest and sweat slicked his brow. Helga, stay tuned. And snapped, "Are you going to do it?" He sprinted straight to the training ground. Wrath swallowed his pride, confessing he'd never forged a lead golem would be a one-way ticket to instant failure. He squared his shoulders and dared to try. Wrath filled his lungs, locked his focus, and set to crafting the golem. Precision and fierce imagination were his weapons, because in alchemy, and for golems above all, visualizing the finished form was everything. The magic gem would pump power into it, but a poorly forged body would choke the gallon's movements. At worst, it could erupt into a feral rampage, and he'd do anything to stop that. He cinched the magicum tight and plunged into the procedure. Seth's eyes flared with anxiety as Rafe surged forward to kick off the transfer. When the formation phase began, Helgo froze, heart in his throat as he drank in the dazzling beauty of his work. In a heartbeat, Wrath ripped a wolf gum into being. Helga leaned in, pulse quick, drinking in the gum's eerily lifelike texture and the flawless, jaw-dropping craftsmanship behind it. In all his years teaching alchemy, he'd never faced a gulm this formidable. I can't stop picturing how many failed attempts were smashed, rewritten, and burned away until this masterpiece finally snapped into place. Wraith swallowed and muttered that he hoped it wouldn't be a total disaster on his first attempt. Hell's stunned face slammed into him and panic flared. He feared he'd screwed up. Seth's jaw dropped that Wrath pulled it off on his first try, but Hell only stared, utterly skeptical. They insisted that not even a genius sharpened by decades could have conjured what Wrath had just crafted. No ordinary person could pull off that level of skill, not in 100 lifetimes, yet they had the nerve to expect him to believe it was Wraith's first try. Nerves slammed into Wraith, he froze, words vanished, and he blurted a shaky apology. Back in Helga's room, they sat in suffocating silence, Helga's eyes downcast and sadness clinging to her like a second skin. Recounting how he'd pulled it off during the test, Wraith softly asked what they should do next. Seth snapped that he couldn't even recognize his own talent, and suddenly Helga cut in, insisting she had no issues with his work. He decided to bulldoze through the class material for now. Their first lesson zeroed in on goal and construction. He ripped the process open and mapped every step. Helga laid out the steps, drove them through practice, then poured the gallons straight into sword and magic training. She picked Rafe to handle prep and answer the students' questions. Wraith spearheaded demonstrations and tackled other assigned duties. Understanding his role, he asked to be excused, citing his health and another pressing task. Wrath swore it was his first time making a golem, so Hell thrust a crude prototype into his hands and snapped, "Practice with it until class." The only doubt gnawing at him was the stone wraith he'd been curious about earlier. He clutched it and asked, "Is this a magic gem?" Confirmation hit, it was true. Wraith's voice trembled with gratitude. He bowed once, then slipped away. From his room, Helga watched them leave the academy, his gut twisting. Why had he handed Wrath that unresponsive item when he couldn't even process it himself? Brutal clarity hit him. He'd let his emotions fog his judgment about his age. He pinned every scrap of hope on Wrath, desperate for him to seize the one thing his heart craved. At home, Wrath hunched over the magic gem, mind crackling as he schemed the perfect goal to forge, and Sylvia beamed, dead sure his creation would blow everyone away. Wraith scowled when he saw Helga had given no direction on the gall's form or materials, forcing the decision into a brutal gamble. He asked Luri for her opinion, and she suggested making. Something cool shimmered on her lips, and she refused to spill a single detail. Inspiration struck Wraith like lightning. He raced to forge a pulse-bounding spectacle for the students. Lathe slammed down a gold blades and spells couldn't train for, reminding him to build in features that crush swordplay and silence sorcery. He nodded hard, and she practically vibrated with excitement as she urged them to pick either a humanoid or monstrous form. Wrath hatched a bold idea and fixed his sights on a crystal-clear goal. When Lathy asked if he felt uneasy, he revealed his plan to forge a goal that would transform the situation. Even Luria faltered, doubt ripping through her. Could this really be done? Luria owned up she'd never forged a transforming golem, but she believed Wrath could pull it off. Wrath confessed he had no clue how to do it. Luria tried to bolt, but he cut her off and snapped that she had nowhere to run. Lathe snapped, "Do you have a real plan to create it?" She knew race skills inside and out, but crafting something entirely new would challenge even him. He feigned cluelessness, but a razor-sharp plan simmered behind his smile. The experiment gave them free rein to try anything, and the build needed a tough practice dummy that could bend and reshape on command while channeling magical energy to move. So they chose Nithril, which Wrath had already used on Sylvia's projects. Siphoning the thrill into the golem would probably force them to recalibrate it with surgical precision. Rafe yanked a glowing magic gem free and in a heartbeat forged a human-like golem. It pulsed with a life so convincing you'd swear it was a real person. Lathe leaned in, mesmerized by the gong. Wrath implored her to strike it lightly, careful not to damage it. Luffy swung with one hand. But the golem slammed its bulk into her blade, freezing her attack in an instant. He struck again and finally sliced it. Wraith urged Sylvia to probe it with a gentle pulse of magic. Sylvia unleashed her go-to spell and it slammed into the golem, leaving it unscathed. She clenched her jaw and forced herself to hold back. A golem that could take the full force of ranked adventurers like Lathe and Sylvia and still stand was unheard of for something meant only for training. Sylvia's jaw hit the floor at Wraith's creation. Wrath seized it and tweaked a dial, and the golem morphed on its own, and even Lyria's breath hitched in raw astonishment. The human golem snapped into a wolf, and Wraith, chest swelling with pride, bounded after it in a playful chase before long. Sylvia and Luria leaned in, hungry to crack his methods. Luria snapped the question, was Wraith going to bring the goal into the academy? He hesitated, unsure if that would be a problem, but Luria shook his head. He didn't think he could get it there. The Golem fed off a glowing magic gem tucked inside its chest. When that gem's energy flickered out, the creature froze dead and stayed inert until someone recharged the stone. The wolf crumpled, utterly drained, and Rafe begged Helva to pour her magic into it before they raced to the academy. Gloria agreed, but warned it would need constant recharging and she couldn't always trek out to the academy, so they'd have to stash the goal here. Disappointment clung to Wreath. They flooded him with encouragement, but he shrugged them off. He swallowed hard and conceded his chapter with Liquid Niquin had closed here. Day 1 at the academy, Wreath already found himself hopelessly lost while he stood there wondering. Then a luscious stranger's eyes locked onto him and couldn't tear their eyes from him, desperate to know who he was. Wrath scoured every corridor and courtyard, his destination a ghost that kept slipping from his grasp, the student's eyes narrowing with suspicion, and as he pondered his next move, Alicia barreled forward and snapped, "What are you doing?" He announced he'd started working there today. She already knew and shot back, "Where Ray you headed?" He swore he'd been hunting for help in his workshop after a list shot. Wrath's eyes snapped to her. He declared the obvious, matching hair color, identical eye placement, and the same facial features as Seth. She fixed him with a fierce stare and asked, "What do you think of my brother?" Wrath declared Seth his rock, the steady friend who always leapt in and pulled him through. Elisha bristled at the odd reply, turned away, a secret grin twisting at his lips. While the others circled her brother like vultures, Wrath strode in with raw, genuine loyalty. She marched him into Helga's workshop, beaming that she couldn't wait for their classes, then spun on her heel and walked away. Keith rapped on the door, then stepped inside. Rage boiled in her veins. Wrath showed up late on his first day. He stammered an apology, explaining he'd gotten lost. Helga said their lessons started today and they'd kick off with theory, not practical work, to ease him in. He ditched most classes to conserve his strength, and Wraith swore he'd go all out the moment the practical lessons kicked off, and that move paid off. He exploded with questions about the magic gem she had given him. Wrath revealed he'd forged it into an energy-efficient gulm, not a triumphant breakthrough, not a total flop. Helga's jaw dropped. He'd somehow built an entire goal out of that single gem. Wrath replayed every failed attempt. The revelation hit him like a punch to the gut, but he swallowed the shock and locked his focus. "Reserve your focus for later." He declared he'd introduce himself any moment now. They rushed out of the workshop for Wraith's first class, and he was dead set on making a jaw-dropping impression as the assistant teacher. "He's not here, he's not here, he's not here, I'm sorry, I'm sorry." Pinned under the students' stares, Wrath's chest hammered as he wanted to flee, but his feet wouldn't move, so he clung to Helga's voice to calm himself. Her words tumbled past him. When he finally came to, Helga shoved him forward as the temporary teacher, her gaze flicking to him for a response. A Wraith quivered, sweat slicking his skin. Helga jabbed Wreath again, forcing him to snap the Wraith out of his trance. He introduced himself and vowed to pour out his knowledge without holding back during his stay. A student shot her hand into the air. She demanded to know if he was the suspicious figure seen earlier that morning. She'd spotted him with Alicia and wanted to know what tied them together. Wraith's cheeks burned and words tumbled out as he scrambled to say he'd only been wandering to learn his new students' faces, apologized, and insisted Alicia was merely an acquaintance, making the class even more baffled since he'd just claimed ties to one of the 4 great noble families. Helga leapt in, snapping that Wraith was just lost, and his jittery hesitation had made him look suspicious. Recognition flared at his quirks, and she zeroed in on the lesson. From day 1 they branded Wraith with a nickname, the lost substitute teacher tied to a noble house. Helvet tore through the lesson, declaring the magic gem the beating heart and power core behind every Galen's creation. Break it or drain its energy and the Galen goes dead. Relief hit Wraith, no tasks on his plate, and he saw it. The hands-on know-how he'd forged under his mentor Luria now being handed down as formal teaching. Helva rallied the class to the training grounds for an early, pulse-bounding practice race. He pounced on a chance to redeem his awkward introduction and dove in to help. He urged the students to bring their questions to Wrath, but doubts clung to them after he'd gotten lost earlier. Wrath convinced himself that answering sharply would win their respect, yet they seemed able to build gons on their own, leaving him standing idle. Certain their opinions were set in stone, he tore through the halls, hunting down any student who might need help. Ratham's eyes snapped to a girl, confusion etched across her face. They held out a lifeline and she rejected it. He darted from person to person only to be dismissed or bluntly told, "Consult Helga." Seeing everyone cold-shoulder him, Wraith and Alicia let out a single, resigned sigh. He asked her what was wrong, and she snapped that classmates had been hammering her with non-stop questions about her relationship with him. Wrath choked out an apology, regret scorching his voice, and Alicia met him with steady eyes, insisting it wasn't his fault and urging him to let it go. Wrath confessed people were giving him the cold shoulder, leaving him scrambling for how to handle it. Alicia fired back that his image as a suspicious figure couldn't be erased and demanded to know why anyone dared doubt his skills. Rafe confessed he still hadn't shown them what he could do, and Alicia told him to meet her at her spot for the next hands-on lesson. Curiosity flared in Wrath and he blurted, "Why?" She shrugged, waved him off, and walked away. She tore into her own motives, mind spinning until the lesson finally ended. After he swung by Daisy's shop, Daisy exclaimed that they wrote him off as too busy to stop by, but Wrath revealed he had free time and dropped in. Daisy grinned and asked if he could duck out of his shop. Wrath cut in that Lucia had it covered and Daisy jabbed him with a tease, "So what did you screw up this time?" Wraith's patience snapped, he barked at her to stop tossing out those confusing comments. Daisy's eyes flashed as she snapped, "Did you mass-produce the elixirs?" Wrath announced he'd just taken a temporary teaching post at the Magic Academy, but rumors tore through the student body that he'd gotten hopelessly lost and stumbled in late on his very first day. Daisy snapped, "Are you foolish?" Wrath, desperation raw in his voice, begged her for a way to salvage his reputation. Daisy stared, baffled he'd even think to ask her. Ruth knew asking Luria for help would hand her ammo to use against him, while Daisy would hit him with blunt, immediate honesty. She threw down the gauntlet, "Prove you're a true alchemist and claw back the reputation you lost." Rage boiled in Wraith when he realized he'd have to wait until the next practical lesson to do it. "Wraith." He jabbed the question at Daisy, "How have you been?" noting he'd stopped showing up at her shop, no help, no alchemy lessons lately. She volunteered to reveal her progress, it would be quicker. They stormed into a room where Daisy used Lamo as she. When they first met they concocted a middling potion, and now Wrath burns to see how much she's sharpened her craft. The instant Daisy started brewing the potion, his breath caught as her hands slipped into a silk-smooth rhythm. After she finished, Wraith tilted the vial to the light and gasped. The potion gleamed with the proof of her relentless effort. The work was top-tier. He raved about Daisy, awestruck that she'd run the shop single-handedly and honed her skills so dramatically in under a year. Daisy's cheeks flamed as she vowed she'd one day surpass him, and Wrath's grin broke wide. He couldn't wait. Back at his shop he found Luria sitting, trouble gnawing at every line of her face. They pressed her and Lurie snapped that her maniflo had come loose and fallen off. Wraith demanded to know if something had happened and she said there were no negative effects yet, just the awful sensation of a small bone jammed in her throat. Alarm flared and he pressed her to dig deeper. Luria warned the flaw was whisper quiet, barely detectable to most mages and nearly impossible to study, so Wraith said they could let it slide for now unless it began to cause harm. Luria nodded, leaned in with a bright grin and fired, "How was your day at school?" His face screamed that everything had gone wrong. Lafayette and Sylvia arrived, aghast at how crushed he looked. Luria insisted she'd only asked about school, and he snapped, fury flashing across his face. Blackie leaned in, demanding every detail. Wraith's shoulders slumped as he confessed classmates were avoiding him. He admitted a chain of incidents had eroded their trust, and he couldn't for the life of him figure out what he'd done wrong. Frustration snapped and on a reckless impulse he quit his job. He was Helga's assistant, meant only to back her up, and even at worst that would be enough, so he tossed aside overthinking and decided to go along with it. Sylvia swore he'd be okay. She called him out, his mana flow had been sputtering and off-kilter recently. Wrath zeroed in, found it caused no trouble and shrugged off any need to worry. He swung by to check on Lathe and she grinned. Because of him Ariel had calmed and the whole place breathed easy in a rare, peaceful hush. A grin split his face as the laugh urged him to reach out if he needed any help. He thanked her, then swore he'd make love to her when the time came. During dinner on the second day of practical lessons, we plunged into our meals. Ruth's jaw tightened as every student still ignored him. A grin split his face as admiration surged. They'd turned ordinary guns into wildly ingenious creations. A question burned in him: had they simply seen things differently? For now, he strode toward Alicia. He spotted her transfixed by the magic gem cupped in her hands, saw the others already shaping their gons, and darted over to Alicia to ask what was wrong, sure she was falling behind. She snapped that she wasn't slacking, thrust a glowing gem into his hand, and demanded they prove his abilities. She drew a deep, steady breath and thundered that Wraith would give a demonstration. The students leaned in, pulse racing to see what would happen, while skepticism simmered around those Wraith skills. Wraith seized the moment to change their minds and told Alicia, "Trust me." He snapped, "Step back," needing space as he locked his gaze on it. He caught their scathing remarks about him in just seconds. Wraithcrafted is a breathtaking catgallum that shatters expectations and leaves everyone gasping. The golem practically breathed, its fur so lifelike it could have passed for a living animal. Gasps and whispers rippled through the classroom as students stared, wondering if their teacher had always been this skilled. Alicia's jaw dropped. She'd heard her brother rave about those extraordinary talents, but she never imagined they'd hit this hard. The gong wasn't a toy anymore, it pulsed with such realism it might as well have been born. Normally golems were made to sit still, trading motion for rock-solid durability, and only a rare few could fashion the delicate inner lattice that let a golem move. One hairline flaw and its body would shatter under force, so crafting moving golems was far beyond any ordinary alchemist. Shock slammed into him when silence met his effort. He'd been sure he'd nailed it. He spun to Alicia and asked if his demonstration had landed, and she hesitated, admitted she might have underestimated him, then said she finally understood her brother's perspective. Wrath's confusion flared as he demanded clarification. She explained again, but he stayed baffled, and that stunned her even more. She brushed off his feet as nothing special, and that only made her admiration for her brother surge. Later, a student, cheeks burning, darted up to Wrath. She left him bewildered. She stammered, then fiercely spelled out her goal. His body lay shattered and she had no clue how to mend it, and Wrath, relieved it was only a class issue, said she probably hadn't focused enough on compression. She barked at her to zero in on that part while forging the golem. She tried again and hammered out a golem that wouldn't shatter. During his demonstration for Alicia, students relentlessly peppered him with questions, and being called sensei made him squirm. Helva beckoned them over, proclaimed the real lesson was starting. They'd craft golems as practice dummies, and pressed him for another demonstration. Wrath turned every second into action, forging a humanoid golem with the hard-won skills he honed under Lathe and Sylvia. This one had to be built with no transformation capability. He slid the magic gem into place and effortlessly conjured a lifelike, intricately detailed humanoid. The students' amazement at his goal of crafting skills never wavered, and Helva barked at Alicia to test it. "Blast the goal with your magic." Alicia hurled a savage gale of wind magic straight at the gauntlet. It sat unscathed, no scratch dared mar its surface. The students' jaws dropped, the goal stood unscathed, not a single scratch in sight. Alicia, the strongest mage among them, gaped as her spell struck and fizzled away with no effect. Her magic betrayed her for the first time, sputtering out against a mere dirt golem. Frustration flared across her face as Alicia zeroed in on Wrath with a razor glare and demanded, "What's so unusual about the golem?" Wrath blinked, protesting he'd only made a standard gong. Alicia ripped into him in front of everyone, and the students froze, panic spreading as they feared they'd be expected to produce the same kind of gong. Helga overheard their panic, cut through it with a calm voice that steadied them, and told them she never expected they'd pull off work that advanced. A week later, Wrath's jaw dropped as students savagely blasted their own gongs with magic. Training ground had turned into a war zone. He slid aside to dodge the chaos and noticed. The gong snapped apart with shocking ease. It was just dirt, but he'd counted on them to use hardened metals or even mithril for the test. Wrath's mind raced. Would the mithril stretch far enough to arm every single student? Out of nowhere, something belonging to Will ripped into view, jolting Wrath who. He cloaked himself in icy calm. Someone demanded why Will was there, and Will fired back that he was the school chairman. Will barreled in to check on his new hire and shot a blunt question about how the rates were progressing. Wraith admitted the struggle had dragged him down, and Will had been convinced he'd be thriving. Wrath laughed nervously, admitted hurdles blocked his path, but he was fighting tooth and nail to push through. Will's face lit up, he shot Wraith a quick, unreadable stare and kept his reasons to himself. When Alicia called, Wrath slipped away, tossing out a quick, practiced excuse. Approaching Alicia, she clocked how he bristled. Talking to Will left him visibly rattled. Wrath hadn't noticed his own mannerisms, but Alicia said that while he wore a calm mask, she could feel the discomfort coiling beneath it. It struck the Wrath with a jolt of dread. Alice must confess, growing up among the 4 great noble families taught her this insight, a skill she picked up without even trying. Surprise hit Rafe like a punch. Seth missed it completely, and he couldn't tell if Will had noticed his discomfort too. Alicia was convinced Will probably knew. Wraith swore he wouldn't bury his feelings if Will already knew. Alicia affirmed that Will and Wraith were acquainted. Wraith? They insisted it was an unwanted coincidence, but Alicia didn't buy it. Will hadn't met that person by chance. Ruth shot Alicia a grateful grin and blurted, "Thanks," nodding to the demonstration Alicia had asked for earlier. That moment earned the students' respect. Alicia said it was necessary, lauded his effort, and crossed her fingers that things would sail smoothly unless trouble reared its head. Wrath clutched a fragile hope that tomorrow would pass without incident. Wraith planted himself outside the chairman's office, heart pounding as he forced his nerves into a hard courage and prepared to step inside. Will waited, sensing Wraith's curiosity flare at the summons. He barked at Wraith to relax, claiming he only needed a favor. Then Will asked to rally volunteers to tend and preserve the school's property. Wraith demanded an answer. Will shot back flat and simple. The training grounds were wrecked by the recent alchemy lessons. He was right, the grounds lay ruined after yesterday's class, and Wrath, hired as an alchemy assistant teacher, bristled that the extra cleanup fell outside his duties. He opened his mouth to refuse. Will dangled payment, and he snapped up the job. Will beamed and declared he worked lightning fast, every move aimed at crafting the perfect learning space for his students. He hunted every side gig and snatched every extra paycheck he could, ready to do whatever it took. Day after day he dug in, elbow-deep in grease, relentlessly repairing and tuning the school's pipes, wires, and rattling floorboards. Students swarmed him, firing frantic questions and desperate requests. The final test was scheduled for the next practical class. The student unleashed a nonstop barrage of questions. Faith sprang into action, hosting an after-school test prep cram session today to support them. He fired off the announcement at the last minute, bracing for only a handful to show. His jaw dropped. The classroom teemed with students. He was impressed, but his heart clenched. He'd only helped with Helga's lessons and had never led one himself, and the thought made his stomach drop. He barked for every student to grab a box, then vowed he'd walk them through the next steps. After everyone grabbed their boxes, he barked at him to mold the dirt inside into a ball. The students won't be able to do it. He barked 200, if that's all. It sounded laughably simple. Someone guessed he'd check their work one by one, but he clarified that checking them individually was the day's task. Confidence surged through them. They were sure they'd wrapped it up in a flash. They heaved and scraped, but the soil clenched shut and refused to give an inch. Rafe hissed that they'd have realized by now this wasn't ordinary dirt. It came from the southern continent, where magical energy is leached dry. Some soils ravenously draw magical energy in, while others violently shove that power away. That was the exact soil Wrath had handpicked. He tossed them an escape hatch. "Quit if you want." Then he vowed he'd answer every question. "Just raise your hand." A flood of questions surged forward. Alicia declared the dirt wouldn't budge at all, yet she questioned whether that was even possible. Sensing their doubt, he strode forward, called everyone close, and launched into a live demonstration to prove his point. He clenched his hand, and in a heartbeat the dirt snapped into a perfect ball, and Alicia blurted, "Is there a trick?" Explain. They could slam more magic into it to overwhelm it, or sculpt the spell with needle-sharp precision. The dirt fought their spells, refusing to budge unless they shoved a torrent of magic into it, exactly as he'd warned. He urged them to zero in on every stubborn speck of dirt when their magic rebelled and normal control failed. Only razor-sharp precision could force each grain into line. Every brutal rep forged their strength. Everything hinged on technique. Only those who'd mastered alchemy basics could prevail. Alicia locked her gaze, razor-focused and unshakably fair. She finally made the dirt budge, but holding it was brutal and she couldn't see them finishing in a day. Shaping it felt flat-out impossible, and he found himself wondering if he'd set the goal too high. Alicia gave a sharp nod, and Wraith slashed the task down to one order: make the dirt move. The special session ended, and everyone dove headfirst into a tidal wave of work. Night had fallen, but he still had to keep the school's facilities running. He snapped his gaze to a ragged pauper hunched on the turning ground. A cold spike of doubt hit him. Was this from another lesson, and were more marks waiting to be found? In the next scene he slipped after them, every nerve primed for pursuit. Wraith dragged himself through the door after a brutal day at work, and Laffy, Liu, Rhymes, and Sue swarmed him with noisy, relieved greetings. Bennett braced himself. They waited, eyes fixed on him. He thanked them, dove into his food with a laugh, and asked about school end. He brushed it off, "I'm fine," then dropped that a test was looming and admitted he'd been staying late to answer students' questions. Laffy's voice danced with mischief, dubbing him a great teacher. Heat flushed his face and words died in his throat. Luria jabbed at him, calling him sensitive, and they traded sharp barbs as their voices climbed. Sylvia felt the strange tug in the magic flow snap away. Luria froze, then blurted that it had suddenly vanished. Wraith snapped, "Had you tracked down the cause?" They hadn't. Laughter exploded, yanking the conversation straight to the test he'd dropped earlier. He insisted it was just a Golan construction test, and he had no direct hand in it. Wrath, filling in as the temporary teacher, refused to grade the test and dove headfirst into helping the students prepare for it. Luria shot him a mischievous grin and jabbed at his rock-solid commitment. Faith shrugged it off and revealed he'd even started maintaining the school's facilities while he worked. Lafayette beamed with joy, absolutely sure he would crush it. Test day exploded onto the scene. Ruth declared today was perfect for it. The students surged onto the training ground, faces tight and nerves buzzing like live wires. Helga swept the room, confirmed everyone was present, then launched the exam. Locked on the prize, they forged a rock-solid goal and did it lightning fast. Seconds bled points, the fastest students ripped through their goals in 5 minutes. Next came the durability test. They blasted the gallant with concentrated light magic to batter it and test its sturdiness. When Alice's turn arrived, Wraith's gaze snapped to her, tracking every movement. She forged a jaw-dropping gulm and locked the test at full strength. Alice slammed the final rune, and in 3 blistering minutes the golem rose, flawless and rock-solid. Alicia nailed Helga's exacting standards, then marched up to Wrath and demanded to know how she'd done. Wrath froze, flustered, and told her to repeat the question. She wanted to know how she'd performed on the test, and he blurted, "You seem to be outshining everyone." Wrath's praise should have hit like a cannon, yet it landed flat with Veilsha, and Wrath kept swearing he meant it as a compliment. A jolt of uncanny magic ripped through Alicia, the exact surge Sylvia and Luria had recoiled from. She insisted it hadn't happened yesterday. Wrath tore through every theory, hit a dead end, and suspected a rogue surge of magic. He forced a reassuring smile at Alicia and said it was probably nothing, but suspicion coiled in his gut. It had come up far too often to be a coincidence. After school, Ray dove into fixing the training ground. His gaze snaps to paw prints again. They plunged headfirst into the investigation, hungry for answers. I tailed them until they suddenly stopped. It refused to spill a single clue about the magic's flow or those eerie prints. Next morning, Helder erupted in fury when he discovered the students' gallons smashed to pieces. The students poured everything into their creations, and that lit the fuse of her roaring fury. Wrath urged them to report it to Will's right away. In Will's office, the room went cold as they realized there were no witnesses. The night guard found nothing suspicious and no other reports surfaced. Will insisted they inspect the shattered gongs for clues. They inspected them and instantly knew magic had ripped them apart. No human hands could have inflicted such damage. His heart lurched as he stared at the gems. Every spark of magic had been siphoned dry. Magic gems don't just run dry on their own. Someone deliberately siphoned every last spark from them. Will beefed up his security detail and the lessons kicked off, so they shelved the investigation for now. Later, Rafe dove headfirst into the incident with Luria. Faith admitted he barely scratched the surface of magic, stunned that anything demanding the gathering of that much raw magical energy could even be pulled off. Luria snapped that siphoning power straight from a magic gem was almost unheard of. With nowhere to store it, you had to unleash it on the spot. She pressed him for any sign. He shook his head, convinced there were none, and Luria was just as clueless. Graith's blood ran cold. If even Luria, the magic expert, was clueless, this was bad. With golems at the heart of it, he decided the answers lay in his own work and rushed to inspect the golems he'd forged. He barged into the storage room and froze. Dread slammed into him as he realized what he'd just done. He unearthed what lay inside. In the following scene, with Lucia and Luria watching, Raitsum shot to his feet and thundered. I slammed it home. This was critical. Lock your focus on every single detail. He'd kept his composure until that moment, then panic erupted through him. He blurted out that his liquid MC1 was missing. Lucia's brow furrowed in confusion and Luria slammed the truth down. The gone wraith had created it. Lucia snapped. Why did it vanish? Did it slip away on its own? Wraith had to know exactly why. The golem held no magic, which was. That warped everything. He remembered people saying they'd felt a strange ripple tear through the flow of magic. He jabbed Luria with a question. When had the magic flow here finally stabilized? She snapped. Yesterday. He pressed on. When did that irregularity first start? Luria's eyes sharpened. She caught his meaning. Wrath revealed the magic flow collapsed the moment he created Liquid MC1, and the Academy has been hit by the same disruption since yesterday. Every crackle of rogue magic screamed one name, his Liquid Macoon. It had somehow flooded the Magic Academy. At the Magic Academy, amid the golem destruction, the culprit drained every ounce of magic from the shattered Gom's gems. If an energy-hungry, inefficient golem was behind this. If it fed on magical energy to survive, the blame fell squarely on him, so he summoned Lathe and the others for backup. He ripped through the briefing, eyes blazing, and rallied the girls to hunt down the rogue golem. Sylvia recoiled. This was a catastrophe, and Lathy warned that wrestling with a go-on crafted by Wraith would be an absolute nightmare. Lucius craved nothing more than to hole up at home and finally rest. Wrath clung to every one of them, his voice raw as he poured out crushing regret. Lafay refused to pin the blame on him. No one had ever heard O'Gallan stir on his own. Wrath clenched his jaw, desperate that no one would trace the gallant back to him if they tried. Nobody reported it. At the last moment the tide turned. We're about to rip the curtain back and meet you. We're going to get to know you. Thank you so much for joining us today. Thank you. He laughed and shot back that its unique abilities would give it away. On reflection, doubt crept in. Used or not, this could turn the tide in their favor. Latvia dropped a bombshell. They were heading out. Wraith snatched a book, vaulted into the group, and surged after the very goal he'd forged. They reached the academy to find security slammed shut, patrols hemming them in. Rafe's eyes narrowed as he hatched a daring plan to slip past the guards. He pitched a daring scheme and pressed Floria for a favor. 10 minutes later. Everyone wore their academy uniforms like armor. Wrath snarled that this was only to get through the main gate. They'd blended into ordinary students, and he swallowed the lie that they had nothing to fear. The security guard cut them off, demanding why they were there. Wrath snapped that he'd forgotten something, and the guard sneered, refusing to believe the whole group had come back just for one student's item. He suspected they'd be short on school materials, so he threw out a wild plan, magical disguises to help them pass. Clutching the uniforms as his only clue and still unsure, Wraith scanned the guards' faces and they slipped inside without a hitch. Once inside, the classrooms themselves gasped at the audacity of his plan. Ray let out a stunned laugh and admitted he was blown away. She pulled it off, no small feat for someone in her late 20s. Lathe barked, "What's our next move?" Wraiths barked that they'd sprint to the storage where the broken gallons sat, hunting for any clue. The guard still held his post outside the storage room. Laughter's heart lurched. Had the school already zeroed in on the culprit, and Luria urged them to bolt before they were caught. Wraith shoved them onward, insisting they go deeper, then called on Luria to bend her magic and pinpoint the golems. Sylvie had hunted for magic from the moment they arrived at the school, sensing nothing, until a jagged pulse of power slammed into her. A weird electric rush of magic slammed into her. They dove into the investigation and sprinted into the backyard. There wasn't a single gallon anywhere. Baffled, Sylvia stared. She was absolutely certain the magical energy was pouring out of that very spot. Luria confirmed the presence still lingered nearby. Wrath's chest tightened had the goal slipped away. Sylvia and Luria swore it still hovered nearby. The Golan's magical energy strangely writhed and shifted nonstop. If it was thrashing that wildly, they or the security guards would have spotted it by now. A thunderclap of realization ripped through Wraith. The guard they'd been hunting was the golem itself. Wraith yanked the guard's shoulder and hissed, "Don't take on new abilities in secret, don't let them go unnoticed." He spun and in an instant his body began to melt, dripping away like candle wax. Their jaws dropped as he morphed into his true form, a writhing liquid Mequangalum. Lafay and the others froze, bewilderment written on every face. Even Wrath faltered as doubt seized him. He theorized the Goa was siphoning magic or harboring a hidden trait, igniting new abilities as. They argued, frantic to explain the impossible, as the golden MC1 liquid rocketed away. Lafayette Chase followed by Swansea. In its throat, nothing but a tangled nest. Wraith bellowed at Luria and Sylvia to unleash their magic. Golan wouldn't fall easily. They hurled spell after spell and watched each one fizzle into nothing. Wraith barked at Luria to slam a sealing spell over the gall and its surroundings to trap it, while thank you very much. Luria lunged, desperate to seize it. Lathe slammed into the breach, sealing every exit until the Gulm had nowhere left to run. Wrath roared, ordering Laffy to strike again with her blade. He sneered it didn't matter. As her blow landed, he wanted to test something. Gown flashed aside, evading her blade once more. Wraith realized their blows couldn't land and the thing was eating their spells. So with Luria and the others' magic useless, he had no choice but to rely on Laffy, and he thought it absurd that such an agile golem would bother wearing a human guise. If his theory was right, Lathe would strike true any second now. His hunch hit the mark, Laffy lunged and struck the Garm. Ray tore the truth open, Galm siphoned magical energy to move and liquid micron was nearly spent. No wonder it zeroed in on magic gems and student-made Galms. No gems shimmered nearby to restore its energy. The Gallan's movements sputtered and slowed, proof its power was bleeding away. Laffy's strikes finally landed. Wrath bristled with confidence they'd win because a Galn runs on magic, strip its power in battle and it collapses. Suddenly the golem tore itself apart and reassembled into an armored soldier, then spoke to them in a thunderous voice. Wrath gaped at the gallant's terrifying skill. Laffy urged them to try talking to it to end the fight, but the gallant scoffed and flatly declared it pointless. Bolt of dread hit Ray. Lathe could burn out before the Guln's mana Randri. He bellowed Laffyback's name in the Luria snapped, ordering Luria and Sylvia to keep the Gon occupied with a relentless barrage of physical spells. Luffy barreled back and snapped at Wraith, do you have a plan? Outclawed at him, but he swallowed it and pitched a risky plan. They locked eyes and with a single fierce nod agreed to try it. Latvian strode forward to stand with Sylvia and Luria. He baited the gallant, yanking its attention away while Luria wasn't there. Lock onto any crack in their defense, then pounce, hurl ice magic balls that smash through their guard. True to form, the Gulm has snuffed out the magic. In that instant, Wrath morphed and vanished into a ball, hiding himself with his transformation ability. They exploded into view, poised to strike. Engulfed by the magic gem's searing glow. A single trigger ignited a thunderous blast, hurling them to the ground. The Gulm ballooned into a hulking behemoth, a living cliff looming over them. Luria pinpointed the strange mana flow to the golem of. It ravenously siphoned ambient magic from its surroundings. Wrath demanded to know, and she revealed it could potentially replenish its own magical energy. Panic surged through Wraith, it was the only plan he had. Luria doubted it could siphon enough mana to keep every operation running. Golem pounced on the students' gallons, ravenously siphoning every ounce of their mana. Two choices stared them down, let its mana bleed out or strike the magic gem. Wraith quaked despite not being in combat, while Laffy hurled himself at the Golem again. The fight exploded with savage intensity. The Gallan's swollen bulk turned every strike into molasses laugh. Fighting to hold the Gulm's attention, they shouted for a plan, and got slammed with a flat no. They realized they'd need allies to shatter its magic gem. Its hulking size made it a bullseye, but iron-hard resilience swallowed every strike. Luria barked clear the area, as she readied herself. It erupted into a powerful spell. Wraith's stomach dropped at the thought of wrecking the school, but Luria waved the worry off, grinning that they could just fix it later. He protested furiously, but she slammed a crackling magic sphere around him and commanded him to stay put. Restraint shattered, she refused to dodge trouble any longer after Luria's massive. Lathe and Wraith held their breath, praying the gong had been blasted to dust. Convinced it couldn't survive the blast, they watched the smoke clear, and the gong stood unshattered, daring anyone to say otherwise. He planted himself, one arm broken but seething with raw power. Wrath's mind went blank, and Laffy doubted her blade could even scratch it now. Wraith clenched his jaw and concluded the only option was to touch the Gallan's magic gem and snuff its power. It demanded flawless teamwork. He froze, refusing to drag his comrades deeper into the line of fire. They'd already committed, resolve like steel flashing in their eyes. Wraith steeled himself and barked for them to pin the goal in place so he could move in. Lucia exploded into the fray, Sylvia slammed in next, Lathe unleashed the third strike and Luria landed the final blow. A split-second gap ripped open in the chaos and Wraith lunged, fingertips stretching to reach the magic gem. And slammed the kill switch, plunging it into total shutdown. Gong lashed out, gulping down his mana. It turned the task into a brutal gauntlet. The Gallan's creator seethed with volcanic fury. Wraith summoned every last ounce of strength, surged forward in a final push and at last succeeded. The surge ripped the going apart, collapsing it and mana sapped he could barely stand. And they'll unleash it. Panic surged the moment Will's guards stormed in. Ray stumbled into Helga's room, where Helga choked out a trembling apology. Wraith barreled in to interrupt and comfort Helga, but she wouldn't be silenced and pressed on. The investigation tore the truth wide open. The Gallon's rampage had been sparked by a faulty magic gem Helga had slipped into Wrath's hands. If Helga had been unaware of the defect, everyone would have written it off as an accident. Helga cunningly handed him a sabotaged gem, sure Wraith would fail at crafting a golem and be crushed. Yet Wraith's brilliant alchemy bent the flawed jewel to his will, birthing a golem and igniting chaos born of Helga's jealousy and Wraith's uncanny talent. Helvet owned up that it would be unfair to dump the school's damage bill onto Wraith's and vowed to handle it himself. Rafe showed up at Will's office, where Will, moved by Helga's genuine remorse, called him a good person. Will guaranteed Wrath he'd never be blamed for the incident and hailed Wrath's staggering alchemical prowess. When Will fired the question at Ruth, did she still want to keep teaching? Wrath's mind raced through the faces of the friends who filled his life beyond work. They flashed a polite smile and calmly refused the offer. Unfazed, Will smiled and promised the door would always be open for him. Their eyes locked and Rafe snapped into action, tearing through the mess they'd made. She asked how it all turned out. He revealed the Galen's magic gem had gone haywire, nobody blamed him for the incident, and he'd walked away from teaching. Luria bristled and shot him a fierce look. Do you really think you're cut out for teaching? She snapped, warning that his lack of friends could leave him unable to support students through their problems. Wraith waved it off, saying Laffy and the others had his back, and Luria beamed, genuinely thrilled he'd found good people in the capital. Wrath snapped, slicing the silence as he demanded what she meant by that comment. Luria's voice sliced the silence. She announced it, she had to leave. Initially bewildered, he demanded where she was headed, and she shot back that she was leaving the capital for somewhere beyond its borders. Every time she dropped another bombshell, Wrath's temper flared, but he accepted it. Impulsive outbursts were just her signature. She baited him with a mischievous grin, "Miss me," and he'd. Her voice turned to steel. She'd watched her disciple come into her own and was finally ready to resume her travels. Wraith grinned and urged, "Let's throw one last unforgettable farewell party." The light lit her face and she teased him again. Exactly 2 weeks after the Galen chaos erupted, Mimi's farewell exploded into a party as Wrath whipped up mouth-watering dishes and flooded the room with crackling, festive energy. Someone shoved a chilled champagne flute into Luria's hand as the room erupted in cheers, everyone toasting the end of Wraith's teaching days.